The mornings in Josesan began early, with the first rays of sunlight casting a soft glow over the palace grounds. A man stretched his limbs, preparing for the day ahead. Around him, others were already engaged in rigorous martial arts training, their movements precise and disciplined. Amidst the rhythmic sounds of bodies shifting and feet striking the ground, a subtle noise emerged from within a nearby carriage. Someone inside took notice but hesitated, unsure if they should speak up about the fact that they had arrived earlier than expected. As the morning unfolded, the man took a leisurely stroll around the palace, his footsteps echoing lightly against the stone pathways. The air was crisp, carrying with it the distant murmurs of activity. He continued his walk until he encountered a mysterious figure standing within the palace premises. There was something intriguing about this presence, though he did not dwell on it for long. Instead, he offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile as he listened intently to the various sounds filtering in from outside. Beyond the palace gates, a group of guards engaged in their morning training. With dumbbells in hand, they worked their muscles, reinforcing their strength and stamina. As he observed them, one of the guards noticed his presence and, without hesitation, addressed him, inquiring whether the crown prince had arrived for his daily exercise. The prince, calm and composed, confirmed the assumption and requested that the gate be opened for him. Without delay, the heavy iron doors parted, granting him passage inside. Once within the training grounds, he found himself surrounded by an atmosphere of unwavering dedication. Several individuals were deeply engrossed in weightlifting exercises, their focus unshakable. Nearby, two men conversed about their progress, assessing the changes in their physiques. One of them admitted he had not recognized the other at first due to the drastic weight loss, while the latter in turn complimented his companion on his increased muscle mass. He took particular note of the way his friend's shoulders had broadened, a testament to his rigorous training. The conversation soon shifted to a display of confidence as they began posing, flaunting their well-sculpted bodies, and boasting about their achievements in bodybuilding. The prince's gaze wandered to the side, where he caught sight of something that piqued his curiosity. A man, drenched in sweat and visibly fatigued, struggled to push forward. His breath was labored as he lamented that he had only reached the halfway point of his exercise. Frustration clouded his face as he questioned why it had taken him so long to cover even this much distance. Not far from him, another individual was engaged in an intense workout, bench pressing with all the strength he could muster. Every fiber of his being seemed to be dedicated to surpassing his limits. Similarly, another man was performing deep squats with immense weights, his muscles trembling under the strain. As he absorbed these sights, a peculiar expression crossed the prince's face. There was something almost eerie in the way his lips curled slightly, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. To him, this was perfection in its purest form, bodies shaped and strengthened to their utmost potential. It was a vision that resonated deeply with him, for there was nothing he valued more than the pursuit of physical excellence. This man, Park Kyung-hui, was not originally of this world. Once a common young man from the Republic of Korea, he had dedicated his college years to studying food and nutrition, all in the pursuit of becoming a well-rounded fitness coach. His passion for weightlifting had first taken root during his time in the military, where he had been stationed in a frontline unit devoid of entertainment or leisure activities. With little else to occupy his time, he had naturally gravitated toward the gym, where he found solace in pushing his body beyond its limits. Even after returning to college, he had refused to abandon his fitness regimen. His dedication had been a source of curiosity among his classmates, who often questioned why a man so deeply immersed in physical training was enrolled in a history course. As the semesters passed, his physique only grew more formidable, earning him comparisons to professional bodybuilders. Thanks to his relentless efforts, he eventually obtained his Class 1 certification, a milestone that had called for celebration with his friends. That night, there had been something slightly different about their gathering. Unlike his usual disciplined self, he had allowed himself to indulge in alcohol, a rare deviation from his strict diet. Seated in his room afterward, he had absent-mindedly munched on snacks, debating whether to watch a video on YouTube before heading to bed. One particular video caught his attention. Its title posed a compelling question: why did the great King Sejong's life end so soon? Even in his inebriated state, Park Kyung-hui found himself intrigued. His immediate thought was simple: perhaps the great king had neglected exercise. His mind, clouded by the haze of alcohol, wandered into a peculiar realm of curiosity. What would life have been like for a bodybuilder in those ancient times? The thought amused him, stirring a drunken fascination that lingered as he drifted into sleep. Then, something changed. A voice pierced through the darkness, urging the crown prince to wake up. The words were distant at first, barely registering in the man's consciousness. He stirred, his head throbbing with discomfort. For a moment, he was disoriented, attempting to recall where he was. The sound of a rooster crowing only added to his confusion. As he groggily opened his eyes, he struggled to make sense of his surroundings. Something was off. Lifting his hand, he inspected it with growing alarm. This was not his hand. The realization sent a wave of panic crashing over him. His breaths quickened as he grasped at the fabric of his clothes, finding them unfamiliar. The space around him was equally strange, nothing like the room he had fallen asleep in. This wasn't a dream, at least. Not the kind he could simply wake up from. A scream tore from his throat, his voice ringing through the chambers and beyond. The servant stationed outside his quarters flinched but quickly regained composure, once again urging the crown prince to rise. Standing in front of his residence, Park Kyung-hui tried to steady himself, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. His thoughts were frantic, desperately searching for an explanation. How had this happened? Why had he been thrust into this bizarre reality? He wanted to deny it, to shake himself awake, but every sensation around him felt too real. With growing desperation, he yanked open the door. A servant immediately greeted him, bowing with practiced formality. The man's eyes darted around, still struggling to make sense of his predicament. Forcing himself to focus, he asked for his name. The servant hesitated for a brief moment before responding, seemingly puzzled by such an odd question. His personal name was Yu, and his courtesy name, Seojong. The man's pulse quickened. He pressed further, asking about his father's name. The answer he received confirmed his worst fears. His father was none other than King Sejong the Great, the fourth ruler of Joseon. Shock and disbelief flooded through him. If his father was King Sejong and his name was Yu, then in history, he was known as the Great Prince Su. The weight of this revelation was suffocating. He had somehow been transported into the Joseon era, into the very body of the crown prince. His surroundings blurred as his thoughts spiraled. This was real. This was happening. Before he could process it any further, a voice called out, announcing that Prince Jinyang was entering. Despite the overwhelming nature of his situation, a particular thought took precedence. He was about to meet one of the most revered figures in Korean history, King Sejong himself. The realization sent an odd thrill through him. As a history student, this was an unparalleled experience, an opportunity beyond imagination. And yet, as his gaze finally settled on the man before him, reality struck with full force. The great King Sejong, the beacon of wisdom and governance, stood before him, but in a form Park Kyung-hui had never expected. Before him was an extremely overweight version of the legendary king. The weight of the king's gaze bore down on Park Kyung-hui as he struggled to keep his expression neutral. His father, King Sejong, studied him closely, likely noticing the slight delay in his responses. Park Kyung-hui tried to compose himself, keeping his eyes forward, but his earlier hesitation had already drawn the king's attention. His father questioned where his focus lay, commenting on whether he was still drowsy. The king's observation left no room for denial. His presence alone demanded attentiveness. Realizing he had no choice but to respond carefully, Park Kyung-hui steadied himself and offered an apology. He explained his reasoning, framing his thoughts in a way that aligned with the expectations of a prince. He spoke about the weight of responsibility the king carried, the numerous benevolent actions undertaken for the welfare of the people. With sincerity, he expressed his uncertainty over what kind of decree could be meant for someone as inexperienced and careless as himself. The king, however, rejected the notion outright. He asserted his belief in the prince's abilities and stated that he saw great potential within him. His father valued his talents and, as a result, had decided to appoint him as a provincial governor. The weight of the decision settled on Park Kyung-hui before he had the chance to fully process it. There was no room for negotiation, no way to challenge it. This was the will of the king. The conversation did not end there. The king soon gave him another task, instructing him to go to the Hall of Nobles and rewrite the books in uppercase letters. Park Kyung-hui accepted the order without hesitation, even as his mind continued reeling from everything happening so quickly. The opportunity to visit such an important historical location piqued his interest. A place he had only read about in the past would now become part of his reality. Arriving at the Hall of Nobles, he was met with a servant who praised him, stating that the books rewritten by his hand would hold even greater value. He quickly dismissed the praise, humbly noting that his brother's handwriting was far superior to his own. The servant, however, saw his words as an act of kindness. As he adjusted to his surroundings, something unusual dawned on him. He could read and understand the characters in the books before him. It seemed the memories of the body's original owner had remained intact, allowing him to interpret the language with ease. He turned his attention to the books. The letters were not small, yet the king had described them as difficult to see. This contradiction struck him as odd until a realization hit him. Years of studying health and fitness had trained him to analyze bodily conditions quickly, and now those instincts took over. His father's condition became painfully clear. King Sejong was severely obese, with a BMI greater than 35. His swollen face, The profuse sweating despite the cold morning air, and the visible signs of metabolic issues all pointed toward one thing: prediabetes or impaired glucose tolerance. A sense of urgency took root in him. History had already recorded the fate of King Sejong. He would pass away earlier than he should, leading to Danjong's reign. But now, armed with this knowledge, Park Kyung-hwa was determined to prevent that outcome. A presence nearby caught his attention, pulling him from his thoughts. His older brother had approached, his gaze unreadable. He made an offhand remark, commenting on how unusual it was for Park Kyung-hwa to be here, given his preference for living in the mountains. The words were measured, not unkind, but curious. Troy asked what had brought him there, and his brother responded that he had come to inspect the books that their father would soon read. There was no further explanation, only a request not to be interrupted. Seizing the opportunity, Park Kyung-hwa remarked that it had been a long time since he had last read like this. He mentioned the difficulty of deciphering smaller characters, hinting at the reason behind the order to rewrite the books. His brother did not dismiss the observation, but instead recognized an underlying meaning in the man's words. He pressed him further, questioning whether Park Kyung-hwa had also noticed their father's deteriorating eyesight. Troy admitted that he had merely made an educated guess, but his brother remained skeptical. He noted how uncharacteristic it was for Park Kyung-hwa to downplay something, especially considering his usual behavior. His brother then provided more details, explaining that their father's vision had begun deteriorating about a year ago. However, it was not a typical case of presbyopia. No one else was aware of it yet, and so the information needed to remain a secret. As his brother left, Park Kyung-hwa let out a slow breath, attempting to relax. The conversation had left him tense, and he could feel the stiffness at the back of his neck. Instinctively, he began rolling his shoulders, stretching his body to release the tension. A satisfying pop echoed through the hall, drawing the attention of a nearby scholar who observed his movements with confusion. The man questioned what he was doing, suggesting that if his neck hurt, he should simply massage it instead of moving in such an odd way. The man's thoughts quickly shifted. The realization dawned on him they had no knowledge of stretching in this era. Medical treatments in this period were still rudimentary. While doctors could provide moxibustion, their understanding of muscle anatomy was severely limited. It made sense that people would not grasp the connection between muscle flexibility and movement. Troy saw an opportunity to introduce something new and beneficial. Keeping his explanation simple, he attributed his stiff neck to horseback riding, explaining how he had suffered from discomfort for days. However, after trying certain movements, he had discovered relief. He gestured for them to observe carefully and confidently demonstrated his stretches, insisting that they worked. Curiosity spread among the scholars. One by one, they mimicked his movements, following his lead. Slowly but surely, they began experiencing the effects of proper stretching firsthand. The session ended successfully, and soon after, word of the man's techniques spread rapidly. By the next morning, people throughout the palace were already discussing the stretching exercises introduced by Prince Sejong. A scholar remarked how his neck, once as stiff as a rock, now moved freely. Another expressed his relief, noting that he no longer needed to see a doctor for minor muscle pains. Thus, modern stretching techniques found their way into Joseon's scholarly circles, thanks to the unexpected knowledge of the crown prince. Yet, despite this success, the man's primary focus remained on a greater concern, a matter far beyond simple stretches. As he walked, deep in thought, a voice called out. Someone was searching for him. His steps slowed as he glanced toward a woman walking beside him. She turned toward him, motioning for him to follow. Her tone carried authority as she instructed him to come forward and greet the guests who had arrived. Without hesitation, he straightened his posture and prepared himself for yet another unpredictable turn in this new and unfamiliar life. As the carriage came to a halt, the cabin owner took notice of the arrival of the great prince. His expression shifted with curiosity as he observed the royal figure stepping down. The visit was unexpected, and it was unusual for someone of such high status to make a trip to his establishment. Despite his curiosity, he maintained his composure and respectfully inquired about the reason for the prince's visit, eager to understand what business had brought him there. Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hwa stated his purpose. He had come to purchase oil, specifying that he was looking for sesame oil and explicitly noting that he had no interest in either pillow oil or ponyo oil. The merchant listened attentively before informing him that, aside from sesame oil, the only other available option was Sudan oil, which came at a price of 3 mez. Rather than bargaining down the price, Park Kyung-hwa surprised the merchant by offering 5 mez instead. The gesture raised eyebrows, particularly from his servant, who had been observing his master's purchases with increasing bewilderment. Earlier, Park Kyung-hwa had bought an assortment of seemingly random items, and none of the retainers could make sense of his intentions. Though his actions appeared impulsive, there was a clear purpose behind them, one that only he understood. As Park Kyung-hui reflected on his current predicament, a critical memory surfaced. If his recollection of history was accurate, he had died from severe dysentery. The mere thought of it made his stomach churn. Until he found a way to return to his own time, he needed to take immediate steps to prevent such an outcome. Health and hygiene had to become a priority, and he couldn't afford to take chances in an era lacking modern sanitation. Before long, his men announced that they had reached their next destination. Pleased with their efficiency, Park Kyung-hui praised them for their good work, though his mind remained fixated on his larger goal. Before he could proceed further, however, his train of thought was interrupted by the sudden arrival of a woman who addressed him directly. She had clearly been paying attention to his recent movements and, without hesitation, pointed out that he had been visiting the village frequently. Park Kyung-hui barely had time to register the remark before realizing who she was, his wife. The realization was unsettling. The concept of having a wife still hadn't fully registered in his mind. Though he had accepted his new reality, the presence of a spouse only made things feel even more surreal. His wife, noticing his silence, took it upon herself to introduce herself properly. Though her expression carried a hint of curiosity, his behavior had clearly been strange lately, and she was eager to understand what had been going through his mind. Troy, needing to maintain his composure, responded as naturally as he could. He claimed that he had been reading in the library and had discovered that, in the ancient Song Dynasty, there had once been a device used for bathing. Internally, he reminded himself that he needed to act naturally, though every moment in this world continued to feel surreal. His wife seemed intrigued by the idea and questioned him about it further. He responded with calculated enthusiasm, stating that he was simply trying new things and that it did not seem like a bad idea. What Park Kyung-hui needed most after arriving in the Joseon era was soap. For a modern person, failing to properly wash clothes and skin after intense exercise could lead to serious skin conditions. In this era, where hygiene standards were considerably lower, it was an even greater concern. Weightlifting without proper hygiene was unthinkable, as the risks of skin infections and disease would be extreme. Fortunately, Park Kyung-hui already had experience making soap. Back in his time, while working at a gym, he had learned about homemade soap production. His grandmother, unwilling to trust commercial soap brands, had insisted on making her own, and the recipe was surprisingly simple. The process involved mixing water with burnt straw ashes, adding natural olive oil, and incorporating powdered herbs before heating everything together. Using this method, even in the Joseon era, producing soap was entirely possible. His wife, however, was skeptical. She expressed her doubts, claiming that oil dirtied the body rather than cleansing it. She admitted that she had never imagined that something used for washing could be made from oil. Park Kyung-hui remained firm. He was determined to experiment with different methods, relying on both historical knowledge and modern understanding. He referenced an old book that stated that boiling water from bush sprouts could effectively remove stains from clothes, even tough ones. His wife fell silent after hearing his explanation. Without further comment, she turned and walked away, leaving Park Kyung-hui to wonder whether she would accept his reasoning or remain unconvinced. He knew, however, that his time was limited and he had to act quickly. On another morning, Park Kyung-hui began the soap-making process. Observing his mixture, he noted that the saponification process appeared to be a success for now. However, he needed to keep experimenting in order to find the perfect ratio. The result did not yet resemble modern soap, and he had no way of knowing how effective it would be in cleaning until he tested it himself. Trying it firsthand, he quickly determined that there was much to improve. While the cleaning ability was acceptable, the main ingredient sesame oil produced an unpleasant smell. If he could solve the odor issue, then he could begin large-scale production. With enough refinement, soap making could even become an industry, and he wondered whether he could sell it abundantly in the Ming Dynasty. However, for now, his focus remained on a greater challenge: King Sejong's health. Even King Taejong, known for his strict discipline, had failed to convince Sejong to exercise. If the king refused to listen to his own father, then a second son, who was not even the crown prince, attempting to make him change his lifestyle would surely irritate him beyond measure. Troy understood the difficulty of this task. If he were to succeed, he needed to convince the king logically. However, there was another obstacle in his way: his own physical condition. With his current body, he was in no position to teach weightlifting or advocate for physical fitness. If he were to gain credibility, he needed to prove himself. He set his sights on a clear goal to achieve a 400 kilograms lift across the three main disciplines and reach a muscle mass of 670 lbs. If he could accomplish this, his physical form alone would become persuasive enough. Determined, he began training immediately. Standing in the middle of a bathing area, he struck a pose, his muscles flexing. Those around him stared in confusion, unable to comprehend what he was doing. However, this was only the first step. If he was to truly integrate weightlifting into Joseon culture, he needed to turn it into an academic discipline. A book needed to be written, one that documented its history and principles. He recalled a saying about prestige and good reputation, emphasizing that honoring the body inherited from one's parents was an act of filial piety. With that in mind, he decided upon a title, The Bodybuilding Secretary, a comprehensive guide to self-discipline and physical development. Later, within the palace, Park Kyung-hwa wasted no time. He began his workout, performing pull-ups using a wooden beam attached to a door frame. His mission was clear: if he was going to change history, he needed to start with himself. After finishing his exercise session, Park Kyung-hwa took a moment to reflect on the remarkable capabilities of his new body. Though he had expected weakness due to its previous lack of physical conditioning, he was pleasantly surprised by what it could already accomplish. In addition to completing his pull-ups, he had also managed to perform dips, push-ups, and even the dragon flag, a movement that required an extraordinary amount of core strength and control. Though he acknowledged that some areas of his body still needed significant improvement, particularly in endurance and conditioning, he was impressed by its raw strength and potential. His core and pulling strength in particular were beyond what most ordinary people could achieve. It was almost unbelievable that, even with the excess abdominal fat weighing him down, he could still do 15 push-ups in a row without even feeling fatigued. Still, there was a lingering thought in his mind: if his lineage truly wouldn't go anywhere, then perhaps his existence here was more than just a coincidence. His train of thought was soon interrupted as his servants arrived, announcing the delivery of the materials he had ordered. The arrival of these long-awaited items filled him with excitement. Among the items delivered were dumbbells, a revolutionary tool for training and muscle development that had never before existed in this era. The merchant who had brought the items expressed his relief, stating that he was glad the prince liked them. After all, this was the first time he had ever crafted such an object. Troy, however, was beyond pleased with the result. As the men left the room, they began whispering amongst themselves, their skepticism evident. They questioned the prince's sanity, convinced that Prince Jin-young had finally lost his mind. Spending 80 acres of rice on a pile of cast iron seemed to them like an absurd waste of resources. One of the men muttered that even samurai families had no use for this much iron, making the prince's decision even more bewildering. Another, however, suggested that perhaps the prince was secretly recruiting soldiers for some unknown purpose. His companion quickly warned him to speak more cautiously, advising that it was dangerous to carelessly speculate about the royal family. After all, in times of unrest, even an idle rumor could lead to unintended consequences. Troy, however, remained completely unfazed by their suspicions. Up until now, his calisthenic exercises had not made a significant difference in his training. However, now that he had access to weights, everything would change. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, his wife's servant was also grappling with disbelief over the prince's latest obsession. She expressed concern to her lady, stating that even as royalty, spending so much on iron was excessive. She questioned whether her lady intended to simply stand by and watch while her husband continued these strange pursuits. The prince's wife, however, cut her off mid-sentence, unwilling to entertain further discussion on the matter. Her servant, surprised by the abrupt dismissal, tried to shift the subject, questioning whether her lady would try washing herself with oil. Even now, she couldn't understand the prince's decision to spend 80 acres of rice on a collection of iron objects. And now, on top of that, he had introduced a bizarre new way to bathe. The prince's wife, lost in thought, reflected on her husband's recent change in behavior. For the longest time, she had assumed that his greatest obsession was hunting, but lately, his interests had shifted toward things she couldn't quite comprehend. She found herself wondering what she had done wrong, as though she had somehow failed to understand him. Yet, in her memories, she could recall a different time, a time when he had been gentler, more thoughtful. She reminisced about the day when he had handed her a rose, an affectionate gesture that had meant something special back then. But today, things were not the same anymore. Looking at the roses she had once treasured, she reached for one and cut it away, lost in her emotions. That night, she decided to sleep early, feeling a growing sense of detachment. She no longer felt the need for attention from others. As she prepared for her bath, her eyes landed on the soap made by her husband. She hesitated for a moment, wondering whether she should use it. Despite her doubts, curiosity got the better of her, and she finally decided to try it just once. Applying the soap to her skin, she immediately felt the difference. It was unlike anything she had ever used before. Meanwhile, Park Kyung-hwa stepped out of his own bath, feeling unsatisfied. Even after bathing, he felt the urge to lift weights, as though only true exertion could make him feel as though he had exercised properly. Suddenly, he heard a noise and turned toward the source, asking who was there. It was his wife. She approached him, commenting on the soap he had made. She admitted that it was surprisingly effective and lived up to its name as a dirt remover. However, she pointed out one glaring issue: the strong smell of sesame oil. If she continued bathing with it daily, she feared that people might mistake her for an oil vendor's wife. Troy took her words into consideration. He briefly considered the alternative pig oil or beef oil, but quickly dismissed the idea. Such products were too expensive and did not smell much better. Instead of selling his soap to the Ming Dynasty, he decided that it would be better suited as an exclusive luxury item for the nobles of the Joseon Dynasty. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He proposed mixing camellia oil with the soap to create a more pleasant scent. He confidently affirmed that this would surely improve the product. Thanking his wife for her input, he left her blushing, caught off guard by his unexpected enthusiasm. Meanwhile, in the GCK region, a man greeted Great General Jin Yang with deep respect. Troy, upon seeing the man's face, immediately recognized him. His memories resurfaced. He remembered seeing this man during the hunt last winter, where he had struggled to drive the deer out of the thicket. The man had endured considerable injuries, and many people had suffered throughout the hunt. Now, Park Kyung-hwa had come to compensate him, even if it was long overdue. Initially, Park Kyung-hwa considered simply giving him silver, but something about that felt insincere. Instead, he devised a better solution. He declared that, for this man's household, 2 bags of rice, eggs, chicken meat, and other necessities would be provided every 15 days. He instructed him to use the food wisely, ensuring that his family benefited from it. Overcome with gratitude, the man humbly asked how he could ever repay such kindness. Park Kyung-hwa dismissed the notion of repayment altogether. Instead, he gave him a different request. He asked that every fortnight he record the growth and weight of his children. He had made a promise to provide food for 20 families. But his true goal was something greater. As part of a controlled experiment, he planned to divide the children into 2 groups. One group would be provided with a diet high in protein, while the other would receive a diet rich in carbohydrates and fats. Over time, he would track the physical changes and developmental progress of the children, carefully recording their abilities and growth patterns. In his mind, Park Kyung-hwa had already gained an advantage over his father. By implementing scientific methods into nutrition and fitness, he was laying the groundwork for a revolution in health and physical conditioning. With his plans set into motion, he prepared for the next step in reshaping history itself. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer striking against heated metal echoed through the air as molten sparks scattered with each impact. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal filled the workshop, a steady reminder of the labor-intensive craftsmanship taking place. Troy, standing nearby, observed the operation before turning his attention to a nearby worker. Holding out a sheet of parchment, he asked if the man could replicate the design drawn upon it. The blacksmith, after taking a glance at the paper, admitted that he couldn't read the words, but he understood numbers well enough. He carefully examined the blueprint and noted that the round piece of iron described in the design would weigh approximately 30 kilograms. To ensure its weight, he used a comparison method, stating that the equivalent weight was approximately 3 lids of a Warsaw-style pot. He then sought clarification, asking whether the prince intended to fit the iron onto a pointed pin. Park Kyung-hwa confirmed the assumption without hesitation. Realization dawned upon the blacksmith as he calculated the total load that would be involved in the construction. He asked if 4 of these weights would be placed on each side, his mind racing as he attempted to grasp the full extent of the plan. As soon as he did the math, his eyes widened in shock. If 8 iron plates were to be mounted onto a single bar, then the total weight would reach 240 kilograms. Troy, unbothered by the man's astonishment, stated that, in truth, even greater weights would eventually be necessary. He explained that the bar itself needed to be strong enough to support at least 300 kilograms, ensuring that it could accommodate heavier loads in the future. Reaching into his garments, he retrieved another sheet of paper, handing it over while giving further instructions. The iron plates needed to be wrapped around a bar approximately 3 feet long, creating a stable, load-bearing mechanism. As he considered the level of technical capability available in this era, a new thought struck him. If metalworking techniques had already reached this level, then theoretically, it might be possible to develop firearms in the future. One of the artisans present voiced his belief that His Majesty would surely appreciate such an innovation, recognizing its potential importance. Troy, however, wasn't thinking about praise. Since taking over this body, he had seen a dramatic improvement in the prince's public image, and in moments like these, he understood that his purpose here was to restore order, whether through strength, health, or innovation. Just as he mulled over these thoughts, his gaze landed upon a man standing nearby. Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hwa activated his coach's eye, instantly analyzing the man's physique. His observations yielded impressive results. The man had a well-balanced constitution, featuring broad shoulders, powerful triceps, and resilient back muscles. His trapezius and shoulder muscles were particularly dense, indicating exceptional upper body strength. The man's assessment led him to a conclusion. This man was an illegitimate son, which meant that, by societal rules, he would never be eligible to become an officer. However, that didn't change the fact that he was the ideal candidate for the initial testing of weightlifting techniques. Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hui declared that he wanted this man to become his first student on the path to physical perfection. He promised that if everything went as planned, the man would soon have no rivals in all of Joseon. The man's entire expression changed. A mixture of pride and excitement filled his face as he recognized the unique opportunity being presented to him. Overcome with gratitude, he eagerly asked how he could repay this kindness. Troy merely waved off the notion of repayment, stating that all he needed was trust. However, as he observed the man's enthusiasm, he inwardly thought to himself that this man had no idea what he was getting into. Later, in the Crown Prince's quarters, the royal heir was summoned by Troy. Upon his arrival, the Crown Prince studied him closely, taking note of the noticeable changes in his physique. He acknowledged the improvements, though his expression suggested curiosity about what had prompted this sudden transformation. Troy, ever calm and composed, stated that replacing hunting with innovative training methods had been the key to improving his body. However, he had not come merely to discuss fitness. He had a different purpose for this visit. Reaching into his bag, he presented the Crown Prince with an object, a bar of soap. The Crown Prince examined it carefully before remarking on its unique properties. He acknowledged that it was a miraculous substance that could effectively remove dirt and contamination. However, he pointed out a problem: camellia oil was an expensive ingredient. If soap was simply made with costly oils, then it would be no different from wasting rice on luxury goods. However, he admitted that depending on the manufacturing process, there was potential for it to become economically viable. Taking a brush in hand, the Crown Prince considered the situation carefully before proposing a solution. Park Kyung-hui listened attentively as he suggested a clever strategy to promote the soap's usage without forcing it upon anyone. Park Kyung-hui then proposed a practical way to introduce it, having the Crown Prince himself write a decree stating that he had successfully removed dirt using the soap created by Prince Jinyang. Furthermore, to prevent books and records from being stained, all employees should wash their hands with the soap both in the morning and at night. The Crown Prince, after carefully weighing the suggestion, admitted that the high cost of soap would not prevent people from purchasing it. However, given that the product was new and unfamiliar, people might still hesitate to buy it. Park Kyung-hui asked if he intended to force employees to use it, but the Crown Prince immediately dismissed the idea. Instead, he argued that it would be far more effective to subtly emphasize its benefits so that people would naturally want to use it on their own. Troy recognized the strategy immediately. It was akin to modern free samples. If people tried the soap and experienced its advantages firsthand, demand would naturally increase over time. The Crown Prince further elaborated that widespread distribution would be easier if private negotiations began first. Once soap became a common necessity, a tax could be introduced on its sale, creating a new source of income for the kingdom. Troy couldn't help but admire the brilliance of the idea. He realized that this was exactly why the Crown Prince was the firstborn son of the great Sejong and the future King Munjong. Meanwhile, back at the blacksmith's hut, tension filled the air as a heated discussion unfolded among the workers. One of the blacksmiths, visibly concerned, asked his colleagues if they were absolutely certain that Great Prince Jinyang had ordered the items they were working on. The men confirmed the order, but their anxious expressions betrayed their unease. One of them sternly reminded the group that they knew what would happen if mistakes were made. The consequences of failure were not to be taken lightly. As they continued their work, one of the blacksmiths wished their lord a safe journey, hinting at uncertainty regarding the prince's future actions. Another blacksmith, however, was far more concerned about the economic impact of their orders. He urgently declared that the items requested by Great General Jinyang needed to be melted down and destroyed immediately. However, a fellow worker vehemently opposed the idea, warning that the deadlines were fast approaching and that failing to deliver the requested items would result in colossal financial losses. Despite their hesitation and disagreements, one thing was clear: the actions of Prince Jinyang were beginning to shake the foundations of the status quo, and the full consequences had yet to unfold. The blacksmith's hut remained tense as the workers debated among themselves. One of them, deeply troubled by the situation, posed a crucial question to his colleague: was money more valuable than life itself? If he truly believed so, then he was free to proceed with the order. But he should remember that none of them truly understood the prince's intentions in forging these iron bars. The uncertainty of their task weighed heavily upon them, for they knew the risks of working against the royal family. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the village, a group of wandering men continued their quiet observation, their conversations increasingly centered around the second prince. It had become widely known that Prince Jinyang was not in line for succession, yet despite that, he had been expending vast resources on acquiring iron for an extended period of time. In addition to his seemingly obsessive focus on physical training, It appeared that the prince was finally revealing his true nature to the public. Whispers circulated among the people, speculating on what his ultimate goal could possibly be. As the discussion unfolded, one of the men brought up an entirely different topic, mentioning something extraordinary he had witnessed earlier that day. He recounted how he had been washing his hands using a new product called soap, and to his amazement, it had completely removed the ink stains from his fingers. Even the oils on his face had been effortlessly cleansed away. The man marveled at the product's effectiveness, calling it a miraculous substance unlike anything he had ever encountered before. The others, hearing this, immediately became intrigued, questioning who could have possibly come up with such an innovation. One of them assumed it must have been the crown prince, but another quickly corrected him, pointing out that the credit actually belonged to Prince Jinyang. However, many in the group found that hard to believe, still unable to accept the idea that a prince previously known for his weakness and lack of ambition could be responsible for something so groundbreaking. Back at the training grounds, Park Kyung-hoi was in the middle of his intense workout, pushing his body through a flat bench press. His servant stood nearby, carefully spotting him as he completed each repetition, his focus unwavering. By the time he reached his 9th repetition, he took a brief pause, evaluating his progress. In his thoughts, he acknowledged that he had already built up the strength to bench press 45 kilograms for 10 repetitions, a milestone that demonstrated his growing power. As he set the weights aside, his servant, clearly impressed, praised him for his skill and strength in mastering the exercise. However, rather than basking in the praise, Park Kyung-hoi immediately launched into a motivational speech, reinforcing the importance of discipline, dedication, and perseverance. He reminisced about the rusty dumbbells from a neighborhood gym he had once frequented, thinking about how even the simplest weights could bring massive benefits when used correctly. However, despite his progress in strength training, Park Kyung-hoi had also been dealing with unexpected setbacks. The production of his equipment had been plagued with difficulties. The blacksmith responsible for forging the remaining tools had, rather unexpectedly, refunded the money, citing unforeseen complications in the manufacturing process. The delays had led to missed deadlines, and even worse, the design itself had been altered, failing to meet the man's exact specifications. Rather than dwell on his frustration, however, he turned his attention to his servant, declaring that it was now his turn to train. The servant immediately protested, visibly horrified at the idea of lifting such an enormous weight. He adamantly insisted that attempting such a lift would crush him to death, but Park Kyung-hoi was not interested in debating the matter. With an intense, almost terrifying expression, he commanded his servant to comply, arguing that his body needed to be stimulated if he was to grow stronger. Despite his obvious reluctance, the servant obeyed, though he struggled tremendously under the weight of the barbell, his face contorted with effort. Troy, ever the instructor, provided training tips, offering guidance as the servant fought to maintain control of the lift. As this scene unfolded, the man's wife approached, her eyes carefully analyzing his transformed physique. In her thoughts, she could not believe the change that had occurred in his body. Once frail and skinny, he now radiated strength, his form exuding power in a way that had once seemed unimaginable. Her servant, standing beside her, compared him to General Wu Ban, a legendary military leader. Hearing this, Troy, momentarily distracted from his exercise, turned to ask whether this comparison was true. He had heard of General Wu Ban before, a man who, from a young age, had shown exceptional talent in military command. The thought intrigued him, leading him to contemplate whether a similar training system could be implemented within the military ranks. In that moment, he wondered if a tax for military training could be introduced, making systematic fitness regimens an integral part of soldier development. Before he could pursue that line of thought further, a loud noise suddenly echoed from the front gate, drawing everyone's attention. The man's sharp instincts immediately activated, and he wondered who could possibly have the audacity to enter his property so brazenly. As he turned toward the disturbance, his gaze darkened. The wanderers from before had arrived, their expressions serious and unyielding. Without hesitation, they strode toward the prince, their movements filled with purpose and tension. His wife, visibly unsettled, immediately questioned what was happening. She stepped forward, addressing the group and reminding them that they were standing on Prince Jinyang's property. Her words were met with hostility, as one of the men, his demeanor intimidating, coldly confirmed that they were fully aware of whose land they were standing on. Turning his piercing gaze toward her, he commanded her to remain silent, stating that, as the prince's wife, she ought to have the courtesy to know her place. At that moment, Park Kyung-hoi stepped forward, his expression dark with anger. Without hesitation, he struck the arrogant man, sending him crashing to the ground. Shocked and humiliated, the fallen man stared up in disbelief, unable to comprehend how he had been knocked down so easily. Park Kyung-hoi glared down at him, warning him in no uncertain terms not to lay a hand on his wife. The tension in the air thickened as the remaining warriors instinctively reached for their swords, their hands gripping their hilts in preparation to draw their weapons. However, before the situation could escalate further, their leader intervened, calming them down with a raised hand. With a composed expression, he introduced himself and expressed his pleasure at meeting the prince again, recalling their encounter during last year's hunting tournament. Troy, still radiating authority, demanded an explanation for their presence. His tone carried an unspoken warning: if they dared to harm his men, there would be dire consequences. One of the samurai warriors suddenly shouted, accusing the prince of forgetting his past mistakes. The leader then held up an object, revealing it to be a tool capable of producing 20 swords. He questioned the man's true intentions, pointing out that he had now ordered the production of 400 swords. To further solidify their accusations, they revealed a hostage, the very man Park Kyung-hwa had helped before. Bound and restrained, the man looked up at Park Kyung-hwa helplessly, his fate now resting in the prince's hands. The leader of the group continued his accusations, stating that 7 months ago, no one had any interest in Prince Jinyang, but now, suddenly, he had begun helping the poor and distributing food. He demanded to know if this was part of a greater plan for rebellion. Troy, remaining composed, dismissed the claims as mere assumptions, arguing that their actions were baseless and that calling in soldiers without proof was an abuse of power. However, the leader was unmoved. He declared that there was no need for solid proof, as gossip spread quickly and that, in the end, all secrets would be revealed. He then issued a final warning, stating that they would begin interrogating everyone around the prince, certain that the truth would come to light no matter the cost. Troy took a moment to analyze the situation, realizing that detention and interrogation were now real possibilities. No matter how much he proclaimed his innocence, it was clear that these men wouldn't back down easily. This was a classic investigation conducted by the EMD, and in such cases, even the most well-intentioned individuals could be pushed into a corner if they failed to defend themselves convincingly. He hadn't done anything wrong since taking over the prince's body, yet he had no knowledge of what political intrigues had surrounded Prince Jinyang before his arrival. That alone made him vulnerable to accusations and manipulation. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself, knowing that he needed to formulate a strategy quickly. The question now was, what was his next move? Before he could decide, the tension was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected figure. A powerful voice cut through the air, demanding to know what was happening. The man's eyes widened in surprise as he turned to see none other than his brother, the Crown Prince, standing before them. The weight of the moment settled upon the group, the already tense atmosphere growing even heavier. The Crown Prince wasted no time addressing the situation. He explained that he had come personally because the rumors about Park Kyung-hwa had spread far and wide. People had been speaking about his strange actions, and now it had reached a point where he needed to step in directly. However, rather than outright condemning him, he stated that he was still willing to give Park Kyung-hwa a chance to explain himself. After all, from his perspective, Park Kyung-hwa had claimed to have found a method to strengthen his body, but to outsiders, it had appeared irrational and suspicious. The samurai accompanying the investigation were far less understanding. They immediately warned the Crown Prince to stay away, insisting that Prince Jinyang had gone mad. However, the heir to the throne dismissed their words sharply, rebuking them for their disrespect. He firmly told them to choose their words more carefully, stating that his brother was no madman. Though discontent existed everywhere, and people often opposed those who used wealth for personal purposes, hasty accusations were dangerous. He admitted that getting rid of these rumors wouldn't be easy, but he would at least give his brother a chance to defend himself properly. That being said, he made it clear if the accusations turned out to be false, Park Kyung-hwa would not escape so easily. A claim like this could not be dismissed without strong evidence. The Crown Prince also issued a warning to the samurai chief, stating that if he accused his own brother without proof, there would be serious consequences. The samurai leader, however, remained unshaken, believing that his judgment was correct and that an interrogation was the only right course of action. At that moment, Park Kyung-hwa took action. Gripping a heavy iron bar, he pounded it into the ground, commanding attention. He declared that he needed assistance and ordered his servant to bring a specific book. As soon as the book was retrieved, he presented it to the Crown Prince, stating that the purpose behind all his efforts was written clearly within its pages. His goal was not rebellion, but the development of education on healthy living. He urged his brother to read it carefully, emphasizing that the philosophy behind it was deeply logical and based on real observations. The Crown Prince opened the book, flipping through the pages and reading its contents with a skeptical but intrigued expression. He admitted that the ideas within it made sense, yet he still struggled to understand why such a vast amount of resources had been dedicated to the development of a healing method. Why was so much iron, so much time, and so much effort being poured into this pursuit? Troy took a step forward, lowering his voice as he leaned toward his brother's ear. He reminded him that they both knew their father's health was worsening. Though others may not see it, the great King Sejong was growing weaker each day. The crown prince remained unconvinced, arguing that their father only suffered from presbyopia, a common symptom of aging. There was no need for excessive concern. He even suggested that if Park Kyung-shui had any real knowledge of medicine, he should clarify his suspicions directly instead of causing unnecessary alarm. Troy, however, stood firm in his conviction. He explained that recently, King Sejong had developed an unusual fever. Despite the cold weather, the king was sweating excessively, and his energy levels were declining at an unnatural rate. Though he didn't want to jump to conclusions, he strongly suspected that their father was suffering from diabetes. His reasoning was simple. He believed that the king's health condition was rooted in an excess of yang energy. Since His Majesty frequently indulged in large meals yet never engaged in physical activities, his energy balance had become severely disrupted. As a result, the excessive yang energy had nowhere to go, manifesting in diseases that were affecting his body, starting with his vision. The crown prince listened carefully, though his expression remained serious. After a moment, he questioned whether the man's assistance to the poor was also connected to their father's health. Park Kyung-hui nodded without hesitation, asserting that his research was entirely dedicated to solving these issues. Every detail regarding nutrition, exercise, and bodily health had been recorded within his book, and his ultimate goal was to use that knowledge to convince their father of its validity. At last, the crown prince made his decision. Raising his voice, he declared that from what he had heard, Prince Jinyang was innocent. However, the samurai chief remained unmoved. He stated bluntly that the crown prince's words were not enough to resolve the matter. He argued that investigating and conducting trials was his duty, and that His Majesty would not be pleased if his legal authority was challenged. He pointed out that competent inspectors from various ranks had already been gathered, meaning that this case was no longer a private dispute between brothers. The samurai chief then addressed the crown prince directly, posing a challenge. Was he truly willing to ignore his duty for the sake of family ties? As the future king, he had to demonstrate his fairness and uphold the country's laws. He reminded the prince that covering up for someone just because they were family was not an act of justice, but one of bias and favoritism. The tension reached its peak. Realizing that there was no peaceful way out, the crown prince turned to Troy, commanding him to explain everything about his purchases and activities. Since this had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding, the only way forward was for Park Kyung-hui to prove himself. Troy took a deep breath, accepting the challenge. He boldly declared that he would demonstrate the truth with his own strength. He explained that in their father's body, yang energy had accumulated, disrupting his health and weakening his vision. However, he firmly believed that by strengthening the body, these diseases could be reversed. He concluded by pointing out something everyone already knew. His Majesty never hesitated to push himself physically when necessary. He was a man of action, and once he understood that exercise and physical conditioning could heal his body, he would embrace it without hesitation. Now, all Park Kyung-hwi had to do was prove it. Troy knew that mere explanations wouldn't be enough to convince his father or silence his accusers. The chief samurai and the inspectors were determined to paint him as a rebel, and even his brother, the crown prince, while supportive, needed strong evidence to justify standing by his side. Words alone wouldn't suffice, but demonstrating unprecedented strength might. If they could witness a level of power beyond what they had ever seen, something on par with the legendary feats of Yamu, then perhaps even the most skeptical onlookers would reconsider their doubts. Troy understood that his father was a man of logic, but he was also someone who respected tangible results. If he failed to convince these warriors today, then he had no chance of convincing the king in the future. The crown prince, sensing this, seized control of the conversation. He turned to the assembled samurai and officials, explaining that Prince Jinyang had been developing healing methods for the people, and the equipment and training tools he had created were all part of this effort. He posed a challenge to the inspectors. If they were so certain that this was an act of rebellion, then why not allow the young prince to demonstrate his abilities? If he could prove that his intentions were pure and that his training had merit, then perhaps the accusations against him would no longer hold weight. The chief samurai, however, remained unconvinced. His sharp eyes studied the equipment before him, focusing on a solid piece of iron that was heavier than even a sturdy war pot. He questioned whether it was truly possible that this was being used for physical training rather than for arming an underground militia. The crown prince, realizing that debate alone wouldn't resolve the issue, made a suggestion. Perhaps the best way to settle things was through a test of strength. If the soldiers were so certain that Park Kyung-hui was lying, then why not have someone challenge him to a feat of physical ability? One of the samurai warriors immediately stepped forward, declaring that he would put Park Kyung-hui to the test. He was renowned for his raw strength, and if the prince lost, it would be clear that he had been deceiving them all along. Troy accepted the challenge without hesitation. He stretched, preparing his muscles for the strain ahead, while explaining the fundamentals of the bench press to the assembled warriors. Many of them had never seen such an exercise before, and to them, the concept itself seemed foreign. The challenger, however, was unimpressed. He dismissed it as a mere matter of strength and questioned whether the prince was secretly afraid of losing. Taking his position on the bench, the soldier inhaled deeply, gripping the barbell with both hands. As he lifted, he immediately realized that it was heavier than expected. He had assumed that this would be an easy test of brute force, but the level of controlled movement required made it far more difficult than he had anticipated. Determined not to embarrass himself, he summoned all his strength, managing to complete one full repetition. His spotter watched intently, waiting to see what would happen next. All eyes turned to Troy, who was still in the middle of his movement. A moment later, the challenger smirked, assuming that the prince was struggling to lift the weight. He took the opportunity to mock Troy, claiming that he had only pretended to be strong, but was now shedding tears under the pressure. Then, the room fell silent. One by one, everyone's expressions shifted as they realized that something incredible was happening. Park Kyung-hwa wasn't struggling at all. He was performing repetitions with ease, not just 1 or 2, but 10. As he finished his set flawlessly, his servant gasped in amazement, declaring that the display of strength was beyond belief. The samurai challenger, still trying to process what had happened, struggled to accept that he had lost a competition of raw power. Troy, meanwhile, took a moment to educate his audience, explaining that in physical fitness training, the number of repetitions depended on the training goal. He confidently stated that he could bench press up to 105 kilograms at once, a claim that left everyone in stunned disbelief. The chief inspector, realizing that they had no grounds to detain the prince, announced their withdrawal for the day. However, he was quick to clarify that this did not mean the prince was completely free of suspicion. The investigation would continue, and his role as an inspector demanded that he pursue the truth with all his effort. Troy, maintaining a composed and confident expression, stated that he would do the same. Regardless of what the inspectors believed, he had managed to escape immediate danger and, more importantly, his older brother was now aware of their father's deteriorating health. The crown prince, satisfied with the resolution of the confrontation, declared his departure, advising Park Kyung-hwa to take care. As he turned to leave, Park Kyung-hwa recalled that his brother had promised to assist with the writing of his book, and in the end, everything had worked out favorably. With the situation settled, Park Kyung-hwa turned his attention to his wife, offering an apology for the ordeal she had just witnessed. However, to his surprise, she expressed embarrassment, admitting that she had failed to recognize his good intentions earlier. As a show of reassurance, Park Kyung-hwa embraced her, a gesture that left her completely flustered. In front of the assembled warriors, servants, and bystanders, she quickly objected, stating that such intimate gestures should be reserved for their private chambers, making Park Kyung-hwa blush in embarrassment as well. Meanwhile, among the inspection group, one of the officers apologized for their misunderstanding and interference. However, the chief samurai remained skeptical. He pointed out that, while they had failed to expose any immediate evidence of wrongdoing, they had still gathered valuable information. Among the many iron devices Prince Jinyoung had commissioned, one item in particular stood out: an unusually thin and hollow object resembling a chongtong, an early form of a cannon. His suspicions deepened as he voiced his thoughts aloud. Was Prince Jinyoung attempting to improve upon the chongtong, developing a new kind of firearm? He recalled the previous year's hunting contest, where he had witnessed the prince's cunning firsthand, and he could not ignore the possibility that a greater scheme was at play. The idea that Prince Jinyoung's supposed Secretary of Corporal Constitution was merely a front for something more sinister was, to him, laughable. He found it ridiculous to think that this was all simply an act of pity. The truth, he believed, had yet to be fully uncovered, and so, with narrowed eyes, he vowed to continue watching the man's every move. For Prince Jinyoung, however, life carried on as usual. Days passed, and soon after, news arrived that the forge had resumed the production of his requested equipment. Then, 3 months later, a momentous announcement came. His wife approached him, her expression both nervous and excited. She had visited the doctor and she was pregnant. Park Kyung-hwa stood in utter shock, barely able to process the news. She confessed that she believed she had conceived on that day, referring to a particular intimate moment from the past. A memory from his previous life surfaced: a conversation with a friend at the bar, a man who had dismissed the importance of exercise, claiming that he simply didn't have the time to work out. Park Kyung-hwa had tried to convince him otherwise, arguing that his life would change if he exercised. His friend had scoffed, calling it nonsense, dismissing the man's words because he was single and had never even been married by the age of 40. But now, Park Kyung-hwa wasn't just a husband, he had 2 wives and a child on the way. His mind drifted momentarily to the barbell and dumbbells that had shaped his life, and for the first time in both of his lives, he found himself laughing, realizing just how unexpected and strange his journey had become. A few days ago, Park Kyung-hwa had been nothing more than an outsider in this world, a man thrown into the Joseon era by circumstances beyond his understanding. But now, standing in front of his wife, his hands firmly gripping her waist, he was about to become a father. The weight of the revelation struck him all at once, not as a burden, but as an overwhelming wave of happiness. He lifted her effortlessly, his voice filled with joy as he questioned the information, almost as if seeking confirmation once more. His wife, flushed from his sudden enthusiasm, laughed softly, assuring him that it was true. The thought of welcoming a child into this world filled him with a sense of purpose unlike anything he had ever experienced. With a bright smile, Park Kyung-hwa suggested that they should inform His Majesty of this incredible news. His wife, seeing the pure happiness radiating from him, expressed how much pleasure it brought her to see him like this. But beyond that, she felt a newfound determination. If she was to give birth to a healthy child, she wanted to ensure that her body was in its best condition. Looking at her husband, she firmly declared her desire to train in the Secretary of Corporal Construction, the very philosophy he had been developing. Understanding the importance of preparing her body for childbirth, Park Kyung-hwa immediately began guiding her through a simple routine. The first step was proper posture, instructing her to inhale and exhale deeply, allowing her body to adjust to the rhythm of controlled breathing. However, even as he taught her these fundamentals, his mind lingered on a grim reality. Stretching alone would not be enough. Childbirth in this era was dangerous, and without proper hygiene or medical knowledge, maternal mortality was frighteningly common. He recalled the tragic fate of the crown princess, who had died of pleural fever after giving birth. The loss of both mother and child due to infection and lack of medical understanding was a reality that still haunted history. But now, standing at the forefront of change, he believed he could prevent such tragedies. If he could develop a reliable disinfectant, he could save countless lives. Just as he was deep in thought, a servant arrived, informing them that they had a guest. When Park Kyung-hwa turned to see who had come, he recognized an older man standing before him, a curious expression on his face. The visitor wasted no time in questioning him, asking if he truly considered the liquid he had created to be soju. With a knowing smile, the elder admitted that he had never imagined that distilled liquor could be produced in such a manner. Troy, fully aware of the true purpose of his invention, confidently asserted that the design had been developed by him. Unlike the traditional methods of alcohol production, he had specifically engineered this thin and elongated part of the distillation process to extract pure alcohol. But his goal wasn't to create liquor for consumption. His objective was far greater. The second prince, who had also been observing the exchange, ordered that all the soju inside the house be gathered for testing. With the distillation process finally complete, Park Kyung-hwa knew that his next step was to verify the purity of the alcohol. He carefully arranged 2 glasses of equal weight, one of them filled with water up to 80%. He explained to those watching that the relative density of alcohol was 0.8, meaning that if the filtered alcohol was heavier or lighter than water, then the experiment had failed. As he carefully adjusted the weights on the scale, anticipation filled the room. If this worked, disinfectant production in Joseon would be revolutionized. Slowly but surely, the 2 bodies balanced a perfect equilibrium. Seeing this, the man's lips curved into a triumphant smile. The experiment had been a complete success. Time passed, and with each day, Park Kyung-hwa became more deeply integrated into the Joseon era. At first, he had believed that if he trained hard enough, he might return to the modern world, but it was now clear that this was only a delusion. Though he still wondered about the life he had left behind, his priorities had shifted. His child was soon to be born, and with that, his entire world had changed. Inside the royal palace, whispers of his achievements spread like wildfire. Prince Jinyang had not only developed a successful disinfectant, but he had also distributed soap among the people, significantly enriching the royal treasury. When King Sejong heard of this, he was deeply impressed, recognizing that his son had grown into a man of wisdom and maturity. In recognition of his contributions to public health, Sujun, one of the royal officials, rewarded Park Kyung-hwa with 200 silver nyangs. However, despite the praise and compensation, Park Kyung-hwa remained humble, insisting that he still had much to learn. Shortly after, news of his wife's smooth recovery after childbirth became another testament to the effectiveness of the disinfectant. She had returned to her normal routine in just a week, a stark contrast to the long and dangerous recovery period that most women endured. Seeing this, King Sejong issued a royal decree, mandating that the disinfectant be used for the treatment of all mothers and newborns in Joseon. It was a historic moment, one that solidified the man's role in shaping the future of medicine. Yet, even as the king celebrated his son's accomplishments, something was gravely wrong. As he gazed at Park Kyung-hui with pride, his eyes gradually closed and within moments he collapsed before his court. The room descended into chaos as officials and servants rushed to his side, calling desperately for a doctor. The date was March 14, 1438, and King Sejong's health had suddenly worsened. Though the crown prince reassured everyone that the king had recovered quickly, the unease in the palace remained. When asked about his condition, the king admitted that his thirst had become unbearable, forcing him to consume large amounts of water. His vision had deteriorated significantly, and despite taking medicinal decoctions, nothing had improved. Troy, upon hearing these symptoms, immediately recognized the pattern. Turning to his brother, he asked if their father had ever mentioned seeing fog or insects that weren't there a common symptom of advanced diabetes. His brother, however, shook his head, stating that while the king had never described such symptoms, he had expressed frustration at not being able to see things from a distance. Troy, relieved that the condition hadn't yet reached its worst stage, concluded that for now, the situation was manageable. However, he knew that they could not afford to be complacent without intervention. The king's condition would deteriorate rapidly. Remembering that his mother's birthday was in September, Park Kyung-hui saw an opportunity. He declared that on that day, he would change his father's mind. His brother, growing increasingly suspicious, questioned what exactly he was planning to do at a royal banquet. Troy, ever the strategist, calmly explained that within the Secretary of Corporal Construction, there were 3 primary exercises that utilized heavy weights: the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. These exercises were known as the Big Three, forming the foundation of strength training, and at the royal banquet, Park Kyung-hui planned to use them to make history. Troy had set an ambitious goal, a total of 375 kilograms across 3 exercises at the royal banquet. This wasn't just about proving his strength. It was about convincing his father, King Sejong, to take his health seriously and embrace the philosophy of physical training. However, his brother, the crown prince, was skeptical. He pointed out that the palace guards, who had undergone years of rigorous military training, had been ordered to attempt 225 kilograms, and none of them had succeeded. If trained warriors couldn't achieve such a feat, how could Park Kyung-hui possibly expect to surpass them? Troy, however, remained determined. He admitted that at this moment he was not yet strong enough to achieve 375 kilograms, but he was certain that he would reach that level. This wasn't just about physical strength, it was about his will. He vowed that he would succeed not for his own glory, but for the sake of their father. Hearing this unshakable resolve, the crown prince nodded. If his brother's will was this strong, then he would do everything in his power to support him. Troy, in turn, shared another goal. He wanted to create a book that their father would take pride in. His brother, however, had one condition. If Park Kyung-hui truly intended to write a book, then he had to incorporate the contents of all 13 Confucian classics into it. Park Kyung-hui tried to maintain his composure, but internally he was panicking. The 13 classics were the backbone of Confucian philosophy, an essential part of royal education. Writing a book that included their teachings was a monumental task, one that scholars spent years mastering. But this was for the sake of King Sejong, and failure was not an option. So, gritting his teeth, he declared that his brother could count on him. They made a deal. Once Park Kyung-hui reached 375 kilograms in the Big Three, they would present the book to their father, ensuring that he not only read it, but followed its teachings. As they argued for the well-being of the king, Park Kyung-hui came to a terrifying realization: he was about to take on something completely insane. Increasing weightlifting strength by a few kilograms over 6 months was difficult enough, but pushing his limit by this much bordered on the impossible. Even if he succeeded, his current physique loaded with excess fat wouldn't be convincing enough. If he wanted to showcase his muscles in their full glory, he needed to cut down at least 3 kilograms of fat. The best and most accessible way to burn calories in this era? Walking. He hoped that his body's unlimited potential would prove useful as he embarked on one of the most intense training regimens of his life. At home, he sat among stacks of books, diligently reading the Confucian texts his brother had assigned him, all while pondering the exhausting routine he had set for himself. The combination of weight training, running, climbing, and now scholarly studies was draining him faster than he had anticipated. At times, he found himself contemplating giving up, but then in his mind he imagined his brother's disappointed face. That alone was enough to push him forward. He couldn't complain, not now. One evening, as he sat down to eat, his wife approached him, asking if his meal was acceptable. She explained that oatmeal was traditionally eaten to fill the stomach, but Park Kyung-hui remained focused on his ultimate goal. He reaffirmed that he had to prove himself at his mother's birthday banquet, and as he thought about his extra fat, he muttered that he would eat only until his filial piety was proven. His wife sighed, unable to fully understand her husband's relentless ambition. Concerned that his meal might be too bland, she added some seasoning to his porridge. However, out of respect for his dedication, she quickly ordered the servants to remove the seasoned bowl and bring a new one that had no added flavoring. She instructed them never to add seasoning to her beloved husband's food ever again. Troy, struggling through another meal of flavorless porridge, quietly shed tears. His routine became merciless, running through the forests, endless deadlift training, climbing, and hours of studying. One day, as he reached the top of a mountain, he took a deep breath, realizing how quickly time had passed. The day of Queen Soyeon's birthday banquet had finally arrived. As the celebrations began, a performer took center stage, balancing on a moving horse as part of the festivities. The queen, clearly delighted, praised the man's incredible riding talent. Even the king, despite his current state of deteriorating health, seemed to enjoy the performance. However, beneath his smile, there was an undeniable sadness in his eyes. His vision was failing, and the weight of his condition was slowly consuming him. Then, the crown prince turned to Troy. It was his turn. The guests whispered among themselves, many assuming that the man's performance would be like those of street performers, a trivial act of entertainment. However, as Park Kyung-hwa prepared to step forward, he turned to his brother one last time, asking if he had mentioned the book. The crown prince sighed. When he had told the queen that Park Kyung-sui could lift 112 kilograms, she refused to believe it. That was why he had no choice but to allow Park Kyung-hwa to proceed with the plan, because if their father witnessed this firsthand, he would have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Troy then stepped onto the stage, his demeanor serious, his body coiled with strength. Facing the royal family, he squatted deeply and, with deep reverence, congratulated his mother on her birthday. He expressed his gratitude, stating that his very existence in this world was thanks to the divine kindness of the king and queen. With that in mind, he had dedicated himself to creating the Secretary of Corporal Construction, a discipline that focused on self-enlightenment through physical development. The king, observing the massive iron object behind Troy, furrowed his brows. He questioned what exactly his son was trying to show. What was the purpose of this demonstration? Troy smiled, stating that he had prepared something small as a token of gratitude for his parents. As he gripped the bar, he felt a flood of emotions surge through him. He had trained relentlessly for this moment, pushing himself beyond his physical limits. Now, he would show the entire court what it meant to truly forge one's body through discipline. With a swift motion, he removed his cloak, revealing his exceptionally muscular physique. Gasps echoed across the banquet hall. Soldiers, nobles, and scholars alike stared in absolute disbelief, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. Never before had they seen a body like this. Whispers spread among the shocked onlookers. Was this really Prince Jinyang? Was this the same man they had once mocked as weak and aimless? Troy, standing tall, looked out across the sea of stunned faces. Then, with steady resolve, he laid down on the bench press. The entire palace fell silent as he wrapped his hands around the bar. And then, with unshakable determination, he began the first repetition. Once again, Park Kyung-hwa defied all expectations. His bench press continued, rep after rep, while the onlookers stood frozen in disbelief. Each repetition solidified his control over the weight, his movements precise and unshaken. The soldiers watching were baffled. They had undergone rigorous military training, yet they couldn't fathom how the second prince, a man they once dismissed, had obtained such monstrous strength. With a final controlled press, Park Kyung-hwa finished his set successfully. As he racked the bar, the silence was deafening. Then, standing before the royal family, he confidently explained. One of the fundamental activities in his book was this exercise called the bench press. Through it, one could train the chest, shoulders, and arms, strengthening the upper body in ways unseen in this era. His mother, Queen Soyeon, applauded, though her confusion remained evident. She admitted that she didn't fully understand what she had just witnessed and asked how much weight he had just lifted. Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hwa broke it down. The bar itself weighed 24 kilograms, and the cylindrical iron plates, stacked on either side, weighed a total of 144 kilograms. In total, the weight amounted to 168 kilograms. The entire court gasped in shock. Even the king, though already impressed, felt a surge of disbelief at the sheer magnitude of the feat. However, Park Kyung wasn't done. Stepping forward, he introduced his next exercise, the squat. He explained that this exercise involved placing a barbell on the shoulders and using the leg's strength to repeatedly lower and raise the body. It was not only a test of endurance and power, but it also trained the legs, glutes, waist, and lower abdomen, a true full-body challenge. His mother, however, panicked. She stood up abruptly, demanding that her son stop at once. But Park Kyung-hui ignored her. He had come this far, and he was determined to showcase the full extent of his discipline. The crown prince merely watched in silence, letting his younger brother continue his historic display of strength. Troy stepped up to the barbell, which had been loaded with 204 kilograms, resting it on his trapezius using the low bar technique. He took a deep breath, steadied his stance, and descended into the squat. The moment he pushed back up, the entire room gasped in awe. The queen's eyes widened. Her son had not only stood up with the enormous weight but had done so with perfect control. The king, shaken, immediately called for a doctor. He questioned if such strength was even humanly possible, but even his servants and scholars couldn't answer him. The only certainty was that this spectacle was unlike anything ever seen before. The concept of healthy discipline, the foundation of the man's book, was now on full display for all to witness. However, Park Kyung-hui wasn't finished yet. With an unwavering voice, he introduced the final test, the deadlift. For this, the largest iron bar had been prepared, loaded with an astonishing 240 kilograms. The room erupted into chaos as the guests murmured among themselves. At this moment, the crown prince decided to intervene. He turned to his father and expressed his concern. What if the man's waist suffered an injury? With the king's permission, he approached Park Kyung-hui and took precautionary measures, wrapping a supportive belt tightly around his brother's core. For a brief moment, the two brothers locked eyes. Both understood the weight of what was about to happen. Park Kyung-hui then turned toward his parents, addressing them with sincerity. He declared that since they had granted him this body, he would continue to care for it properly and fulfill his duties as their son. Among the inspection members, murmurs of doubt and skepticism continued. Some were convinced that Park Kyung-hui had lost his mind, that no human could achieve such feats. But Park Kyung-hui knew the truth. He could have lifted even more if his body were fully conditioned, but with his current state, this weight was already pushing his limits. Although the belt provided some support, the plan to reach 375 kilograms in the Big Three within 2 years was still completely insane. Yet, he had no choice. He had to prove that the human body could be strengthened to such extremes. He decided to use the sumo deadlift technique, widening his stance to maximize power output. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the iron bar, bracing his entire body. And then, he pulled. The entire hall fell silent. Slowly but surely, the massive iron bar rose from the ground. The onlookers' eyes widened in disbelief. Was this truly possible? Could a single man lift something this massive? Park Kyung-hui felt his hands begin to tear, his skin splitting open from the sheer friction and pressure of the iron. Blood dripped from his palms, yet he refused to let go. With one final effort, he locked out the lift, standing tall with the weight fully raised. Then, with one last breath, he let the bar drop. The impact was so powerful that the ground cracked beneath it, sending shockwaves across the hall. Gasps and shouts erupted, as the nobles, warriors, and scholars struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The queen, unable to handle the stress, felt her blood pressure drop, her face turning pale. Meanwhile, the king sat speechless, his mind racing. Then, to everyone's surprise, the queen stood up. With a serious expression, she approached her son, her footsteps slow yet filled with emotion. Even the king was confused by her actions. When she reached Troy, she gently took his hands, examining the deep cuts left behind from the deadlift. Tears streamed down her face. She spoke softly yet firmly, asking what he meant by this so-called filial piety. She had watched him for 2 years, seen the way he trained his body relentlessly, and witnessed the toll it had taken on him. Now, standing before him, she could no longer hold back her emotions. The women in the court, upon seeing the queen's tears, began to cry as well. One of the martial arts experts in attendance murmured to himself he had seen many warriors before, but never had he seen someone with such well-defined musculature. The sheer structure of the man's abdomen, the way his entire physique stood out, was beyond anything he had imagined possible. Then the king spoke. He acknowledged that Park Kyung-hui had shown great discipline and resilience. He even admitted that he himself had tested the training regimen from the book and found it to be legitimate and beneficial. However, he had one final question. What exactly was the ultimate purpose of this healthy discipline Park Kyung-hui had presented before them? Troy, still breathing heavily, stood before his parents with unwavering conviction. He bowed deeply, then raised his bloodied hands in front of them. It is to establish and perfectly prepare the body you both granted me. The king, now fully engaged in the discussion, questioned whether lifting such immense weights was meant to be the standard for everyone practicing this new discipline. He feared that, if that were the case, his instructions on promoting this method might end up harming the weaker individuals rather than helping them. Troy immediately dispelled the misconception, explaining that strength training wasn't about lifting extreme weights from the start. He shared that he had initially embarked on this journey just to shed the excess fat in his abdomen, and his strength had naturally increased in the process. He revealed that in just 3 months, his movements had become smoother and his daily fatigue had disappeared. His body had adjusted naturally as a result of the discipline, making it clear that this was something anyone could benefit from, not just those aiming for great feats of strength. Recognizing his son's efforts, King Sejong turned his gaze toward the crown prince, acknowledging that both he and Park Kyung-hwa had authored books on this topic. He stated that he would read through them carefully, distinguishing right from wrong, and afterward, they would discuss the corporal construction secretary within the palace. The news filled Park Kyung-hwa with excitement. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. However, the king didn't stop there. With a thoughtful expression, he asserted that the royal title of Grand Prince Jinyang no longer seemed sufficient. Not only had Park Kyung-hwa created an entirely new discipline, but he had also perfected it and demonstrated its benefits with undeniable proof. In recognition of this, he suggested adding Su from Seongbu to his title, making his new official name Grand Prince Swang. Later that evening, in the privacy of his chambers, King Sejong sat down with the book and quickly realized that this was no ordinary manuscript. As he flipped through the pages, he couldn't help but marvel at how well structured and deeply researched it was. Despite knowing that Park Kyung-hwa had received some help, he couldn't shake the feeling that his son's intelligence had somehow evolved beyond what he had previously believed possible. Sitting across from him, the crown prince admitted that he had also read the book and found himself amazed. He explained that Park Kyung-hwa had simply compiled a training regimen that their father himself had already begun using. Unlike most books, this one included diagrams and practical applications, making it clear and accessible even for those unfamiliar with the concepts. The king's curiosity deepened as he reached the end of Volume 1, where a specific diagram had been placed, a diagram detailing the effects of dietary habits on human development. He read about the observations Park Kyung-hwa had recorded regarding children's physical growth and nutritional intake. The text explained that cooking rice with 6 kilograms of grain could sustain an adult for 10 days, while children, despite their smaller size, could eat twice as much in the same period due to their rapid metabolism. On the opposite side of the spectrum, excessive food consumption led to excessive fat storage, with as little as a spoonful of sesame oil daily being enough to fuel significant strength development in youth. One particular line caught the king's attention. A person with a full stomach gains over 300 grams of excess fat per month. Reading those words, King Sejong instinctively looked down at his own belly, his fingers pressing against the soft flesh beneath his robes. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the palace, Park Kyung-hwa sat with the crown prince, eagerly asking about their father's reaction to the book. The crown prince relayed the news the king had decided to give the corporal construction secretary a chance. Troy, already fully prepared, excitedly stated that for the first day, he would only introduce the basics and focus on posture and alignment. However, his enthusiasm was quickly interrupted when his brother informed him that national affairs were overwhelming at the moment, and it had been suggested to wait for an auspicious day before continuing the discussion. The man's excitement immediately turned into frustration. He asked which day had been designated, but his brother's vague response made it clear that it would take far too long. If nothing was done, their father's vision would deteriorate to blindness before training even began. Determined to act, Park Kyung-hwa quoted an old saying, emphasizing that the hardest part of living a healthy lifestyle was starting. He then declared that if the great king refused to come to him, he would go to the great king himself. Before the crown prince could stop him, Park Kyung-hwa sprinted out of the room. The guard stationed nearby immediately reacted, calling out to him, warning that there were rules in the palace and that he couldn't just barge into the king's chambers unannounced. However, Park Kyung-hwa was unfazed. Standing his ground, he challenged the guards, daring them to throw him out with their full strength if they could. 3 palace guards rushed forward, gripping him firmly by his arms in an attempt to remove him. However, before they could drag him away, the king himself appeared. With a heavy presence, King Sejong's voice boomed across the corridor, demanding to know what was happening. His sharp gaze landed on Troy, kneeling with his book in hand. His father's expression was one of disapproval, and he immediately reprimanded them for causing a disturbance in the royal palace in broad daylight, questioning if they had forgotten their dignity. Troy, despite the heavy atmosphere, held his ground. Looking up at his father, he declared that there was something urgent they needed to discuss. The king sighed, already anticipating the topic. He addressed his son directly, stating that if this was about the corporal construction secretary, he had already read the book and made it clear that he would try it when he had time. But Park Kyung-hwa was relentless. He argued that the correct approach to the training was to start as soon as possible and to practice it consistently. The 2 men locked eyes, a silent battle of will and authority playing out between them. Then, the king asked a piercing question. Did Park Kyung-hui write this book because he suspected him of having a disease? Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hui confirmed it. He had interfered because the signs of illness were undeniable. According to his research, the most appropriate course of action was to treat the disease early before it progressed to irreversible stages. The king turned to his doctor, commanding him to list any symptoms he had observed. The doctor complied, stating that the king merely sweated deeply and consumed large amounts of water. Hearing this, Park Kyung-hui clenched his fists. It was obvious why the king had brought his physician. He intended to use the doctor's words as justification for inaction. But Park Kyung-hui wasn't fooled. He knew that his father had already read the book and was seriously contemplating his illness. The real issue wasn't whether the king understood the problem, it was that he hated the idea of exercising. Park Kyung-hui realized that all he needed to do now was to give him one final push. Steeling himself, he addressed his father once more. Considering his symptoms, Park Kyung-hui boldly declared that he believed the king was suffering from type 2 diabetes. The man's plan to convince his father was unfolding as intended. Though it required more than just reason, it demanded persuasion, strategy, and in some cases, a well-placed lie. The moment he declared that he had personally put his body through similar conditions, the reaction was immediate. Every person in the court turned their attention toward him, their faces painted with disbelief. Such a claim was not only bold but reckless, for the idea of someone deliberately inducing a disease to experience its effects was unheard of. But Park Kyung-hui knew the weight of his words, and more importantly, he understood that his father needed to hear them. The king's gaze narrowed as Park Kyung-hui continued explaining the mechanics of diabetes, though the medical terminology was unknown to those listening. He spoke of how excess yang qi could destroy the body, how sugar, used medicinally in moderation, could easily become a poison when consumed in excess. He described how ingesting large amounts of grain syrup or caramel could trigger a temporary state resembling diabetes, forcing the body into a state of extreme thirst, exhaustion, and blurred vision. Then, without hesitation, he claimed that he had personally gone through this, that he had endured the same thirst, had found himself drinking entire buckets of water, had collapsed in moments of extreme fatigue, and had even seen his own vision darken when the condition worsened. For a moment, silence hung thick in the air. The king remained stone-faced, but something in his eyes flickered recognition. Park Kyung-hui had given him the exact description of what he had been experiencing, down to the last detail. Deep down, Park Kyung-hui knew he had never actually subjected himself to such suffering. Everything he described was based on medical knowledge from his own era, carefully crafted to sound both credible and alarming. Yet as he spoke, even the crown prince, his own brother, a man who had spent years beside him, believed the words without question. He had not only convinced his father, but had also inadvertently deceived those closest to him. The turning point came when the king, clearly unsettled, asked how long it would take to restore his health if he followed the corporal construction secretary. Troy, without a single moment of hesitation, declared that it would take 5 days. His words, spoken with absolute certainty, left no room for doubt. The response was immediate. If he failed, he would be charged with deceiving the king, an act punishable by severe consequences, and so, the challenge was set. The training began at dawn. King Sejong, a man who had spent his years governing with wisdom rather than physical exertion, now found himself at the mercy of his own son's relentless discipline. The royal training grounds, once reserved for soldiers and warriors, had never before seen a king struggling through physical exercises. Mounting a horse, an act he once found effortless, now became a grueling task under the man's watchful eye. Each time his body moved too slowly, he was instructed to correct his posture. With every misstep, his son sharpened his expectations, pressing him to move faster, steadier, stronger. Though his father held absolute power over the kingdom, on this field, Park Kyung-hui held absolute authority over him. The passing hour felt like an eternity for the aging king. He had been prepared for something difficult but had underestimated the sheer intensity of the man's methods. Just as exhaustion settled over him, hope flickered in his mind, the idea that perhaps this session had finally ended. But the moment that thought began to take form, Park Kyung-hui shattered it completely. This was only the warm-up. The real training was just beginning. The next exercise tested not only strength but endurance. Squats, an unfamiliar concept to the king, quickly became a new source of suffering. The demands of proper posture, controlled breathing, and repetitive movement turned into a grueling ordeal. Each repetition weighed on his body, forcing him to engage muscles long neglected by his years of sedentary rule. The instructions were precise. He was to exhale as he exerted force, inhale as he relaxed, and maintain a rigid stance to avoid injury. The repetition count was set, not too extreme, but enough to push his limits without breaking his body completely. Park Kyung-hui observed carefully. offering silent corrections, ensuring that his father remained in proper form, knowing that any lapse could result in failure. By the time the session neared its first break, a royal servant arrived, announcing that it was time for the king's meal. At first, King Sejong felt relief. The idea of food, of rest, was something he had begun to crave within the first minutes of training. He expected the comfort of a warm, satisfying meal, something that would soothe the strain in his limbs. But when the food was brought to him, he quickly realized his mistake. The meal was small, plain, and lacked any of the richness he was accustomed to. His frustration was immediate. The coarse texture of the rice, the blandness of the ingredients, the absence of the usual meats and flavors, everything about this dish felt like an insult to his status. His patience, already worn thin from training, snapped entirely. He demanded an explanation, called for the royal chef, and, in his irritation, even declared that the food was unfit for his table. But before his anger could escalate further, Park Kyung-hui entered the hall. There was no warmth in his expression, no amusement at his father's complaints. Instead, his gaze was cold, his stance unyielding. The meal, Park Kyung-hui explained, had been prepared specifically for his father's health. He had removed grain syrup and honey to control sugar levels, had chosen germinated brown rice to maintain satiety, and had replaced excessive meat with tofu, ensuring that his father's diet would support his recovery rather than worsen his condition. The king's temper flared. This was not food fit for a king, it was a punishment. But Park Kyung-hui stood his ground, unwavering. His father had made a promise, and he would hold him to it. Faced with no alternative, King Sejong picked up his chopsticks, his movements slow, reluctant. Each bite was taken in silence, his frustration evident in every chew. Even as he forced the meal down, a thought pressed into his mind: where had his son inherited such stubbornness? Late into the night, King Sejong sat in his chambers, brush in hand, attempting to write on a scroll. His fingers trembled, his grip weaker than before. Frustration mounted as he realized how much his strength had diminished. He called for his servant, instructing him to fetch a new brush, assuming the one in his hands was flawed. But as he glanced at his fingers, the truth was undeniable. Ever since training began, his entire body had changed. His stomach rumbled loudly, the hunger from his restricted diet gnawing at him. He reached out, intending to call for food, but before he could, something made him freeze. A shadow appeared in the doorway. His heart nearly stopped. Park Kyung-hwa stood there, silently watching. For a brief moment, the king felt a chill run down his spine, an eerie sensation creeping over him. Before he could react, Park Kyung-hui bowed respectfully, then disappeared into the darkness. As the candlelight flickered, King Sejong exhaled heavily, rubbing his forehead. That boy would be the death of him. Even in his dreams, he feared Park Kyung-hui would be watching. King Sejong never imagined that he, the ruler of an entire kingdom, would find himself in such a predicament. If not for the promise he had made, he would have abandoned this grueling routine long ago. But now, he had no choice but to persevere, all because of that relentless brat of a son. Every muscle in his body ached, every movement reminded him of his suffering, yet something deep within him had changed. He could no longer deny the results. Night fell over the royal palace, and the guards standing watch outside the king's chambers exchanged hushed whispers. They found it unusual, even concerning. For years, the king had suffered from restless nights, often ordering his servants to leave because his snoring made him uncomfortable. Just 2 weeks ago, he had barely been able to breathe properly in his sleep, tossing and turning in exhaustion. But tonight was different. The air around his chambers was silent, peaceful, as if nothing could disturb the stillness. Inside, King Sejong slept soundly for the first time in years. Deep within his dreams, he envisioned himself training, his body sculpted to perfection, his movements swift and effortless. He felt lighter, stronger, as if he had returned to his youth. The vision of a beautiful, muscular form, unlike anything he had ever possessed before, brought him an overwhelming sense of joy. He had resisted, complained, and cursed the process, but for the first time, he felt something he had long forgotten: energy, vitality, and the promise of longevity. A full month had passed since the king had begun his training under the man's guidance, and now it was time to assess the results of the corporal construction secretary. Troy, ever alert to changes in his surroundings, noticed something unusual as he walked through the palace halls. Someone was asleep where they shouldn't be. Approaching carefully, he recognized a man mumbling in his sleep, lost in hallucinations. The scientist, deep in his fragmented thoughts, spoke to a doll clutched in his hands, muttering about a deadline for the production of an Armely sphere. A strange, unsettling smile stretched across his face as he continued speaking in a dazed, delirious state. He wondered if the king would expel him once the high-torque water clock was completed, laughing bitterly to himself. His voice wavered between lucidity and madness, reflecting on the idea that he was nothing more than a tool for the king. His words carried the weight of someone who had long been consumed by his work, someone who had dedicated himself entirely to science, only to find himself questioning his existence. The man's sharp voice interrupted the rambling, snapping the scientist out of his trance. Startled, the man jerked upright, immediately apologizing for his disheveled state. His intellect and talent were undeniable, but at this moment, he resembled anything but the celebrated genius of the Joseon era. The man before him, second commander and deputy Jang, had once been a slave, rising rapidly through the ranks to become a third-ranking official and a royal engineer. His brilliance had shaped advancements in science and engineering, earning him a place in history books centuries later. However, looking at him now, Park Kyung-hui couldn't help but feel that something was off. The man before him seemed entirely different from the figure he had imagined, his mind scattered, his exhaustion evident, and his perception of reality questionable at best. After gathering himself, Jang inquired about the reason for the man's visit. The moment Park Kyung-hui handed over a royal order from the king, the scientist's demeanor shifted completely. His already fatigued expression turned to despair, his mind racing at the implications of being tasked with another royal project. Before he could spiral further, Park Kyung-hui calmly reassured him, explaining that he hadn't even stated his request yet. Once Jang composed himself, Park Kyung-hui brought up the problem at hand. The king was progressing in his training, but with the cold weather approaching, he wouldn't be able to exercise outdoors. Therefore, a solution was needed, something that could allow him to feel as if he were running in a field, even while inside a room. Jang, upon hearing the request, immediately stated that he had never built such a device before. He expressed that it would take a long time to develop, given that he was already buried under a mountain of work. If added to his existing backlog, it could take years before completion. Park Kyung-hui quickly realized that constructing a treadmill in this time period was not going to be easy. The materials alone would be a challenge, wood would be too weak, and metal would be far too heavy. He needed an alternative method, one that would ensure the king could continue his training without being physically overwhelmed. As Jang contemplated the request, he questioned whether the regimen Park Kyung-hui had introduced was truly meant for health. He seemed visibly unsettled by the sheer intensity of the routine, recalling the endless pain that came with increasing weight levels. His own body trembled at the thought of it, expressing that if it were up to him, he would refuse altogether. But as it was a royal order, he had no choice but to comply quickly. Taking a deep breath, Jang agreed to draft the design immediately, asking Park Kyung-hui to accompany him. However, Park Kyung-hui had one pressing concern: if this was going to take years, it would be useless for the king's current needs. Jang, surprisingly, provided a solution. While wood alone wouldn't last, constructing a steel-plated version would increase durability. He sketched something resembling a hamster wheel, explaining that it would mimic the sensation of running without requiring actual movement across a field. Troy analyzed the design, finding the logic sound. He asked how long the construction would take, hoping for something manageable. Jang, after some thought, estimated that if there were no extravagant decorations, the device could be completed in 10 days. Park Kyung-hui was impressed by the speed, knowing that for an entirely new invention, 10 days was an incredible achievement. Asking if Jang could manage such a workload, the scientist simply replied that a royal order required absolute effort. He had no choice in the matter. Troy, though aware that this wasn't Jang's original intention, found himself satisfied with the result. 10 days later, the device was completed. Park Kyung-hui stood beside the crown prince, presenting the newly developed step device. The machine, an impressive structure for its time, was now ready for use within the palace walls. The crown prince expressed a sense of relief, knowing that exercise could now continue indoors. However, his worries remained. His father was going to be the first to use this contraption, an entirely untested invention. Troy, however, assured him that there was no need for concern. He had already tested the device himself. There were no issues, and soon King Sejong would be the first ruler in history to train on a treadmill. The man's brother had always been someone who preferred intellect over physical exertion, and while he admired the man's dedication, he couldn't help but feel apprehensive about their father's extreme training regimen. He voiced his concerns, saying that while Park Kyung-hui adapted easily, their father was still a beginner. If someone who didn't train regularly were to test the device first, it would make him feel more at ease. Troy, always one step ahead, grinned mischievously. He already had the perfect test subject in mind. His brother's expression twisted with suspicion the moment he saw that smile. Realization dawned. The man's older brother, the crown prince, quickly dismissed the idea, telling him to quit joking. He reminded Park Kyung-hui that, unlike him, he had always disliked exercise just as much as their father. But no amount of reasoning or protests could save him. Moments later, he found himself running on the wooden wheel, sweat dripping from his brow, his breath growing heavy. Meanwhile, Park Hyung-hui stood calmly beside him, watching with mild amusement as his brother's resentment grew with each passing second. 15 minutes passed, and the crown prince was ready to collapse, but Park Kyung-hui remained unmoved. He reminded him sternly that there was still time left. This was only the beginning, and it didn't end there. Not long after, his exhausted brother was forced to do bench presses, struggling under the man's watchful eye. The crown prince, grumbling between each lift, began to realize the true nature of his younger brother's methods. This wasn't about health alone. This was torture disguised as training. He tried to reason with Troy, questioning why he had to go through this ordeal. But his words fell on deaf ears. Troy, unmoved, simply remarked that his brother's good looks would go to waste if he didn't maintain his body properly. That alone was enough of an excuse to push him harder. Each repetition was met with complaints, but Park Kyung-hui remained firm, demanding that his brother increase his efforts. And when it was time for squats, the complaints turned into outright despair. The crown prince, already struggling with exhaustion, demanded that Park Kyung-hui at least be honest about the rep count. He clearly remembered doing 12 repetitions, yet now Park Kyung-hui insisted that he continue. With his patience wearing thin, he accused his younger brother of deception, claiming that he was deliberately increasing the numbers just to make him suffer further. But Troy, ever the perfectionist, calmly corrected his form, noting that his knee was buckling again and that his back was still leaning too far forward. The corrections kept coming, and frustration bubbled over. The crown prince, now at his absolute limit, lamented his former brother, the one he knew before Park Kyung-hui became obsessed with fitness. He cried out, begging for his kind, compassionate sibling to return. Troy, without an ounce of sympathy, merely grinned and remarked that, for the sake of his brother's well-being, he was willing to become a wicked spirit. If that meant ensuring his physical fitness, then so be it. At that moment, a piercing scream echoed through the palace, cutting through the air like a blade. It wasn't from the crown prince. Instead, it came from the king himself, whose voice boomed across the courtyard. The king, who had once struggled to run for even 15 minutes, had now adapted to his new regimen so well that he was effortlessly running for an hour. His progress was undeniable. Even the crown prince, who had once barely managed a dozen bench press repetitions, was now surpassing his original limits. Their natural talent, their bloodline, had begun to show. There was no doubt now this family, for all its politics and intellect, possessed an unparalleled physical capability when trained properly. Even Zhang, the scientist who had engineered the step device, had played a significant role in this transformation. The fact that he had created such an advanced machine using only the technology of this era was nothing short of astonishing. But more than that, he had taken it upon himself to conduct further research, seeking ways to improve its efficiency. Troy, watching from a distance, found himself pondering a thought. Why did Zhang's image seem so different from how history had portrayed him? Had he always been like this? Or had something changed because of the man's interference in history? Regardless, his achievements could not be denied. The greatest scientist in Joseon had proven his worth, demonstrating an extraordinary sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, whispers began spreading across the palace. People had begun to notice the king's physical changes, and concerns arose. Some were worried, whispering that he had lost too much weight too quickly. They feared that he had fallen ill, his body weakening rather than strengthening. One court official, in hushed tones, remarked that the king had grown so exhausted from training with the great Prince Swang that he had even begun neglecting political affairs. It was true, King Sejong was a man of immense intellect, one who devoted himself completely to any field of study he pursued. And Park Kyung-hwa had managed to harness that very trait, using it to push his father toward physical transformation. The crown prince's servant, having overheard these conversations, hesitated to inform his master. But when he finally did, the crown prince simply waved it off, stating that his father's condition was no different from his own. He too had lost unnecessary fat since beginning the training program, and his father was merely going through the same experience. But just then, a court physician hesitantly raised a concern. He pointed out that rapid fat loss was also a symptom of diabetes, and suddenly, the air grew heavy with doubt. The discussion escalated quickly, with multiple officials questioning whether the very regimen designed for health was actually detrimental. They even proposed filing a petition, urging the king to pause the training for at least one day to ensure his safety. But before the petition could be prepared, the king himself entered the hall. The moment they laid eyes on him, the entire room fell silent. For the first time in years, King Sejong stood before them not as an aging ruler burdened by ailments, but as a man radiating strength, vitality, and an aura of authority unlike ever before. His body had changed drastically, his posture more upright, his movements fluid, and his gaze sharp with renewed energy. The difference was undeniable. His presence alone commanded respect, and when he spoke, his voice carried an air of authority that silenced all concerns. Troy, standing at his father's side, calmly reassured the doctor that there was no need for alarm. According to the records of the royal clinic, the king had begun sweating more, and the amount of water he consumed daily had significantly decreased. The doctor, still hesitant, questioned what would happen if these symptoms were, in fact, a sign of illness. But Troy, unfazed, reminded them that they were only halfway through the 6-month training period. There was no turning back now. He turned to his brother, urging him to simply wait and see, for in the end, muscles never lie. With calluses forming on his own hands, Park Kyung-hui found himself lost in thought. Time was passing too quickly. His past life in the 21st century was beginning to feel like nothing more than a distant dream. But before he could dwell on it further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see the chief of inspection, the very man who had once tried to incriminate him. Without hesitation, the chief remarked that the prince had entered the office before sunrise that morning. Troy, raising an eyebrow, found himself questioning why an inspector general would be so early in the palace. Then, with a knowing look, the chief revealed the truth. King Sejong had begun complaining of fatigue once more, and his political duties were beginning to fall behind. The transformation of King Sejong had reached its peak, and it was now evident to all who witnessed him. No longer the ailing ruler who struggled with fatigue, he now commanded attention not just with his wisdom and authority, but also with his renewed physical prowess. Even the inspector general, a man who had once been skeptical, now stood before him, not to oppose him directly, but to relieve some of his burdens in governance. Troy, standing beside his father, watched the exchange with a knowing smile. It was clear that both he and the inspector general had the same underlying concern: the king's well-being. However, Troy, ever persistent, turned the conversation toward the inspector general himself, subtly implying that if he was so concerned about health, he should also start preparing his own body. The inspector general, unfazed by the man's remark, dismissed the idea immediately. His responsibilities, he claimed, were far too great for him to spend time on such things. Unlike Troy, he could not afford to prioritize personal health over official duties. Troy, however, was not one to back down. He countered by stating that 2 hours of training would leave 22 remaining hours for governance, making the argument that a stronger body would only enhance efficiency. But the inspector general, ever the bureaucrat, saw it differently. He feared that those 2 hours of exertion would ruin the remaining 22, making governance more difficult rather than more effective. And yet, despite his doubts, he maintained his formal stance, declaring that his concerns were rooted in the king's best interests. As he walked through the snow, he reminded Park Kyung-hui that the 6 months he had promised were nearing their end. The time was approaching when the kingdom would judge whether or not this so-called discipline had truly benefited the king. As the days passed, murmurs spread within the inspector general's organization. The inspection bureau had always been feared, their role being to scrutinize and investigate high-ranking officials for misconduct and incompetence. Unlike other courts, they did not require evidence to impeach someone. Their accusations alone were enough to bring someone down. And now they had set their sights on the corporal construction secretary, questioning whether it had truly been beneficial to the king's reign or if it had distracted him from his duties. One of the inspectors spoke in hushed tones, noting that tomorrow would be the military training exercise and that the chief of inspection had to make a decision. That very night, the entire inspectorate gathered before the palace. As one unified body, they knelt before King Sejong, presenting their petition. The king, arriving with his usual composure, inquired about the reason for their urgent assembly. The chief inspector, stepping forward, formally requested that His Majesty reconsider his participation in the bodybuilding training. Though he acknowledged that all disciplines take time to master, he argued that the nature of this matter was entirely different. Political duties were, and always would be, the king's most sacred responsibility. Even though King Sejong had never once neglected his governance, the inspector general asserted that he still needed to set an example, not as a man obsessed with self-improvement, but as a ruler who adhered to the established principles of the state. There was an undeniable tension in the air. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then, with a serious gaze, he spoke. He challenged the validity of the inspector general's argument, noting that it seemed to prioritize outdated principles over tangible results. He then posed a question: was this opposition truly born out of loyalty, or was it merely a challenge to his authority? The weight of his words hung over the gathering like a storm cloud, silencing even the most vocal critics among the inspectors. Finally, the king clarified his stance. The reason he had dedicated himself to learning the corporal construction secretary was not just personal improvement, but to serve as a role model for his soldiers. The upcoming military training would be his final test. One of the assembled officers voiced his concerns, reminding the king that military exercises were governed by a law set forth by the great King Taejo. Another warned that if the king was not skilled in horseback riding, he could face serious danger. A third remarked that even the youngest warriors took over a year to learn how to shoot arrows from a moving horse. How could the king possibly expect to succeed in such a short period? But King Sejong remained resolute. Without hesitation, he commanded that a royal guard accompany him to prevent accidents, but made it clear he would not back down. Before the inspector general could continue his argument, the king silenced him once more. If the training proved effective, he declared, then he expected all of them to commit themselves to at least half of what he had accomplished. There was no further room for debate. The decision had been made. The day of military training arrived. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers gathered in Chiran County, Gangwon Province. Seated atop his horse, King Sejong raised his voice, commanding that he would personally inspect the front line before the drills commenced. As soon as his orders were given, the soldiers, with practiced discipline, adjusted their formations, falling in perfect synchronization. Their resounding battle cries echoed across the training grounds, signaling that they had understood their orders without question. Yet among them, hushed whispers persisted. One soldier muttered in disbelief, questioning whether the king had ever moved so swiftly before. Another remarked that, despite having trained for over a decade, he had never seen His Majesty display such physical prowess. It was no secret that during previous military exercises, the king had always remained inside a carriage, issuing commands from a distance rather than riding alongside his soldiers. But today, everything had changed. The signal to begin was given, drums boomed across the field. The troops surged forward, marching with precision and unity. Riding alongside them, King Sejong found himself experiencing something completely new. As he guided his horse, he reflected on the hours he had spent training with Park Kyung-hui, the 2 hours per day of relentless horseback drills, the aching muscles, the exhaustion, the relentless discipline, and yet, at this moment, it all felt worth it. For the first time, he understood what King Taejo had once told him, that horseback riding, when the body is properly maintained, is an experience of pure exhilaration. There was no burden, no struggle, only the freedom of movement, the feeling of control, and the clarity of vision that came with a trained body. As he surveyed the landscape ahead, something caught his attention. A shadow stirred within the distant undergrowth. His eyes sharpened, focusing on the movement hidden among the trees. And in that moment, his vision was clearer than ever before. A wild boar lurked within the bushes, its massive form shifting as it prepared to bolt. For a brief moment, the king was overcome with realization. The effects of his training were no longer theoretical. His body had changed, but so had his senses. He could see further than before, could react faster, could anticipate movement in ways he never had before. Everything, the struggle, the suffering, the training, had led to this moment. As the beast prepared to break from the foliage, King Sejong gripped the reins of his horse tightly. Determination burning in his gaze, the hunt was on. King Sejong, feeling an exhilarating rush unlike anything he had experienced before, raised his hand with a newfound sense of confidence, signaling to his son Troy to hand him his bow and arrow, which the young prince did without hesitation, his movements fluid and precise as if he had already anticipated his father's request. And as the king grasped the familiar weight of the weapon in his hands, he felt a sense of control he had never known, his body responding effortlessly to his commands, his breath steady, his focus sharp, as he prepared to take aim at the wild boar that had emerged from the undergrowth, its powerful form shifting cautiously as if sensing the looming danger. But before anyone could witness the shot, an entirely different scene was unfolding elsewhere within the military training grounds, where a soldier curiously inquired whether the inspector general would not be participating in the hunt alongside His Majesty, only to receive a vague and dismissive response. As the inspector, standing with a composed yet unreadable expression, merely gestured for the soldier to proceed without him, maintaining a calm demeanor while secretly allowing his thoughts to spiral into a darker territory. His mind fixated not on the hunt itself, but on the figure of the second prince, whom he had long perceived as a growing problem, a force of change that threatened to disrupt the established order and potentially place His Majesty in a precarious situation. For he had never once forgotten the cunning and relentless nature of the young prince, whom he considered to be the very root of the issue, a disruptive element that had come to influence the king in ways that few could have predicted. And though many viewed the man's contributions to His Majesty's well-being as a remarkable achievement, the Inspector General remained skeptical, convinced that the training regimen, no matter how beneficial it appeared on the surface, had the potential to cloud the king's judgment. For in his eyes, military training was not simply a means of self-improvement or an exercise in discipline, but rather a preparation for war. And in war, anything could happen, including unforeseen accidents and unexpected tragedies, which made the young prince a wild card that could not be ignored, prompting the inspector to tighten his grip on his weapon. his mind racing through the possibilities of what might unfold if he were to intervene at this very moment, allowing himself to contemplate the unthinkable. His eyes narrowing as he observed Park Kyung-hui with a quiet intensity that hinted at an unspoken resolve, as though he were weighing the risks of taking decisive action before the prince's influence could grow even stronger. But just as he began to consider the moment that might alter everything, a sudden and powerful voice echoed across the training grounds, breaking his concentration and forcing him to abandon his thoughts. For at that very moment, a soldier excitedly proclaimed that His Majesty had successfully taken down the wild boar, a feat that immediately shifted the atmosphere, sending waves of astonishment through the gathered warriors, who erupted into loud cheers and congratulatory shouts, their admiration evident as they marveled at the sight of the king achieving something so extraordinary. One of them even going so far as to compare the moment to witnessing the legendary military training of the great King Taejo himself, a statement that solidified the undeniable impact of what had just transpired. And as the joyous commotion spread throughout the field, the Inspector General found himself frozen, his plans slipping through his fingers as the weight of the moment overtook him, rendering any notion of immediate action completely impossible, leaving him with no choice but to withdraw his intentions, realizing that, for now at least, he could not move against the prince, as the undeniable proof of the king's revitalized strength and skill had turned the tide in the man's favor, solidifying his influence even further and making it all the more difficult for any opposition to be raised against him in the future. As the soldiers gathered around His Majesty, offering their praises and congratulations, King Sejong, still basking in the afterglow of his triumphant hunt, slowly dismounted his horse with the assistance of his attendants. But as soon as his feet touched the ground, he momentarily stumbled, his balance faltering just enough to draw alarm from those closest to him, particularly Troy, whose sharp eyes immediately scanned his father for any signs of distress or injury, his mind racing with the worst possible scenarios, fearing that after all their efforts, all the painstaking training, and all the progress that had been made, something might suddenly unravel before his eyes, threatening to undo everything they had fought for. Yet before panic could fully take root, the king, instead of showing any sign of weakness, simply let out a hearty laugh, the deep and genuine sound cutting through the air and confusing those around him, particularly the crown prince, who had expected something far more concerning, yet instead found himself staring at his father with bewilderment as the older man chuckled with unrestrained amusement, shaking his head as though reveling in his newfound vigor, his voice booming as he confessed that for most of his life he had never been able to hit a moving target with his bow. But now, even in what was considered his old age, he was finally starting to understand the true essence of hunting and horseback riding, the joy of skillfully controlling his body and engaging with nature in a way he had never done before, a realization that filled him with an infectious excitement, much to the relief of those who had momentarily worried about his well-being, while one of his aides, still wary of the king's overexertion, cautiously reminded him to take care of his body and not be too reckless, prompting Sejong, now in the best of moods, to acknowledge the concern with a light-hearted assurance, his tone carrying none of the former exhaustion that had once plagued him, making it abundantly clear to those watching that this was a man who had truly changed, no longer bound by the physical limitations that had once defined his rule, but rather standing tall and full of energy, a renewed monarch who could both command and lead by example, embodying the very principles that Park Kyung-hui had been striving to instill in him. And as this transformation unfolded before the eyes of all present, the Inspector General, still watching from a distance, slowly began to accept the inevitable, for the proof of the king's physical renewal was undeniable. And with this undeniable evidence before him, he realized that any further opposition to the prince's training methods would be futile, thus begrudgingly relinquishing his initial intentions, silently lowering his weapon, and deciding to retreat, no longer able to justify his previous doubts in the face of such overwhelming success, as the world around him now recognized the young prince's contribution. His once questioned regimen now validated through the very strength and confidence of the king himself. Troy, upon observing the increasingly erratic behavior of the royal inventor Jang, began to suspect that the man was overworked and struggling, and in his growing concern, he resolved to speak with His Majesty to request that the inventor be granted a well-deserved vacation to recuperate. However, before he could even finish voicing his suggestion, Jang adamantly refused, cutting him off with a sharp and immediate rejection, as if the very thought of stepping away from his work was an offense to his honor. His refusal, however, was not rooted in pride or arrogance, but rather in an unshakable sense of loyalty, for he considered himself deeply indebted to His Majesty's kindness, never forgetting that he had once been a mere slave who had been granted the unprecedented opportunity to hold a governmental position, something that had been completely unthinkable under normal circumstances. To him, the privilege of serving the king was far greater than the luxury of rest, and in his mind, to accept a vacation would be an act of ingratitude. an indulgence he felt unworthy of. Instead, he found fulfillment in simply witnessing His Majesty's progress, believing that the sight of the king regaining his health and vitality was already reward enough for his efforts. Yet, despite his stoic devotion, Jiang could not entirely conceal his peculiar fascination with the suffering of others. For as he explained the construction of the leg curl machine, he could not suppress his unsettling enthusiasm, revealing that the design of the device bore a resemblance to a drummer's chair, an observation that seemed to spark a dark amusement within him. His usual, eerily wide grin returned, his expression once again slipping into that familiar psychotic edge, as he muttered with thinly veiled excitement that he was eager to see how His Majesty would react when he finally had the opportunity to test the new piece of equipment for himself. Though Park Kyung-hwa had begun to accustom himself to the inventor's peculiar mannerisms, he could not help but wonder if Jiang's determination to build these devices stemmed solely from duty, or if there was something more sinister at play, a twisted sense of pleasure derived from watching those of high status endure physical hardship under the guise of training. However, before he could dwell too deeply on this thought, a separate matter demanded his attention, as questions began to arise within the palace regarding how much longer the great prince intended to make the king exercise, given that His Majesty had already committed to an hour of rigorous training every single day. As concerns about overexertion were raised, Sejong himself addressed the issue, stating with unwavering authority that those who did not follow this path would be guilty of breaking a sacred promise between master and subordinate, an unthinkable act that would bring disgrace upon those who dared to waver. Thus, the soldiers, despite their exhaustion and wavering resolve, found themselves with no choice but to persevere, pushing their bodies forward even as fatigue threatened to overwhelm them, their breaths ragged, their limbs aching, their determination tested with every passing second. Amidst their suffering, some among them, desperate for relief, turned toward Troy, their expressions pleading as they silently begged him to intervene on their behalf, hoping that he might persuade the king to ease their torment. However, rather than responding with sympathy, Park Kyung-hwa simply smirked knowingly, his voice laced with mock innocence, as he questioned whether he truly had the authority to command someone as powerful as His Majesty, a statement that only served to confirm the soldiers' growing suspicions that the prince, in his own way, was exacting revenge upon the Inspector General's office for the intrigues and accusations they had previously directed at him. As these thoughts spread among the ranks, one particularly exhausted warrior, too drained to remain upright, stumbled and tripped over a dumbbell, his body collapsing face first onto the ground with a loud and graceless thud, prompting the surrounding soldiers to rush to his aid, concern evident in their voices as they asked if he was still conscious. Through his muffled sobs of frustration, the fallen soldier lamented that at the very least, the others should have kept running, leaving him behind so they could complete the training without him. Yet despite his self-deprecating words, his comrades did not abandon him, choosing instead to stand by his side, even offering to carry him on their backs if necessary, a display of unity that deeply impressed Troy, who watched the scene unfold with a sense of pride and satisfaction, thinking to himself that even though the men were groaning in agony, their will remained unbroken. And nothing could have been more pleasing to witness in his newly disciplined city. 1 week after the grueling military training exercise, a separate and far more political matter was unfolding at the residence of Inspector General Yuk-chi, where a loyal warrior voiced his concern about his superior's sudden decision to depart, questioning whether it was truly necessary for him to leave. But the seasoned official, rather than entertaining further discussion, simply dismissed the concern outright, stating that it was far too late to question such things now. The warrior, however, persisted, expressing his frustration at how outsiders who had no understanding of the situation were already spreading talks of dismissal and exile, their baseless rumors poisoning the air with misinformed speculation. And yet, despite this apparent injustice, the Inspector General remained unshaken, his mind already set on the path ahead. Now nearing the age of 50, he admitted that he found it increasingly difficult to accept change, acknowledging that while he could not deny the effectiveness of the bodybuilding secretary's techniques, and even openly admitting that His Majesty's health had improved remarkably under its influence, there was something else that concerned him far more: the unexpected transformation of the great Prince Jin Swang, who had, within a remarkably short period, evolved into a completely different person from the one he had once known, a shift that unsettled him in ways he could not fully articulate. In addition to this, he voiced another, entirely separate concern, stating that while it was not yet a widely discussed issue within the main government, the movements of the Jurchen people had been growing increasingly unusual, an ominous development that required careful observation. For this reason, he revealed his plan to travel to Hamgyong province to monitor the situation personally, taking up the role of provincial governor in order to keep a watchful eye on the region's shifting dynamics. Before departing, he left one final instruction to his subordinate, warning him to relay a message to the great Prince Shuang, advising him to exercise caution regarding an impending visit from the Ministry of Rights of the Ming Empire, an issue of great importance due to the troubling whispers surrounding a certain individual. It had been reported that during the last diplomatic visit, a Ming eunuch had taken an interest in the soap produced under the prince's guidance, purchasing over 100 bars and bringing them back with him. But the real issue was not the sale itself, but rather where the soap had ultimately ended up, for it was believed that these goods had fallen into the hands of Wang Zhen, a powerful figure who, according to chilling rumors, was harboring a malevolent entity within himself, an insatiable force known as the Hungry Ghost, a spirit that could never be satisfied, a symbol of endless greed that now loomed ominously over the horizon. And though it remained uncertain when or how Wang Zhen would make his approach, there was little doubt that one day he would come seeking the great Prince Shuang with an entirely different kind of business in mind. Meanwhile, far beyond the reach of these immediate concerns, in a distant time period, an entirely separate discussion was taking place. As an article detailing the great Prince Shuang's alleged connection to time travel was being analyzed, bringing to light a peculiar event that had occurred during the last mid-autumn harvest festival. A day when the entire family had gathered to enjoy the traditional folk game of weightlifting, an occasion that had brought particular delight to an elderly grandfather, who had watched with great pride as his grandson, having undergone rigorous training, demonstrated remarkable progress, a sight that filled the old man with an unshakable sense of joy, leaving the question lingering in the air: was this merely a coincidence, or had history itself been rewritten? With the establishment of the bodybuilding secretary as an undeniable part of the country's cultural and military traditions, it became clear that the discipline had not only taken root in Joseon, but had also shaped the very foundation of how strength and physical conditioning were perceived. However, while its impact on the kingdom was undeniable, it was an inescapable fact that this monumental shift in thinking began with one man, none other than great Prince Shuang, the second son of King Sejong the Great, a figure whose contributions went far beyond the realm of simple physical training. It was not only his martial and bodily advancements that left an impact, but also his innovations in hygiene and medicine, for he was the first in history to create soap and surgical alcohol, two items that would go on to revolutionize sanitation and healthcare within the kingdom and beyond. Because of these remarkable feats, some historians, scholars, and theorists have debated whether his extraordinary knowledge could be explained through conventional history, or if he was, in fact, a time traveler, possessing knowledge that far surpassed what should have been available to a man of his time. This controversy has persisted throughout history, with some dismissing it as an exaggeration of folklore and others pointing to the clear evidence of his technological leaps, arguing that it was impossible for such advancements to have occurred without some kind of unexplainable intervention. Among those studying this topic, Li Dawin, the expert and director of the Joseon History Archives, provided a more balanced academic analysis, stating that the great prince's techniques bore a striking resemblance to modern bodybuilding, something that could not be ignored. However, despite acknowledging the similarities between his training methods and contemporary exercise science, she remained skeptical of the time-traveling theories, offering an alternative perspective on the historical figure. According to her research, during his youth, the great prince was so competent and disciplined that he earned comparisons to a man from the future, yet at some point, he allegedly became negligent in his duties, allowing the bodybuilding secretary to fade into a mere folk tradition rather than a global discipline. She asserted that if he had taken the opportunity to spread the discipline further, the tradition of weightlifting and strength training would not have remained a cultural relic confined within Joseon, but could have, instead, become a widespread practice that would have defined fitness worldwide, replacing what modern bodybuilding would later develop into. In the end, she dismissed his legacy as being far less significant than it could have been, arguing that he was ultimately just a historical footnote, a man who contributed a mere folk game to his country's cultural heritage rather than shaping global fitness practices as some had claimed. While such discussions unfolded in the present day back in the past, the hero himself, unaware of the ways in which future historians would judge him, awoke from his sleep, feeling a renewed sense of determination to continue his modifications for the future. His brother, seated nearby as he worked, took note of his expression and, in a casual tone, inquired about the kind of dream Park Kyung-hwa must have had to make him appear so unusually serious and contemplative. Without waiting for an answer, his brother continued, remarking that the man's complexion looked pale, leading him to believe that he had been pushing himself too hard with his reading, and that perhaps it would be best for him to reduce his studies for a while. However, rather than considering this advice, Park Kyung-hwa instead found himself deeply shaken by the memory of the dream, the echoes of future criticism ringing in his mind. The realization that his legacy might one day be dismissed as insignificant that all of his work could be reduced to nothing more than a traditional game rather than a serious discipline filled him with a renewed sense of urgency, making him more determined than ever to cement the bodybuilding secretary's place in history. Thus, even though he was already on the verge of fainting from exhaustion, buried under a dense pile of books, he resolved to push forward, unwilling to allow future generations to look down on his efforts. As he forced himself to continue reading, a stray memory surfaced in his mind. His father, King Sejong, had mentioned that he was planning to create a new set of characters for the common people, an ambitious project that was to be announced the very next day. Though Park Kyung-hwa could hardly claim to be an academic scholar, his passion for leadership and physical preparation had already proven that when the mind and body worked in harmony, nothing was impossible. With this belief, he considered how he might assist his father in his linguistic endeavor, though he recognized immediately that such a task was far beyond anything he had ever undertaken before. When Sejong had asked for help in formulating the new written characters, he had suggested that Park Kyung-hwa could base the sounds on phonetics, referencing books within the royal library to develop a logical structure that would be easy for the common people to learn. However, the more Park Kyung-hwa thought about it, the more he realized that language development was far more complex than any training regimen he had ever devised, and he began to feel a creeping sense of doubt, wondering whether he could contribute anything meaningful to such an intricate project. In his frustration, he sighed heavily, prompting the crown prince, who had been observing him, to tease him by comparing his melancholic habit to that of Assistant Commander Jang, the eccentric and unpredictable inventor whose mannerisms had become infamous within the palace. Though the remark was meant in jest, it barely registered in the man's mind, as his thoughts had already shifted to a new concern, the realization that, as his responsibilities grew, he would soon need to take on disciples. Individuals who could continue his teachings and serve as both trainers and assistants in spreading the bodybuilding secretary throughout the kingdom. When his brother inquired about when he planned to begin selecting candidates, Park Kyung-hwa responded by suggesting that Mylon, a boy of royal lineage but of low standing due to being the son of a concubine, might be a suitable choice, given that he was barred from holding a governmental position and thus would have greater freedom to pursue a different path. However, his brother countered that while Mylon would be an excellent choice, it would be even more beneficial to recruit individuals from various backgrounds, explaining that for the bodybuilding secretary to take root within the Eastern Palace, they would need a disciple who was a member of the royal family. With this, Park Kyung-hwa was left in deep contemplation, realizing that there was only one person who could fulfill this role. Though he remained uncertain whether the individual in question would even enjoy practicing the bodybuilding secretary's technique, the potential disciple was none other than Prince So-san, the third son of the deposed Crown Prince Yeong, a man who had once been the designated heir to the throne during King Taejong's reign but had ultimately been stripped of his title due to his rampant corruption, infidelity, and exploitation of the royal family's power. In the aftermath of his father's disgrace, Prince So-san had grown up with a notorious reputation, widely known for his delinquent behavior and acts of vagabondage, leading many to assume that he would follow his father's path of ruin. However, upon meeting him in person, Park Kyung-hwa found himself pleasantly surprised, as the young prince behaved far more normally and courteously than he had been led to believe, making him question whether his infamous reputation was entirely deserved or if it had been exaggerated by court gossip. In his mind, Park Kyung-hwa understood that the reason the boy had turned to delinquency in the original history was due to the humiliation his father had suffered, but since that moment had not yet come to pass, the situation remained fluid, leaving open the possibility for change. Without hesitation, he posed a question to Prince So-san, asking whether he had ever heard of the bodybuilding secretary, to which the young prince responded without hesitation, stating that he was well aware of it, as it had already become a widely recognized and respected discipline. Troy, sensing the opportunity to bring a new disciple into the ranks of the bodybuilding secretary, posed the question directly to Prince So-san, asking if he was willing to learn the discipline and inherit the knowledge necessary for body preparation and self-mastery. The young prince, much to the man's surprise, responded with unwavering politeness and immediate acceptance, his tone composed and seemingly sincere, giving the impression that this arrangement would proceed smoothly without any resistance. Encouraged by this apparent enthusiasm, Park Kyung-hwa wasted no time in calling upon his trusted subordinate, Ma, instructing him to begin the prince's warm-up routine, ensuring that he followed the proper steps to prepare his body for what was to come. However, the moment Ma, a commoner, addressed the young noble, the prince's entire demeanor shifted drastically, his formerly courteous expression twisting into one of irritation and disdain. His tone dripping with arrogance and condescension as he dismissed Ma outright, claiming that the mere scent of sweat from a lowly commoner was enough to give him a headache. This abrupt change in attitude left both Park Kyung-hui and Ma momentarily stunned, as they had not expected such blatant elitism from someone who had just moments ago expressed such eagerness to learn. Sosun, noticing their bewilderment, clarified his position, explaining that while he greatly desired to master the technique, as a member of the royal family, he could not, in good conscience, accept instruction from someone beneath his station. Troy, observing Ma's reaction, quickly realized that his subordinate, though visibly frustrated, remained composed, unwilling to let the prince's words affect him deeply. This, however, gave the two of them an idea. If arrogance was the boy's greatest weakness, then the best cure would be humility. Without hesitation, they decided on the most effective method of correcting his attitude. They would make him experience the full weight of the training firsthand. Soon enough, the once haughty prince found himself struggling under the unforgiving load of a squat bar, forced to endure the same discipline that he had so condescendingly dismissed, his body quickly reaching its breaking point as his muscles screamed in protest. With each agonizing repetition, his pride and arrogance were systematically stripped away, his earlier boastful demeanor reduced to exhausted, breathless desperation as he struggled just to remain upright. At the same time, Ma, now lifting an even heavier weight with remarkable ease, maintained a smug, amused expression, watching with obvious enjoyment as the once self-important prince crumbled under the physical toll of his own arrogance, forcing Sosun to come to the humbling realization that strength was not granted by birthright, but earned through effort and discipline. Eventually, when his legs could no longer hold him, the prince, now gasping for breath, pleaded for mercy, admitting that he had been wrong to act so condescendingly, apologizing profusely while begging for the weight to be reduced, all of his earlier pride and arrogance completely shattered under the relentless weight of his own weakness. As Park Kyung-hwa watched the young prince collapse onto the ground in exhaustion, his body reduced to a trembling, breathless heap, a thought surfaced in his mind, a realization that, despite his earlier behavior, Sosun's life had been shaped by injustice, much like his own. Born into the shadow of disgrace, the boy had been mistreated and ostracized his entire life, forced to endure the scorn and judgment of others simply because he carried the blood of the deposed crown prince, a mark that had permanently stained his existence and left him desperate to assert his worth in whatever ways he could. Now, as he lay defeated before him, Park Kyung-hwa questioned whether it was truly right to subject Ma to the same type of unfair treatment that Sosun had suffered, knowing full well that Ma himself, being the son of a concubine, had faced similar injustices throughout his life. It was only after this moment of reflection that Sosun, finally speaking with genuine vulnerability, admitted that his cruelty toward others was not born from a desire to inflict suffering, but rather from an inability to cope with his own circumstances, as he had spent his entire life being forced into submission, constantly under the watchful eye of the palace, restricted from any form of political involvement, and forever reminded that he could never be a legitimate heir to anything of value. Overwhelmed by the weight of his powerlessness, he had turned to mistreating those beneath him, using his limited authority to impose control where he otherwise had none, not out of malice, but out of sheer desperation to find some form of relief from his frustration and anxiety. Hearing this confession, Park Kyung-hui responded without sympathy, but with the sternness of a leader, reminding Sosun that, as a member of the royal family, he had a duty to conduct himself with honor, and that if he continued to lash out at others, his own wrath would eventually be turned back on him in ways he could not control. In that moment, the prince, realizing the futility of his past behavior, lowered his head and, for the first time in his life, set aside his pride, offering a genuine apology and promising to change his ways, his tone carrying the weight of sincerity that Park Kyung-hwa had not heard before. With this, Park Kyung-hui and Ma were satisfied, knowing that true discipline had finally begun to take root in the boy's heart. From that moment forward, Park Kyung-hwa set forth a new challenge for Sosun, declaring that he would only consider granting him authority within the bodybuilding secretary once he had achieved a combined weight of 400 kilograms. Across the three core exercises: bench press, squat, and deadlift. Sosun, somewhat perplexed by the challenge, hesitated, prompting Park Kyung-hui to explain that his training had to serve a purpose, and that if he wished to prove the method's effectiveness, he needed to demonstrate mastery over his own body, for anyone who moved within the palace had to exemplify discipline in both physical preparation and scholarly knowledge, mastering not only their bodies but also the 4 books and 5 classics, the foundation of Confucian learning. He further clarified that the position he would eventually hold would be that of a trainer, a role of great importance, as it would allow him to share this knowledge with others, ensuring that the bodybuilding secretary continued to thrive beyond just one generation. He then presented a greater vision, one that resonated deeply within the prince's heart, if he were to truly dedicate himself, he could one day become the king's personal trainer, and in doing so, he would rise above the judgment of others, for no one would dare to challenge him once he held such a crucial role in the palace. For the first time in his life, Sosin felt hope. Tears welled up in the prince's eyes as he asked, his voice filled with disbelief, whether such a future was truly possible, confessing that for years he had felt so burdened by shame that he had never even bothered to learn the three classics, believing that knowledge itself was meaningless for someone like him. In response, Park Kyung-wai reassured him that such things could be remedied, promising that both he and Ma would personally assist him in catching up, ensuring that he did not fall behind. Furthermore, he informed Sosan of a monumental development, revealing that His Majesty King Sejong was currently creating a new set of characters, ones that would change the way people learned and eliminate the barriers of literacy that had long plagued the common people. Unlike the current written language, which was difficult to master and largely influenced by the Middle Kingdom, this new system would be designed for the Korean people, consisting of 28 new characters, carefully crafted so that even those who had never held a brush before could quickly learn to read and express themselves. This was not just a reform, this was a transformation of how knowledge was passed down, an act of compassion by a ruler who wished to ensure that all people, regardless of status, would have the ability to learn. With this newfound knowledge, Sosan, once burdened by despair, now saw a future worth striving for, a path that had once seemed impossible, now within his reach. Troy reflected on the monumental undertaking his father, King Sejong, had embarked upon, a set of characters that would not only allow the people to accurately record their voices and thoughts, but also grant access to knowledge that had long been limited to scholars and the nobility, creating an opportunity for literacy to flourish among commoners who had previously struggled to express themselves in writing. The weight of such an innovation was staggering, and the hero, for all his efforts in body preparation and strength training, could not help but recognize the significance of his father's work. Knowing that true progress came not only through physical discipline, but through intellectual advancement as well. With this in mind, he continued his own mission, balancing the responsibilities of his personal training regimen, mentoring his disciples, and tending to his family, whose lives had now become deeply intertwined with the principles of the bodybuilding secretary. One morning, his young son ran up to him, his tiny arms outstretched, greeting him with an innocent, joyful smile, eager to be lifted into his father's strong embrace. Without hesitation, Park Kyung-hui scooped the child into his arms, cradling both his son and their pet kitten, the warmth of his family grounding him in a way that even the most intense of training sessions could not. The child, ever curious, suddenly tilted his head and asked his father an unexpected question. He wanted to know why his uncle, Prince Sosan, was always lying down whenever he saw him, even mentioning that just the other day he had witnessed his uncle begging for his life to be spared, a statement that immediately caught the man's attention. In response, the boy was given a simplified explanation that in training there is no gain without pain, and that muscles must first suffer soreness before they can grow stronger. A concept so fundamental to the man's discipline that he barely thought twice before imparting it to his young son. Hearing this, the child turned to his uncle Sosan and praised him enthusiastically, stating that he must be amazing, because while everyone else collapsed after training, he could still sit up and talk. However, the prince, rather than accepting the compliment, dismissed it with self-deprecating honesty, explaining that his ability to remain seated was not a testament to strength, but rather a consequence of starting later than the others, meaning he didn't yet have the luxury of resting, even if he desperately wanted to collapse like the rest. Changing the subject, Sosin remarked that it might be good for the boy to start learning some form of discipline, even though he was still too young to read. Unexpectedly, the child responded by proudly holding up a book, showing that he had already begun learning on his own, a revelation that took Sosin by surprise. He immediately asked how long the child had been able to read, but rather than answering, the boy simply ignored the question and instead offered the book to his uncle, asking if he wanted to take a look. Troy, watching this interaction unfold, found himself reflecting on how drastically his life had changed not long ago. His world had been nothing more than bars, dumbbells, and strict training regimens, but now he had a 5-year-old child to care for, a family whose lives had become intrinsically tied to his pursuit of strength and discipline, and a responsibility far greater than any weight he had ever lifted. The modern world he once knew felt like a distant dream, an existence that barely seemed real compared to the life he now led. In a way, he had not only reshaped the future of an entire nation, but also the daily lives of those closest to him, as even his wife had adopted his methods, practicing alongside him and finding joy in her own physical improvement. However, while exercise had become a source of empowerment, it also came with risks, as evidenced by a terrifying moment during training when his wife, after performing a series of stiff-legged deadlifts, suddenly wavered, her eyes rolling back as her body collapsed without warning. In an instant, Park Kyung-hui rushed to her side, his arms catching her before she could hit the ground, his voice thick with concern as he asked if she was all right. Though she weakly reassured him, explaining that a sudden dizziness had overcome her, she also confessed that a wave of nausea had followed, causing those observing the scene to speculate about the cause of her symptoms. Understanding their concern, Park Kyung-hwa quickly assessed the situation, explaining that it was likely a temporary reaction caused by a lack of oxygen, which in turn had reduced blood flow to her brain, causing momentary faintness. Had he not been by her side, she might have suffered a serious injury, reinforcing his belief that while training was crucial, ensuring the safety and well-being of those involved was just as important. As he pondered this, a thought surfaced: the more people exercised, the more likely they were to sustain injuries, and if this discipline were to continue expanding, he would need to find a way to prevent and treat these injuries effectively. Later that day, Sosun approached Troy, stating that he wanted his brother to meet someone, a particular individual whom he believed might benefit from the man's expertise. When asked who this person was, Sosun revealed the man's name, Woo Han-gu, a former soldier who had once passed the military exam and served in the garrison, only to have his career abruptly cut short due to an unfortunate injury. According to Sosun, Woo had been present during the strength demonstration event, where he had successfully lifted a stone nearly the size of a full-grown adult, proving his natural physical prowess. But the moment he completed the feat, he had collapsed forward, his spine unable to support the strain, leading to his subsequent dismissal from military service. Upon hearing the name, the man's expression shifted, as he felt a flicker of familiarity, as if he had heard that name somewhere before. Sosin confirmed his suspicions, revealing that during a past coup, Wu had played a pivotal role as the military officer who had managed to suppress Yi's rebellion, proving his capabilities as a warrior before fate had cruelly robbed him of his standing. While performing rapid pull-ups, Park Kyung-wai contemplated the matter, considering that if this man's injury was permanent, there was little he could do, but if the damage had been mismanaged, there might still be a way to rehabilitate him, restoring his strength and mobility through proper methods. Sosun, struggling to keep pace with the man's training, remarked that having heard of his ability to heal His Majesty, he believed that the same miracle could be replicated for Wu. The idea intrigued Park Kyung-wai. If this man was naturally vigorous, recovery might be possible, and if so, he could not ignore the opportunity to help someone reclaim their strength. Meanwhile, in another region, the very same Wu Han-gu, now a man burdened by bitterness and frustration, slammed a cup of alcohol onto the table, his voice thick with anger as he cursed the great Prince Swang, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Drunken and resentful, he shouted in disbelief, questioning how a single man could claim to turn others into paragons of health, dismissing the idea as nothing more than nonsense. However, his drinking companion, clearly uneasy, cautioned him to watch his words, warning that His Majesty himself had learned the discipline created by the prince, a fact that placed Park Kyung-hwa in a rank far too high to be spoken ill of so carelessly. Undeterred, Wu scoffed, clenching his fists in frustration, before violently shattering the cup in his hand, his anger boiling over as he declared that if he ever met the great prince in person, he would demand to know whether the rumors of his extraordinary strength were true, insisting that he did not believe the stories, that the weightlifting feats attributed to the prince were impossible, and that he would slander his name openly until proven otherwise. Unfortunately for him, he did not have to wait long for an answer. Without warning, a shadow fell over him, and as he turned his head, he found himself face to face with none other than Park Kyung-hwa himself. Standing directly behind him, his expression grim and unyielding, his presence alone exuding an air of quiet dominance. Before Wu could even react, Park Kyung-hwa spoke in a cold, measured voice, stating that the weight he had lifted overhead had actually been half of what had been rumored. A revelation that sent a jolt of terror through the drunken warrior, causing him to freeze in place, his face draining of color as a wave of fear washed over him, his bravado shattering instantly as he teetered on the brink of unconsciousness, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the man standing before him. Troy, recognizing that Wu Han-gu's condition required immediate attention, wasted no time in requesting a private conversation with the injured warrior, determined to assess the extent of his physical damage and determine whether a solution could be found. After a careful examination, Park Kyung-hwa quickly understood the severity of the situation. The injury had progressed to an alarming state, worsened by Wu's persistent weight gain, a factor that had come as a result of his misguided attempt to heal quickly. More troubling, however, was the fact that Wu had refused to stop riding horses, even after sustaining the injury, his stubbornness pushing him to continue exerting his body despite the obvious signs of deterioration. This reckless decision had only exacerbated the damage, further limiting his already slim chances of recovery, making the path toward rehabilitation even more uncertain. Given the worsening prognosis, Park Kyung-shui felt compelled to explain the situation bluntly, informing Woo that his condition had deteriorated significantly because of his failure to seek help in time. His insistence on training while injured accelerating the damage, rather than promoting healing. Faced with this harsh reality, Woo, desperate to reclaim his strength, anxiously asked if there was still any possibility of recovery, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope as he awaited the man's response. Rather than offering false assurances, Park Kyung-hui met Woo's gaze with a knowing smile, calmly stating that while there was a method that could potentially aid in his rehabilitation, he could not guarantee a complete recovery, as the damage done to his body might be irreversible. With no other options left, Woo, clutching onto the faintest glimmer of hope, made the firm decision to follow the man's proposed method, committing himself fully to the training regimen, no matter how grueling or uncertain the results might be. They began immediately, starting with kneeling push-ups, a controlled and modified movement that would allow Woo to reintroduce strength into his weakened frame without overexerting himself. Afterward, the two engaged in back-stretching exercises, carefully and diligently focusing on realigning his posture and gradually rebuilding his mobility, ensuring that every motion was executed with calm precision rather than reckless force. As the session ended, Woo, still struggling with doubt, questioned whether these light exercises could actually lead to any significant improvement. His skepticism evident as he glanced down at his still frail and burdened body. In response, Park Kyung-hui calmly explained that he could not teach Woo his exact method, as heavy weightlifting would no longer be an option for someone with such an unstable condition. While his recovery would allow him to regain a level of strength, it was highly unlikely that he would ever return to his former physical peak, a fact that Woo was forced to accept no matter how difficult it was to hear. Faced with this cruel fate, Woo, struggling to contain his emotions, pleaded for another alternative, his voice thick with desperation and despair. Stating that he could not bear the thought of living without the ability to act like a warrior, his very identity threatened by his inability to fight or perform his duties. Furthermore, he expressed concern that his condition would bring shame to his wife, that his inability to return to his former strength would make him a disgrace in her eyes, causing Park Kyung-hui to suddenly remember the terrifying moment when his own wife had collapsed from exhaustion, her body failing her without warning. This memory led him to a new realization, one that he voiced aloud: if rehabilitation alone could not fully restore a body, then perhaps a deeper understanding of human physiology could provide a more effective path to recovery. With this in mind, Park Kyung-hui proposed a radical idea, suggesting that they develop new healing techniques based on the principles of his training methods, drawing from his knowledge of muscle and skeletal structure to find ways to aid the injured more effectively. At first, Woo hesitated, as the suggestion sounded too similar to the path of a physician, a profession he had never once considered nor studied for, having never read a single medical text in his life. However, Park Kyung-hui countered by explaining that even the most experienced doctors lacked an in-depth understanding of the human musculature, often misdiagnosing injuries and prescribing ineffective treatments due to their lack of knowledge regarding physical movement and rehabilitation. A true physician, Park Kyung-hui insisted, needed to understand the relationship between muscles and bones, the way each part of the body interacted, and how movement itself could serve as a form of healing. Hearing this, Woo's perception of Park Kyung-hui changed completely, realizing that the prince was not merely a man obsessed with strength, but someone who possessed an extraordinary intellect, capable of foreseeing innovations that others had never even considered. Accepting this newfound understanding, Woo resolved to follow the man's guidance, beginning his rehabilitation with renewed determination. While Troy, watching his efforts, felt a growing sense of accomplishment, recognizing that he was slowly gathering disciples, individuals who would carry his teachings forward, ensuring that his knowledge would not be forgotten or overlooked. As he contemplated the future, another thought struck him: if exercise were to become widespread, people would inevitably begin training outdoors, and given the customary lack of proper attire, he imagined a disturbing possibility: a world where men would train naked, an outcome that he could not allow. Thus, he realized that he would need to create suitable clothing, garments that would allow for ease of movement while remaining affordable enough for anyone to wear. With his wife's skill as a seamstress, he quickly set about designing an outfit specifically for exercise, using cotton, a fabric commonly associated with peasants, due to its low cost and widespread availability. Once completed, the first exercise shirt was hastily made, yet despite its simple construction, its quality proved surprisingly high, ensuring that it could be reused multiple times without degrading. However, when he presented the design to his wife, she immediately questioned his reasoning, perplexed as to why he had chosen such an ordinary fabric for something that was meant to be associated with physical strength and discipline. At first, she continued her line of questioning, attempting to understand her husband's logic. But everything changed the moment Park Kyung-hwa demonstrated the garment, putting it on and showcasing its practical benefits. The moment she laid eyes on him, she was left completely speechless, her eyes widening in amazement as she took in the sight of the unfamiliar yet undeniably functional clothing. Unable to contain her curiosity, she immediately asked what kind of attire this was, as she had never seen anything like it before. With a confident smirk, Park Kyung-hwa informed her that this was a specialized outfit designed exclusively for exercise, something he had developed to ensure comfort and practicality while training. Cotton, he explained, was chosen because it was readily available, breathable, and allowed for ease of movement, making it the most suitable material for athletic activities at present. However, he admitted that the nobility might be reluctant to adopt it at first, as they were unfamiliar with the fabric's texture, and might view it as beneath them. Hearing this explanation, his wife's perspective shifted completely, and she quickly apologized for misjudging the fabric, admitting that from the way Park Kyung-hwa moved, the material truly did appear ideal for training purposes. With her newfound understanding, she took immediate action, calling upon a tailor to replicate the design, ensuring that additional pieces could be produced for wider use. Thus, cotton, once an ordinary fabric associated with peasants, was transformed into the first form of specialized exercise clothing, a development that would change the perception of training attire forever. Later that night, within the dimly lit halls of a study chamber, a scholar sat with an open book, his eyes scanning the pages with growing astonishment. As he took in the incredible depth of knowledge contained within the bodybuilding secretary. Meanwhile, deep inside Jingwan Temple, a heated discussion unfolded, as a man addressed Mei Juk-hyun, a scholar who had buried himself in his studies for nearly 23 hours, questioning whether he was pushing himself too hard. Apologizing for his overexertion, Song dismissed the concern, focusing intently on the materials before him, while another young scholar, Shin Soo, observing his senior's behavior, could not help but wonder what had captured his attention so completely, prompting him to ask why he was so fixated on these studies, unaware that the knowledge contained within the pages before him would soon shake the foundations of learning itself. Song Saman, ever the dedicated scholar, firmly believed that a relative of the royal family must always set an example, and thus he had no time to waste on trivial matters. He was keenly aware that many of his peers had already surpassed him in various fields, and with the introduction of Prince Jinyang's book, he recognized that even a brief encounter with its contents was enough to pique his interest. Though he had initially approached it with skepticism, he quickly found himself intrigued by the principles it laid out, particularly the idea that cultivating the body was an extension of honoring one's lineage. Despite his growing appreciation for the text, he turned his attention toward Dan, the junior student who had been engaging in an unfamiliar exercise, and inquired about his activities. It was revealed that the boy was performing something called push-ups, an exercise described in the book. Seong, watching closely, recalled that Dan had disappeared at dawn and only returned after taking a bath, prompting him to ask whether he had been performing the mountain run as prescribed in the book. However, Dan casually explained that he had opted to replace the run with jumping rope instead, a revelation that immediately sparked discussion among the scholars. Shin, another student, quickly voiced his doubts, stating that he did not find the book as revolutionary as others claimed after all, aside from the art of bodybuilding. The book was essentially a compilation of knowledge they already possessed. However, the noble student Runhagi took issue with this perspective, firmly warning Shin not to underestimate the book that had been personally sent to them by the Crown Prince. Tension quickly escalated as the two locked eyes, their hostility filling the room, while Seong, caught in the middle of their dispute, felt increasingly uncomfortable. Observing the growing conflict, Song attempted to defuse the situation, suggesting that both parties take a step back and that they continue their discussion the following day, once their tempers had settled. When the next day arrived, the debate resumed, though with a more structured approach. This time, the scholars turned to Dan, who had read the book in greater detail than anyone else, asking for his personal assessment. Dan explained that the central philosophy of the discipline was not simply about valuing the body inherited from one's parents, but rather improving and strengthening it, ensuring that it could serve its purpose in the best possible condition. This statement immediately sparked another round of skepticism, as Shin expressed his doubts, arguing that a true text of wisdom should contain the words of sages, and from his understanding, a crown prince was far from a sage. Seong, nodding in agreement, added that the traditional way of demonstrating one's worth was to ascend in social status, gaining fame and recognition. If that were the case, what purpose did bodybuilding serve? To him, it seemed like a discipline without true merit, lacking any tangible value beyond physical appearance. Additionally, Seong pointed out that the first volume of the book claimed that practicing the exercises would lead to fewer illnesses and significantly reduce fatigue, even under extreme conditions. While this was a compelling argument, he remained skeptical, questioning whether such an approach truly had scientific merit. While he was not opposed to the idea of cause and effect, what troubled him most was the fact that the discipline required expensive equipment to be properly practiced, making it inaccessible to most people. In response, Shin agreed, stating that even if the methodology could transform the body, they had yet to see real proof of these claims. At this point, Dan, having heard enough, realized that his colleagues were completely ignorant of what was happening beyond the walls of their academic circle. With a knowing smirk, he decided to illustrate the book's effectiveness in the clearest way possible. Dan, turning to face them, asked whether they intended to look down on His Majesty, the king, an accusation that immediately sent shockwaves through the room, leaving the scholars visibly shaken. He then proceeded to explain that since learning the principles of the bodybuilding secretary, the king had undergone a remarkable transformation, becoming more active and energetic than he had been even in his youth. Though not every theory in the book could be proven with certainty, one thing was undeniable: it had made the king physically stronger and more resilient. He then posed a rhetorical question, asking if they truly believed that having the ability to move normally after a long day of study would not improve their academic performance. Seong, now caught off guard, asked if Dan was suggesting that they bring exercise equipment into Jingwan Temple, seemingly appalled by the idea. However, Dan clarified his stance, explaining that if the temple's conditions were not suitable for traditional training, they could improvise by using stones or small logs in place of weights. Furthermore, he assured them that no one would be forced to participate if they did not want to train; they simply did not have to. Despite this reassurance, many of the scholars still viewed the practice with hesitation. 8 days later, after considerable debate, the scholars finally put Dan's plan into action, deciding to construct their own training equipment using local materials. However, their enthusiasm quickly faded, as one of the students, Sancta, became the first to collapse from exhaustion, panting heavily as he complained bitterly about the difficulty of the exercises. With an exasperated shout, he declared that he couldn't take it anymore, causing the rest of the scholars to quickly abandon their training, retreating into the temple, where they immediately resumed their studies instead. Standing outside, wiping sweat from his brow, Dan watched as his fellow scholars gave up one by one, understanding that, in the end, they lacked the willpower to push through their discomfort. Even so, he remained steadfast in his commitment, having personally witnessed the power of the bodybuilding secretary through the transformation of those who followed it diligently. Determined not to waver, he vowed to continue practicing, knowing that, over time, his efforts would yield results, ultimately enhancing his ability to study and function in daily life. Meanwhile, as the summer of 1441 progressed, back in the palace workshop, Park Hyung-woo turned his attention toward the invention of new exercise equipment, marveling at the sheer dedication of his chief inventor, Jang. The man had worked tirelessly, tackling the difficult challenge of designing and constructing a shoulder press device and a seated row machine, both of which were far more complex than previous designs. Despite the technical difficulties involved, Jang, ever the eccentric genius, had once again succeeded, his signature psychotic grin spreading across his face as he proudly declared that everything was progressing perfectly, though everyone knew that his motivation was driven by something far beyond mere duty. Observing Jang's peculiar behavior, Park Hyung-woo couldn't help but smirk, knowing that, despite his unhinged enthusiasm, the man was an irreplaceable asset, one whose creations would continue to advance the world of physical conditioning and rehabilitation in ways that no one in this era had ever imagined.
A small pig wandered into the courtyard, its hooves clicking sharply on the polished wooden floor. The official turned, surprised. He remembered this pig raised by his wife with utmost affection. It bumped into his leg gently. He panicked. "This tiny pig won't last another month." He sighed deeply. "I must find better food. My wife depends on this pig's survival." In the palace, a minister reported recent border threats. The king nodded solemnly, concern growing heavier. The minister bowed deeply, shouting praise. "Your unmatched grace has secured the realm's safety, Your Majesty." That night, lanterns lit the sky as laughter echoed from the grand feast held in celebration. A servant approached the king's table politely. "Shall I pour Your Majesty a drink?" "Of course." Another noble raised his glass. "They say your strength rivals history's finest warriors." The king smiled faintly. He replied calmly, "Strength alone means nothing. I built muscle to lead wisely, not simply to fight." A soldier questioned the king's wisdom. "You trusted a strong man over seasoned warriors for battle?" He paused and added, "I meant the liquor. The spirit sent from the capital was powerful." The soldier recalled receiving clear instructions. Apply the spirit to wounds, using clean cotton cloth every time. Thanks to this method, festering wounds healed faster. Soldiers recovered, and infection rates dropped sharply at camp. One officer muttered, "So that's why the distillery was spotless." It wasn't just for drinking. Some commanders warned the spirit caused trouble. Soldiers often drank it to fight off the northern cold. Laughing, they admitted many were caught sneaking drinks. Mixing spirit with water became their usual excuse. When asked how it was resolved, one smiled. We added motherwort, a plant too bitter. Even when they tried to drink secretly, the awful taste forced them to spit it out immediately. Laughter erupted. Oh ho, Li One Bong, take a cup too, the king offered warmly, raising his drink. One Bong looked up in surprise, hearing his name called across the courtyard during the evening gathering. A noble spoke proudly, with great strength. One Bong helped defeat the northern barbarians alongside loyal soldiers. One Bong responded humbly, no. I only use this strength to serve and protect His Majesty. He was formally introduced, Yi Qingak, known as Yi One Bong, loyal general of the Joseon army. The king smiled. Two strong men must talk. But the man excused himself, more royal texts awaited study. For the first time, he scanned someone whose muscle power rivaled or possibly exceeded his own. History remembered this man well, an unmatched martial artist who acted during a time of political chaos. He opposed the royal purge, rallying troops from Jinan province. Yet betrayal ended his bold stand. Though defeated, his strength remained legendary. His fallen figure became a symbol across bloody northern snowfields. The present stirred. Why are we here? Someone asked. Didn't he have something to say? He glanced sideways, alert. The man beside him seemed too polite, too direct with his words. This being your Majesty's close friend. I've heard your strength is unmatched, the guest said respectfully. I have many questions about your training, he added. Would it be rude to visit you? The reply was calm, of course. Internally, he thought, he's more normal than I first assumed. Elsewhere, two workers gossiped near a gate. Is that the scary muscle guy's house? One whispered. He stepped forward, massive and composed. The villagers stared silently, whispering, is he even human? One elder asked, is that the tool called a small dumbbell? The man answered, that's right. May I examine it? He asked curiously. The man handed it over, warning of its heaviness. He struggled immediately. It's heavier than expected, he muttered, arms trembling under the weight of cast iron. Stunned, he gasped. I can barely lift this. And he uses it so easily for curls. One man approached with curiosity. I heard your highness lifts 1,000 gyun for major exercises. He looked down thoughtfully. If I tried the 3 major lifts, how much could I handle? A sudden shout drew attention. A woman gasped as a heavy weight slammed down in the yard. The man groaned, barely holding it. Arr! His body shook under the pressure of the loaded barbell. Nearby, the muscular figure watched calmly. I've trained for years. Even I feel pain during these lifts. The barbell struck the ground with force. Everyone stepped back, startled by the sheer impact and weight. One observer stepped forward. You are incredible. Lifting 600 gyun as a beginner is beyond impressive. He nodded. Today, such strength might even be seen as a form of divine power. Is something bothering you? He asked. Is there a problem with training or body preparation methods? The lifter smiled. No, I've learned so much, but my solo methods may have some flaws. The king spoke. Grand Prince Suyang developed a training method to perfect the body for combat. He added, it was meant to enhance one's strength and aid in military techniques efficiently. The listener asked, so this training wasn't just for strength, but also practical weapon use? The strong man replied, yes. Training the body isn't only about looks, it's about effective, functional combat movement. Another nodded. I've heard that too. Muscle should be useful, not just built to impress. He stepped forward confidently. Conducting oneself and preparing the body should also apply to daily life. Another interjected skeptically, that's not practical. The crowd behind him murmured, some doubtful, others curious and unsure. He growled internally, these skeptics don't know anything. I wasn't always this body. I'm Choi Young-jik, former soldier. He recalled his past life, proudly posing. I first learned about bodybuilding while serving in the military. He clenched his fist. In 3 years, people will beg to follow my training methods. Morning sunlight bathed the palace rooftops as important news quietly made its way to the throne. The king opened a scroll, expression unreadable. His grip tightened slightly as he read its contents. His son asked gently, is something wrong, father? Noticing the shift in his father's calm demeanor. It's from the Ming Empire, the king replied. They wish to buy 100 bars of soap. They also want to meet the soap's creator, Grand Prince Suyang, he added, face filled with concern. News spread quickly. A eunuch from the Ministry of Rites delivered the Ming Empire's request. The young prince smiled. This outcome is promising. Yi is more open-minded than most royals. Another suggested, send Yi as envoy. Meanwhile, Yi trained hard, lifting iron, unaware of his next mission. The barbell crashed down with force. Training had intensified, and progress was visible in every rep. Breathing hard, one trainee grinned. Look at you lifting that with ease now, even under the sun. You've already reached over 600 gyun, the trainer said. You might become an assistant by next year. Really? The trainee asked. I thought I'd never match his performance, much less teach beside him. He hesitated. "Hey, remember when I failed trying to impress a concubine?" "Yeah, I remember," came softly. "I figured having one now would be great," the younger man said with a hopeful grin. The older man sighed. "I see, many royal concubines bear children before 20. In fact," he added, "it's a tradition. Late births are frowned upon in most noble houses." A pause. "Is there a fixed age?" the younger one asked. About that," he mumbled nervously. He exploded. "You base your life plan on the royal childbearing schedule? Are you even serious?" he asked curiously. "A man-made disaster?" The idea sounded strange in such a peaceful courtyard setting. "Not a natural one," the other clarified, "but something caused by humans through neglect, anger, or violence. To prevent that," he said, flexing slightly, "you rely on physical strength, naturally your body's trained power." The younger one nodded slowly. "I see, like stopping someone dangerous before damage is done," he added, "but for women to develop strength, that method is still unclear and unexplored today." She strained with effort, lifting a barbell. "There's one," he shouted, pointing toward her in excitement. He grinned. "Look carefully. This is the martial art I'll teach your concubine for protection." "Try grabbing my collar," he said. "Fighting often starts that way. Most people go straight for it." His brother chuckled nervously. "It's true. I've grabbed collars a lot. Let's get this over with." As the grip tightened, he laughed. "You're about to witness the martial art I personally created." With a sudden motion, he gripped tightly and twisted. "Something like this," he declared with confidence. Her eyes widened, and she murmured, unable to process what had just happened so fast. The body hit the ground with force. A loud thud echoed across the courtyard. "Cook." He stood tall. "You just experienced my technique disabling joints to bring opponents straight to submission." Pointing casually, he added, "Both arms disabled. Now they can't even reach for a spoon, right?" Ji-un pushed Hye-ran forward, laughing loudly. "Your turn now. Don't pretend you're suddenly weak." Hye-ran sighed, steadied her stance, gripping Ji-un tightly. "Okay, I'll show proper technique this time." With determined eyes, Hye-ran attempted the move. Ji-un winced. "You need balance, not just blind strength." Hye-ran. Confused, Hye-ran asked, "Balance for what purpose?" Ji-un smiled knowingly. "You'll understand someday when trouble unexpectedly arrives." Far ahead, royal guards approached swiftly. Ji-un whispered, "The world isn't safe. Your training begins now." Palace guards rushed frantically. Eunuch Du entered Prince Seryang's quarters. Something terrible happened to His Highness. Prince Seryang placed his book aside, standing quickly. "Explain immediately. What disaster has struck the court?" Eunuch Du stammered. "Rumors claim His Highness's strength vanished overnight. Movement and recovery seem utterly impossible." Eyes wide with confusion, Prince Seryang muttered, "Vanished strength? What madness is this? Could this be poison?" Inside the chamber, Prince Seosam lay exhausted, unable to rise. To think, this happened, what a curse. Prince Seosam gasped painfully, clutching his chest. "Bring the tea, quickly!" His voice echoed through trembling halls. Hurried footsteps followed. Lady Mayong appeared, carefully holding the tray. "Father, your tea is finally here." Enraged, Prince Seosam yelled, "You wench!" His hand hurled the porcelain cup violently toward her trembling figure. The cup shattered near Lady Mayong's feet. "You care only for your husband now, neglecting me completely." Furious, Prince Seosam stood, his face twisted. "How dare you delay, you mannerless wen?" His voice cracked. Lady Mayong sat nervously, heart pounding. She sensed her father's unsettling eyes examining her every movement. Prince Seosam chuckled darkly. "Seosan has brought in a beautiful child. His taste in women resembles mine." Without warning, Prince Seosam lunged forward, grabbing Lady Mayong's wrist tightly. She gasped in shock and fear. Tears welled as Lady Mayong cried out, "No, don't do it! Please, this isn't right, father!" Prince Seosam ignored her plea, yanking her violently. The room echoed with despair as she struggled helplessly. Prince Seosam screamed in fury, veins bulging. "Useless girl! How dare you resist my direct commands?" He tightened his grip mercilessly. "Didn't I warn you? Why return here knowing the consequences, foolish child?" Suddenly, flames burst nearby. Prince Seosam's eyes widened in panic. His expression changed instantly to genuine fear. Terrified, he cried out, "Save me!" His trembling legs stumbled backward toward the dangerously growing flames. The brazier tipped over, embers spilling. Fire spread quickly across the delicate wooden floor without hesitation. The king sat silently, observing prisoners kneeling below. Tension filled the air as everyone awaited judgment. Finally, the king spoke. "Chief Inquisitor, report. What findings has the Royal Investigation Bureau uncovered?" Bowing respectfully, the Chief Inquisitor answered, "Your Majesty, Grand Prince Yangyang suffered severe injuries during this incident." The king's eyes narrowed. How could concubine Yun overpower a prince trained extensively in martial arts? Master Wu stepped forward. "Your Majesty, concubine Yun learned deadly techniques. Their methods target weaknesses without hesitation." Lady Mayong knelt silently, her thoughts heavy. Even though I survived, my dignity remains forever shattered. With trembling lips, she pleaded, "Please punish me, not others. This disgrace is entirely my responsibility, Majesty." The king sighed, recalling forgotten promises. He once called me his favorite nephew. Now, I'm a stranger. A minister stepped forward. "Your Majesty?" Grand Prince Suyong fought bravely. "Shall I explain the entire incident?" Beneath the moonlit sky, silence lingered. The minister finally confessed. First, he wasn't targeting lives, only aiming for escape. The king's voice thundered through the chamber. "Who is truly at fault for this disgraceful incident?" Chief Inquisitor hesitated, then admitted, "Your Majesty, based on facts, Grand Prince Yang Yang likely provoked this outcome." Minister of Justice added, "Considering Yang Yang's history, he probably attempted assault. Concubine Yun merely defended herself successfully." Lowering his head, the minister continued, "However, despite her reasons, Concubine Yun still harmed her father-in-law." The king leaned back, sighing heavily. "How troublesome. Even royal blood cannot prevent disgraceful scandals." "Tisk." Lady Mayong clenched her trembling fists. Her heart pounded. She knew her fate was now sealed. The king stood tall, his voice echoed coldly. "In other words, it's capital punishment. Execution is final." The king exhaled deeply. "Concubine Yun shall be punished with 80 flogging strikes. Implemented immediately." Under the night sky, the royal guards confirmed the order. "Yes, Your Majesty. Preparations are complete." The enforcer approached silently, gripping his cane tightly. His expression revealed no mercy for Lady Mayong. Lady Mayong's heart raced. Fear consumed her as she felt the cold floor beneath her hands. She gasped, "Ah!" as the executioner raised his arm high, the cane ready to strike mercilessly. Night fell over the palace. A distant drum echoed as punishment proceedings began under royal order. Lady Mayong flinched, her breath caught. She felt the wooden frame beneath her and gritted her teeth. The enforcer bound her hands tightly. She struggled briefly, then froze, unsure of what was coming next. He raised the cane above his head. "Ahem!" he warned. Lady Mayong's eyes widened in panic. The first strike landed. She screamed. Pain tore through her body with unbearable force and fear. The executioner hesitated. Suddenly a voice roared, "You bastard! What are you doing?" "Hit her harder." Chief Guard stormed forward. "Can't you hit her properly? That disgraceful woman deserves nothing but shattered legs." Sneering, he shouted, "A wretch like her mustn't ever dare stand before her father-in-law again." Pushing the executioner aside, he growled, "Out of my way, useless fool! I'll handle this personally." Eyes wild with anger, he raised the cane himself, preparing to deliver a merciless, punishing strike. A commanding voice interrupted, "That's enough, brother." The cane stopped mid-air, tension freezing the entire courtyard instantly. Confused whispers spread. The king narrowed his eyes. "What's happening? Who dares interrupt my final judgment?" The chief guard trembled. "Your Majesty, what's the meaning of this? Why delay rightful punishment?" The king's eyes darkened. "Do you truly wish to waste your life rotting in the palace dungeons?" Raising his hand slowly, the king declared, "Leave this to me. One more wrong move means exile." The king stepped forward, his outstretched hand trembling slightly. His voice echoed authority despite the tense atmosphere. The chief guard collapsed to his knees. Pain twisted his face as the king's words cut deeply. "Father forbade your presence in the capital," the king declared coldly. "Yet I showed you mercy. Despite burning 5 provinces, I silenced opposition for you. This time, no one will protect you." The king's brother lowered his head, defeated. "This will be the last time I show mercy, brother." The king's voice echoed across the courtyard. "Guards, place Grand Prince Yang Yang under house arrest immediately." Guards restrained the struggling prince. He shouted desperately, "You can't do this. I'm of royal blood." The king turned his back, ignoring the outburst. "I'm personally halting the execution. Enough suffering for today." With trembling hands, the executioner untied Lady Mayong. Relief washed over her exhausted, battered face silently. A court official stepped forward. "Your Majesty, Prince Seosin humbly expresses gratitude for your immeasurable kindness today." The king spoke calmly. "Prepare new residents. Move her quickly. And..." His gaze softened with unspoken understanding. Gently, he added, "You've endured enough. Rest peacefully. Nothing will trouble you anymore under my protection." Under the moonlit sky, Lady Mayong whispered, "Thank you, Your Majesty." Tears mixed with heartfelt gratitude. Not long after, the king ordered Grand Prince Yang Yang's family arrested, ensuring peace across the royal court. In time, happiness returned. Lady Mayong gave birth to her second child, a daughter named Ju Hyun. One peaceful morning, an attendant approached. "Your Highness, a guest has arrived. It's his first visit." Curious, the prince asked, "A first-time visitor?" The attendant nodded. "Yes, Your Highness. He awaits respectfully." The visitor bowed politely. "My name's Guanmin. I'm honored to meet a royal family member today." The prince asked, "Weren't you pursuing temple studies? Why suddenly visit the palace without prior notice?" Guanmin smiled faintly. My health faltered during training. Rest assured, I wouldn't disturb your highness unnecessarily. Guanmin smiled. I've adjusted now. Just came to express gratitude directly before returning again. The prince waved casually. No need for that. Besides, it's not like I taught you anything. Suddenly, Guanmin asked cheerfully, Then, would it be all right if I joined your daily exercises? The prince hesitated. If it were anyone else, sure. But Hao Weiji serves among our top ministers. Staring thoughtfully, the prince continued, I only worry such a talented man faces unnecessary hardship too early. The prince clenched his fists. Are you really comparing yourself to the nation's greatest living geniuses? Guanmin nodded firmly. Yes, I do. I've decided. I'll become a trainer no matter what. He smiled calmly. I've already informed His Majesty. I'm officially withdrawing from the Hall of Worthies. The decision was final. Sunlight beamed over the rooftops, signaling the start of Guanmin's new path. Beyond the training grounds, destiny awaited, a place where strength, discipline, and perseverance would shape the future. Standing tall, Hajiwi introduced himself confidently. I am the new disciple. Pleased to meet everyone. The seniors laughed heartily. An official like you lacks practical strength. Train alongside us and improve properly. Jiwi nodded with determination. Yes, please guide me. I'm eager to learn and improve every single day. Slightly embarrassed, Jiwi smiled. Allow me to demonstrate what I've practiced so far. I'll start immediately. Stepping forward, Jiwi pointed confidently. I'll begin with pull-ups first. The seniors exchanged surprised glances. Pull-ups, huh? The seniors teased. Let's see if you can even do one proper pull-up, rookie. Laughter echoed loudly. Grimacing, Jiwi grabbed the bar. I've trained 6 months, but barely reached 3 or 4 reps. With determination, he pulled hard. 5, 6! His muscles strained, veins bulging under the burning sunlight. A senior stammered. Your arms aren't fully extended. Jiwi gasped. Correct form matters more than chasing numbers. Finishing confidently, Jiwi smiled. 10, 11. Nearby seniors laughed. This new disciple really sparked everyone's training spirit again. Standing atop the overlook, Jiwi admired the endless horizon. How spectacular. Such vast, untamed beauty remains untouched. His companion chuckled. If we harvest those aludia trees, we'll easily produce 20,000 seen of valuable oil. Jiwi smiled knowingly. Silver's value is fleeting. I plan to gain something more precious on this journey. With curiosity, his companion asked, Something more precious? Jiwi nodded confidently. Yes. It is far more valuable. The king summoned his ministers urgently, declaring a dangerous disease had spread throughout the capital's borders. Minister Hong stepped forward cautiously, explaining their scouts discovered sick villagers near the southern trade route entrance. The king frowned deeply, commanding immediate quarantine. He ordered soldiers to investigate, ensure no merchants secretly entered. Outside the palace, a guard stood vigilant. His orders were clear: nobody passes without royal health inspection. Meanwhile, at the southern gate, panicked farmers gathered. One shouted desperately, Hurry! Someone bring the royal doctors! Old physician Ma collapsed suddenly, apologizing weakly. His journey was long, and his health had already worsened severely. Struggling to sit upright, physician Ma declared loyalty, offering his remaining strength to serve the suffering king. Coughing heavily, he admitted his back pain hindered treatment. His legs weakened, forcing him to abandon difficult cases. Physician Han watched silently, uncertain. Though assigned by the king, he doubted how much help remained possible. Finally, Han decided firmly. A royal order required results. Together, they would attempt treatment one final time. Huang Qi-sin, eldest son of Huang Huij, smirked confidently, suggesting the patient directly embrace warming energy. The old man, surprised, gasped. Unexpectedly, his stiff hands sensed warmth returning through the cold stone bench. His mind raced quickly. This wasn't ordinary warmth. Someone nearby was sharing life energy without direct touch. Struggling to sit up, the old man admitted honestly. Restoring complete body strength surpassed his current abilities. Qi-sin leaned forward, offering secret knowledge. He explained a unique healing art focusing on energy flow manipulation. Outside, the weather brightened. The old man chuckled faintly, grateful for their sincere efforts helping his condition. Despite lingering weakness, he respectfully admitted failure to fully recover but maintained his body using learned techniques. Minister Han expressed cautious optimism, wondering if continued warm therapy might help restore the official's fading strength. Suddenly, Huang Qi-sin snapped his fingers, realizing something important about balancing warmth without causing harmful excess. Turning back confidently, Qi-sin advised carefully regulating warmth. Excessive heat could easily disturb internal balance and recovery. Attendant Nam stood silently, wondering how warmth reached his chest despite standing under cold stone walls. He glanced down, startled. His own hand felt an unfamiliar warmth, as if touched by invisible energy. Outside, Huang Qi-sin prepared to leave, satisfied his guidance offered the elder a fighting chance. In the garden, officials discussed quietly, Even without medicines, internal strength methods seemed to show hopeful results. Walking side by side, they concluded sometimes forgotten traditions offered solutions beyond modern healing practices. Unfortunate, yet enlightening, the king paced before countless scrolls, concerned. He ordered a review of every report regarding southern diseases. Minister Park respectfully informed the king about strange warmth sensations experienced by several recovering officials. Recently, puzzled, the king questioned aloud. Could such warmth be harnessed intentionally as treatment, beyond simple herbal medicine? The minister explained calmly. Slow breathing exercises helped officials regain strength, surprising even experienced royal physicians. Smiling slightly, Minister Park added, strengthening internal energy wasn't new. Sometimes forgotten methods were simply the most effective. The king asked about envoy preparations. Minister Kim nodded respectfully, confirming plans to visit before his departure. Minister Kim confirmed his route through Nanjing, planning to return by boat after completing trade discussions. He explained livestock improvement was a key mission. Introducing stronger animals could improve the people's nutrition. The current pigs, small and weak, offered little value. Imported breeds could significantly improve local protein availability. Minister Kim confidently stated Chinese pigs were larger, easier to raise, and provided abundant meat for everyone. The king stared sharply, sensing hidden intentions. He knew seeking livestock alone wouldn't justify such an expedition. With suspicion, the king pressed further. He demanded Minister Kim reveal any undisclosed objectives behind this journey. Minister Kim hesitated. The king's concern about prolonged absence complicated persuasion, but retreat wasn't an option now. Kim explained the Ming Empire's vast resources. He hoped to secure grain supplies and improve agricultural practices. Finally, he added one personal goal: visiting Nanjing's grand libraries to collect rare books for future studies. The king leaned forward. Books, you say? Surely there's more behind your interest in ancient writings, Minister. Minister Kim admitted honestly. I wish to meet scholars in Ming. Their knowledge may strengthen our nation's future. The king pondered deeply. He knew the Ming harbored brilliant minds, but such encounters could change political balance. He warned Minister Kim to stay vigilant. Ming politics were dangerous, yet the journey might yield great wisdom. Finally, with a solemn expression, the king ordered, return safely. Bring knowledge but never compromise Joseon's dignity. Waves splashed against the pier. The ship prepared to depart, sails fluttering beneath the bright morning sun. Minister Kim turned back briefly. With a steady voice he promised, I'll return safely, my wife. His son ran forward, calling out. His small hands reached helplessly as the ship began moving away. His wife approached quietly, smiling despite worry. Why must you leave during such harsh times? She asked softly. Kim reassured her gently. His Majesty's orders demand it. Our people's future depends on what I bring back. As the ship prepared to sail, Minister Kim faced his comrades and offered them his heartfelt gratitude. Smiling warmly, he promised to return safely. I look forward to reuniting with you all, he said. One commander teased him lightly, accusing him of planning to skip responsibilities upon his safe return home. Minister Kim laughed, denying the accusation humorously. Joking aside, their bonds remained strong despite the looming separation. Another friend mentioned his rare vacation. Kim chuckled, crediting His Majesty's generosity for granting long-awaited personal rest. His son ran excitedly, proudly showing strength. Father, look, this sword feels light now, he shouted happily. Minister Kim laughed heartily, ruffling his son's hair. You've grown stronger, my boy, just wait for my return. Lifting his son briefly, he promised sincerely. When I return, we'll train together and practice even harder. Boarding the ship, he took one last look back, etching his family's faces firmly into memory. At the palace, the king sighed. From completing orders successfully to returning safely. I trust he'll manage both, Minister Kim spoke calmly, voice steady. I only have a small wish, nothing beyond this nation's prosperity. Gazing over the calm waters, he continued. I want Joseon strong and thriving, a homeland our people cherish. With conviction, he declared firmly, so that no one can ever look down upon us or our people. The ship sailed steadily along the open sea, nearing the foreign coast under strong and chilly winds. Shin Suk-ju sneezed forcefully, struggling to stay composed as the cold air pierced through his uniform. Despite his size, he felt weakness. His body faltered from prolonged exposure to harsh sea winds. Embarrassed, he bowed his head, knowing his illness risked disrupting communication duties crucial for the mission. The officer beside him watched silently, disappointed. Suk-ju apologized, aware of the mission's delicate importance abroad. Shin Suk-ju, designated interpreter, stood calmly as the ship's departure marked the mission's critical starting point. The sail unfurled with force. The vessel surged forward, catching strong ocean wind under clear skies. Another official leaned forward urgently, scanning ahead. His sharp eyes noticed something forming along the distant horizon. A faint shoreline emerged slowly from the blue, confirming they were finally approaching the diplomatic destination safely. Concerned about presentation, Shin Suk-ju questioned the cargo's condition. aware even minor issues could insult hosts. Envoys reported to the prince. Tensions rose as news confirmed foreign martial artists approached the harbor. Interpreter Nam Bin clenched his fist. Orders had come. Action was expected without further delay. Eyes sharpened. The prince understood this was no routine exchange. The kingdom's pride was on trial. He declared they'd compete directly, using their own strength to prove Joseon's worth without retreat. The entire delegation reacted in shock, stunned by the bold challenge and the high expectations ahead. The delegation stood before the massive palace gate, awed by its size and architectural grandeur. One envoy compared the structure's scale to Hanyang, realizing their capital paled beside this vast construction. Eunuch Changsheng appeared, his demeanor confident. He clearly held high status within the foreign court's hierarchy. Shin Suk-ju asked about their audience schedule, careful not to sound impatient before an elite official. They were reminded firmly that Prince Shixing wasn't easily approached. Access required approval from the emperor himself. Eunuch Changsheng raised a concern regarding the official meeting schedule and timeline for receiving the delegation. Shin Suk-ju was shocked. A 40-day wait seemed excessive for such a high-priority mission. Changsheng casually shifted focus, asking about the tributes, especially curious about the products they had brought from Joseon. He mentioned trying the soap earlier, expressing surprise at its quality and acknowledging its practical usefulness. Despite the wait, the envoy smiled politely, relieved their offering was appreciated even if still imperfect. Changsheng raised an eyebrow after hearing the soap had been improved. He questioned their inventory capacity immediately. The Joseon envoy responded confidently, showing the soap prepared in large quantity with backup stock for inspection. Curious, Changsheng smelled the soap closely. The subtle mix of floral and ginseng fragrance caught his interest. He acknowledged the quality, then made a sarcastic remark about poor countries doing something impressive for once. Changsheng changed topics, mentioning the Joseon prince's appearance, hinting at rumors of strength and reputation spreading. Changsheng continued explaining court procedures, but was interrupted by a guard urgently approaching from the courtyard. The sudden shout caught everyone's attention. Changsheng turned, annoyed by the disruption in front of guests. The guard hesitated, struggling to deliver confusing news as others nearby listened carefully for context. Frustrated, Changsheng snapped, demanding clarity. His patience wore thin as the explanation failed to make sense. The palace loomed quietly, its stillness contrasting with the rising tension among the diplomatic officials outside. Su Yang respectfully bowed before the Ming emperor, speaking on behalf of the Joseon delegation's arrival. He praised the emperor's reputation, acknowledging his peaceful reign while exaggerating formal flattery to show respect. The emperor responded calmly, recognizing Joseon's king and his sons, especially noting rumors about the second prince. He recalled using their soap recently, expressing surprise at its cleansing strength and effective skin results. Pleased, the Joseon envoy smiled. Talk shifted toward potential trade deals, starting with soap distribution and quality. As the emperor watched silently, unease spread among the ministers. Something about the moment felt tense. The envoy received permission to leave, but he sensed a strange discomfort hanging heavily in the air. Outside, the Joseon delegation walked calmly. However, subtle glances from soldiers hinted that something had changed. Footsteps echoed oddly. One official muttered, confused by the shift in mood during their quiet departure. Hidden within shadows, foreign ministers whispered angrily, displeased by Joseon envoys gaining attention and royal favor. Sweat dripped as tension rose. The Joseon envoy realized someone important had been waiting to confront them. A calm voice greeted them. The official acknowledged their arrival with a tone that suggested deeper intentions. Facing the group, he offered respectful words, but his posture showed this meeting held serious meaning. He thanked them, crediting their influence for enabling his rare audience with the emperor so quickly. Smiling, he hinted at deeper knowledge, suggesting familiarity with someone crucial from the Joseon royal family. The official continued speaking, sharing rumors of the prince's strength and how subjects respected him deeply. He noted the prince's reputation included not just strength, but intelligence, further elevating Joseon's image. Impressed, he complimented the soap's effect, expressing daily use made him feel cleansed and revitalized. Curious, he asked about pricing. The envoy explained it varied by ingredients used in each soap. The ginseng soap cost 10 rice bags, while scented variants were priced at 6 per bar. The official calculated soap value, equating it to silver currency. The economic implications were becoming very clear. Hearing the numbers, another envoy considered future trade. The price seemed reasonable for quality and scale. However, one Joseon official grew alarmed. The foreigner was asking about production methods, not just cost. To deflect, the Joseon envoy revealed only a harmless detail mentioning kelp as a key ingredient base. The foreign official chuckled knowingly, realizing the answer was intentional. The real formula was still protected. Despite curiosity, the foreign official admitted sea bans made kelp harvesting nearly impossible under current trade policies. The Joseon envoy remained polite, requesting continued production of soap in secret to avoid diplomatic restrictions. Still interested, the official asked if they could increase supply, especially of the widely favored scented soap. With confidence, the envoy responded by asking how much was needed to fulfill the foreign demand. The reply came quickly, 10,000 gyun, a staggering amount signaling the seriousness of their growing trade interest. Murmurs spread through the court as the foreign official hinted there was more to his identity. He revealed the envoy's true status. Su Yang, second son of the Joseon king, now confirmed. Calmly, he introduced himself as Wang Zhen, powerful eunuch, and head of the Ministry of Rites. Wang Zhen stood firm, reminding them of his authority as the chief eunuch of the rites. He asked if there was anything else they desired. Now that the trade deal was successful, Su Yang politely requested permission to travel and observe markets across the empire before returning home. Wang Zhen hinted at deeper intentions. He was willing to pay well if Su Yang wanted money. The Joseon officials were stunned. Wang Zhen casually offered 70,000 silver as if it meant nothing. Su Yang thought carefully, believing that grain seeds and livestock were ultimately more valuable than silver alone. He thanked Wang Zhen sincerely, assuring that Joseon would send more soap in future shipments. Wang Zhen agreed thoughtfully, finding the barter idea reasonable and showing rare approval through his expression. He promised the Joseon envoys their journey in the Ming Empire would be smooth and respectful. One envoy commented quietly. Now understanding why the Ming court had been so drawn to the soap, Su Yang was shocked by the Ming court's outrageous idea of using cucumbers for skincare purposes. He questioned the logic behind it. Unsure if this practice was meant as medicine or mockery, the Joseon officials sat silently, confused by Ming's obsession with strange, non-scientific skincare methods and beliefs. Su Yang thought to himself Ming had influence, but clearly lacked reliable knowledge in personal hygiene care. The next day, the delegation traveled into town, prepared to begin the next stage of diplomacy. The Joseon envoys were greeted outside by Ming officials confirming their identities before proceeding with arrangements. A representative explained that the Ministry of Rites had arranged everything to ensure a smooth tour. Everyone marveled at the carriage's luxury. Its size and detail clearly symbolized elite-level diplomatic treatment. The envoys hesitated, unsure if such extravagance was truly meant for them or a mistake. They were reassured this was the smaller one. The prince's personal carriage would be even grander. While traveling, an envoy looked out cautiously, aware the bumpy ride covered long distances between cities. Inside the carriage, another envoy requested the window be shut to block incoming dust and debris. The man coughed hard, frustrated, noting dust followed them in both Ming and Joseon lands alike. Prince Su Yang acknowledged the complaint silently, recognizing that his companion's frustration was not without reason. He reflected smooth paved roads like Rome's wouldn't appear in most civilizations until centuries into the future. Shin Suk-ju sat slouched against the wall, quiet and lost in thought as the carriage moved. Another envoy scolded him gently, pointing out that there was a proper seat available right beside him. Su Yang spoke firmly, reminding him that longing for family shouldn't mean neglecting discipline and self-respect. He emphasized caring for the body as a duty to one's parents and to proper conduct. Suddenly, Su Yang noticed Shin's belly protruding and blurted out a sharp comment causing instant embarrassment. Shin Suk-ju shouted in disbelief, offended by the sudden attention drawn to his weight and posture. Su Yang continued calmly, pointing out his coughing, lack of exercise, and breathlessness from minimal walking effort. Faced with undeniable truths, Shin collapsed dramatically. Overwhelmed by facts that revealed his poor physical condition, Su Yang stepped forward with a smirk, announcing he had something special prepared for Shin's benefit. He explained their next journey required covering 1,800 li to Changsan, hinting physical training was about to begin. Su Yang dragged Shin Suk-ju out of the carriage, determined to start his physical training immediately. Shin screamed in terror as he was forced to begin climbing the steep mountain trail at sunset. 12 days later, the delegation finally arrived at Changsan. The city lit beautifully under the full moon. An official commended them for their endurance. Su Yang responded humbly, saying he owed it to kindness. Despite exhaustion, Shin Suk-ju felt grateful and relieved. Their arrival marked the end of an intense journey. The Joseon envoys were welcomed by local officials, already informed of their arrival through prior communication. The governor-general greeted them warmly, acknowledging their long journey and inviting them to begin with dinner. A generous table was prepared. The scent of unfamiliar but rich dishes filled the dining hall. Servants announced the meal with enthusiasm, presenting the main dish, bright, steaming noodles garnished with exotic toppings. The Joseon delegates were surprised. The food looked strange, with noodles that appeared unlike anything they knew. A local official explained the origin of the first dish, tracing it back to the Yuan Dynasty. Next, a platter of neatly arranged boiled beef was served, introduced with pride and ceremonial flair. Chopsticks lifted a slice for tasting. The envoy prepared to evaluate this traditional dish with full focus. He found the pork decent, but immediately frowned, commenting that the beef was poorly raised and underwhelming. He compared the flavor to malnourished cattle, subtly criticizing the livestock standards without directly offending the host. One envoy muttered disappointment, criticizing the waste of quality meat due to improper cooking technique. He tried to lighten the mood, laughing awkwardly, then asked if others actually liked the pork dish. Another guest responded cheerfully, confirming the pork tasted great and praising it without hesitation or reserve. Laughter echoed around the table as the envoys relaxed, enjoying the meal despite earlier criticism and confusion. Elsewhere, under a moonlit sky, the capital of the Ming Empire, Beijing, awaited the next chapter. A Ming official reflected quietly outside the governor's residence, watching over Changshan under the moonlight. He recalled escorting the Joseon prince, and recognizing the envoy's importance as the king's own son. Another official questioned his motives, wondering why he supported envoys from a small, distant tributary nation. Wang Zhen responded calmly, remembering when he became a eunuch with barely a single silver coin. He looked at his reflection in the wine, thinking how much power he had gained since. Wang Zhen sat alone in his chamber, quietly sipping wine as moonlight filtered through the window. He tossed the cup aside, his mind already racing with thoughts far beyond the night's peace. Looking ahead with sharp focus, he whispered that he was eager to see what comes next. He wondered aloud what 50,000 yang truly meant to Joseon's second prince, clearly planning something deeper. A massive pig stood before them. Its size immediately drew attention from the visiting Joseon officials. One envoy noted its bulk rivaled a wild boar, though it lacked tusks, confirming it was domestic. A local explained proudly that their pigs could reach 200 gyun in just 1 year's time. To evaluate the quality, Su Yang requested a portion be cut for proper inspection and tasting. Impressed by its size, he remarked it could feed an entire nation even if only one was sent. Su Yang suggested they compare other pigs first, before deciding which one to bring as tribute. He warned that sending a pig without care could cause diplomatic trouble and political embarrassment for Joseon. Their journey continued. The Joseon delegation arrived at Luoyang, another major city within the Ming Empire. They observed that Luoyang's population and activity matched Beijing's, revealing the vast scale of the Ming domain. One envoy noted how unusual it felt to see so many people acting freely outside the capital. While exploring the streets, one envoy overheard merchants loudly promoting something related to strength and vitality. They listened closer. A local shouted about a soap that builds muscle using the Joseon prince's name. Alarmed, one envoy realized the vendors were illegally using Prince Su Yang's identity to promote the product. Su Yang watched calmly. Recognizing the rapid spread of their influence since arriving in the Ming Empire, he smiled, flexing confidently, and warned they'd face him directly if any more problems were caused. Su Yang flexed his muscles confidently, asserting he didn't need gimmicks, he had real physical strength. One of his retainers panicked, trying to stop him before things escalated further in public. Nearby, a vendor exaggerated claims saying their pills, using Joseon ginseng, could grant unmatched physical power. He pointed to a muscular man, claiming he ate 100 pills and gained massive strength instantly. Crowds stared at Su Yang in awe, shocked by his build and wondering if it was real. Su Yang boldly declared he needed no enhancement pills, challenging the muscular man with his natural strength. The vendor was stunned by Su Yang's confidence. Realizing a public strength contest was about to begin, he nervously admitted that someone with such physique clearly didn't require the advertised ginseng pills at all. Su Yang stepped forward, questioning the vendor's false claim about receiving ginseng directly from the Joseon prince. Flustered, the vendor shouted defensively, denying familiarity and questioning who Su Yang even was in return. Su Yang clenched his fists, fully prepared to respond to the vendor's disrespect with direct strength. He proudly declared his true identity, Grand Prince Su Yang from Joseon, surprising the crowd with his commanding presence. Panicked, the vendor ordered his strongest ally, the youngest bodyguard, to confront Su Yang in combat. The muscular opponent charged with a powerful strike, initiating a fierce hand-to-hand challenge between both men. Their fists collided with massive force, shaking the ground and drawing all attention to the explosive clash. The opponent trembled in disbelief. He had never felt physically inferior to anyone before this moment. Despite his size and power, he questioned why he was being overpowered so easily by Su Yang. Su Yang answered firmly, stating the truth: he simply had more refined muscle, strength, and control overall. With a powerful throw, Su Yang slammed the opponent to the ground, ending the fight decisively. As the dust settled, Su Yang stood tall, composed, and victorious, his dominance clearly unquestioned. The vendor panicked, realizing their strongest fighter had lost, shattering their claim of world-class strength instantly. In full retreat, they shouted regret, knowing they had severely underestimated the strength of their opponent. Su Yang grinned quietly, unaffected, his confidence undisturbed. As the crowd began whispering and turning toward him, he revealed his powerful physique again, a clear statement to those watching and doubting his strength. Surrounded by stunned onlookers, Su Yang flexed proudly, declaring himself the true embodiment of Joseon's strength. Spectators were so impressed by Su Yang's physique that an artist suggested sculpting it into stone. The artist explained he planned to carve a new Buddha, and Su Yang's body inspired him. Meanwhile, Su Yang's retainers found him again, asking if he had secured anything meaningful during their trip. He admitted it was too early to finalize a pig breed and asked about their progress. They reported finding old books in poor condition and planned to ship them back to Joseon first. The envoy secured a large batch of seeds but worried about their adaptability back in Joseon. Soo-young praised everyone's effort, then discovered a document believed to be from ancient Baekje script. Excited, he recognized it contained the inscription of Chu Suiliang, a famed calligrapher from the Tang Dynasty. Another scholar confirmed its authenticity and expressed strong interest in examining the historically important writing up close. A second onlooker identified a biography of Duke Dan, eagerly asking to see the text as well. On March 11, 1443, the Joseon delegation approached the massive Jinghang waterway near Hongzhi Lake. Stunned by its scale, one envoy asked if the enormous vessel before them was truly a ship. They compared it to Joseon's turtle ship but admitted this Ming vessel dwarfed it in size. Su-yang explained it was from Emperor Yonggle's naval expeditions, once led by the great Admiral Zheng He. He added they should visit the shipyard in Nanjing, reflecting on how 3 months had already passed. Back in Joseon, officials met with the crown prince inside the palace to discuss military advancements. The king inquired about the research on Huapo, a small handheld cannon recently developed by court engineers. He expressed doubt, unsure if such a small weapon could be useful beyond frightening the enemy. The crown prince clarified that its compact design allowed it to be mobile and fired while moving. He concluded that if every soldier had a Huapo, they could attack freely during combat maneuvers. The official explained a report about a soldier surviving an ambush due to wearing only light leather. Because the arrow was weak and the man had no armor, the wound wasn't immediately fatal. Had the arrow been stronger, it would have pierced clean through his body and killed him instantly. A young engineer stepped forward, saying he had been testing new designs using counterweight sticks for breakthroughs. He began demonstrating a prototype with a spinning motion, eager to prove his improved firing concept. The young engineer aimed his new device steadily, preparing to test its precision and counterweight mechanics publicly. Zhang carefully sipped his drink, savoring the silence that accompanied his long-awaited break from duty. A cool breeze passed by as he exhaled deeply, settling into the peaceful rural tavern seat. Despite the calm, Zhang's thoughts drifted to the palace and the emperor's stern, expectant gaze. He leaned forward, asking aloud what would please his majesty: training, loyalty, or unwavering personal strength. Suddenly, the wooden training dummy laughed mockingly, breaking his thought. "Your jokes are going too far." Zhang enjoyed his drink, amused by the wooden dummy. Unaware someone was approaching from behind unexpectedly. A soldier entered the tavern, recognizing Zhang immediately. His presence hinted at official business interrupting Zhang's break. Zhang, dropping formalities, made a simple request for food, choosing to stay grounded despite his known status. The tavern host quickly prepared the fish. Smoke rose as the herring grilled over open fire. Zhang took a bite, but his face twisted. The fish tasted spoiled, and something felt wrong. Zhang's face tightened as a strange realization hit. This wasn't just spoiled fish, something was wrong. A bystander explained the fish was cleaned with alcohol, effective but risky, depending on how it's handled. The vendor admitted the herring sat too long before grilling. Zhang's suspicions about poor storage deepened quickly. Someone mentioned a special liver method. If mastered, it could preserve herring freshness for over half a month. Elsewhere, a large ship surfaced. A crew prepared a haul of fish, signaling a major operation. A massive net of fish was hauled onto the ship, marking the start of urgent processing. Zhang issued instructions, rapidly gutting, salting, and rotating the workers to maintain efficiency and preserve fish quality. A crew member proudly revealed a pulley system he built, improving speed thanks to gym training knowledge. Salted fish piled up quickly in baskets, glistening under the sun, ready for long-term storage and transport. One worker questioned the method's effectiveness, wondering if quick salting could really preserve freshness for half a month. The processed fish piled high. Their numbers exceeded expectations, demanding swift decisions about storage and future plans. A worker noted they had more than 10 times the usual load, over 1,000 fresh fish. Zhang explained how expanded storage now allowed fish to be enjoyed raw, not just salted or dried. His thoughts shifted toward scaling operations. A stronger boat could push into distant waters for larger hauls. Looking toward the horizon, Zhang decided firmly he must report everything to His Highness immediately, without delay. A royal decree was announced loudly. Its urgency echoed through the village, gathering everyone's attention immediately. The order named Ma Il-yang, a disciple of Grand Prince Su-yang, as its key executor. He declared a new initiative, building a hall for discipline, training, and preparation of the physical body. The goal was clear: recruit 20 sons from defeated noble families to begin strict re-education under his guidance. These chosen youths would be trained to rebuild honor, control their actions, and strengthen their physical discipline. A month later, training continued at the estate. Discipline halls stood quiet under the clear blue sky. Ma Il-yang reflected on old days with His Highness, wondering if his current efforts truly worked. Despite his encouragement, the disciples only responded when Prince Seogin taught, ignoring Ma's own lessons completely. Standing shirtless and frustrated, Ma noticed the disciples showed no interest when he spoke or demonstrated directly. He sighed, recalling a warning. Those who fail the annual exam will be exiled to Hamgil province. One disciple overheard the exile news and froze, realizing the exam was more serious than expected. Suddenly, a massive figure appeared. It was His Highness, returning with unmatched muscles and fierce presence. The disciple stuttered, stunned to see the prince in person. His presence brought immediate pressure and tension. With intense energy, His Highness declared warm-ups. The disciple screamed in dread, knowing what was about to happen. Another instructor watched silently, sweat forming, fully aware that serious training was now beginning without compromise. Prince Siogen questioned the disciple's performance, waiting for an answer to the ongoing problem he had posed. He pointed towards stacked weights, suggesting physical strength training as the best method for those lacking discipline. Outside, students groaned under the sun, straining with effort. Their struggle proved the training was extremely difficult. One disciple gasped for air as Siogen scolded him, still unable to solve the core challenge given. Observing quietly, another trainer frowned. The results were lacking, and it was clear a new approach was needed. The trainer stood firm, arms crossed, watching the disciple struggle closely with a serious, judging expression. Desperate, the disciple shouted he understood the lesson, straining hard to lift the weight once more. The trainer smirked. The disciple's answers matched perfectly, so more weight would be added to test him further. A heavy plate slammed down. The disciple groaned loudly, muscles shaking under the growing physical and mental pressure. His partner yelled with urgency. Losing in a strength contest now would ruin their team's entire momentum. The disciple gritted his teeth, vowing not to be the only one enduring this harsh training. Fueled by pain, he promised to pass the burden down. Others would face weightlifting trials too. That mindset spread. Weightlifting as the answer became a growing principle across all corners of Joseon. Far away in Ming Empire's capital, Nanjing, new voices reflected on the state of the provinces. Two men observed the city's pace, surprised by how advanced local reforms were, especially in calendar systems. Fresh vegetables filled the market. One man observed that non-rice farming seemed far more profitable recently. He explained that rice remained central in Joseon, as food security was always the highest survival priority. Historically, Joseon faced constant threats, raiders, and invasions, forcing the nation to emphasize stable, state-managed food production systems. Still, the scene of a muscular farmer in vegetable fields proved it was time to evolve forward. Arriving in Jiangnan, travelers suggested enjoying local produce, hinting at growing interest in regional agricultural products. Hungry guests shouted for food. The loud clatter of dishes signaled urgency and impatience in the room. Startled servers stumbled over each other, rushing to deliver the ordered meals before tensions rose even higher. Everyone froze for a moment. The hosts and guests exchanged a sharp, uncertain glance before the first bite. The server announced a live fried carp dish still twitching. Guests were warned to avoid touching the moving head. Next came a roasted piglet, deboned and stir-fried, offering a feast prepared for unrestricted hearty consumption. An elaborate seafood dish was served, richly sauced and carefully garnished, an unmistakable signature of Ming cuisine. The guests were amazed by the presentation, unsure how to react to such unfamiliar culinary extravagance. They tasted the food cautiously. It was bold, flavorful, and filled with spices never used in Joseon. As the plates emptied, calm returned. With satisfaction, everyone prepared to hear what would come next. The host stood confidently and smiled. "Now that you're full, there's someone important I'd like introduced." After finishing their meal, the nobles leaned back in satisfaction, unaware of the events soon unfolding. Prince Youngjik, with determined eyes, prepared to introduce a man who could change Joseon's future forever. Far away, the Nanjing shipyard buzzed with activity. Crates, timber, and sailors moved with tireless, synchronized purpose. Among them stood a rugged stranger, recently arrived from sea, known for his strength and rough reputation. His presence stirred tension. Veterans sensed he carried a mission larger than trade, something bound to disrupt order. The dockworkers whispered after learning the muscular man was an official envoy from the royal Joseon court. Realizing the mistake, the younger sailor panicked. He had nearly shown disrespect to an important foreign dignitary. The envoy recalled hearing of the man's reputation. He had engineered great ships for past royal expeditions. Fang Jishu, former naval shipbuilder, explained his final warship was meant to escort a mighty flagship. With warships retired, he now built merchant vessels, quietly making a living beneath the shadow of greatness. Fang Jishu was startled by the prince's question, unsure of where the conversation was heading. The prince asked if Jishu had experience with other ship types. Curious about his broader knowledge, Jishu admitted he'd learned extensively through hands-on work, driven by deep fascination with various regional ship designs. He proudly listed models he contributed to Fujian, Guangxi, and Guangdong ships, each reflecting regional function and design evolution. Noticing Jishu's passion, the prince proposed, "Why not bring those skills to Joseon for new development?" Fang Jishu passionately declared his dream, constructing massive ships capable of mastering the harsh, open ocean. He refused the idea of downsizing. Smaller ships, he believed, couldn't match his ambitions or skills. The prince remained calm, noting how engineers shared one trait: unyielding pride regardless of nation or environment. He quietly revealed a new sketch, a compact boat designed for rowing and sailing in shallows. Jiju was surprised to learn the small craft could outperform large ships in daily fishing efficiency. The sketch revealed a single-mast vessel slicing cleanly through waves, compact, yet powerful in performance. The prince acknowledged Jiju's pride, but challenged him to redefine greatness through strategic, efficient engineering instead. He argued that building a better small boat was no less noble than creating a giant warship. Before parting, the prince invited him to visit Joseon's port within 10 days to begin collaboration. Meanwhile, in a quiet riverside area outside Nanjing, the prince's team prepared for what came next. In the fields, workers examined lettuce, closely checking root length and selecting only those absorbing enough water. The prince explained the importance of long roots, ensuring vegetables thrive even when buried deep in soil. He emphasized selecting only strong seeds, believing better harvest began with careful observation and strict standards. Nearby, a farmer was asked about a pig's growth, how long it took to reach full size. He proudly said it took over a year to raise one weighing more than 240 gin. The farmer admitted raising such pigs was hard work, but he took pride in the results. The prince challenged him confidently, stating even this prized black pig wouldn't be enough to impress Joseon. He promised delivery of a whole pig, properly raised and measured, by tomorrow without any delay. As sunset painted the sky, the prince reflected the real challenge was finally beginning with unknown variables. Though profits from soap trade could repay the borrowed silver, he remained cautious of uncertain allies' motives. As the sun set, the prince pondered quietly whether his confidence would truly be enough tomorrow. From above, he noticed preparations in motion workshops were active, and livestock had already been weighed and tagged. He smiled faintly, realizing that despite delays, Joseon's team had begun preparing with remarkable quiet discipline. Advisors and workers gathered below, assuring him they had followed every royal instruction down to the letter. Materials were lined up along the shore, ready for shipment at dawn. Tonight was for final checks. As the group sailed toward Joseon, one envoy expressed concern about how Hanyang might react. Another worried how their tribute would be received, unsure if it met court expectations or standards. The prince reassured them, confident the royal court would welcome innovation, and the hall would fill quickly. Back in the capital, a palace messenger rushed in, urgently calling out to the king. He shouted breathlessly news had arrived, and it was so important, it disrupted morning court routine entirely. The king, sweating from exercise, was interrupted mid-workout and demanded the news be truly important. He warned the messenger that a trivial report would lead to harsh punishment without further explanation. The messenger quickly announced that the diplomatic envoys had successfully returned from the foreign port mission. The king was pleased until learning pigs had escaped, causing confusion and noise all over the capital. Annoyed, the king dismissed it, assuming the animals were just imported livestock from the trade route. A court official nervously reported that one of the escaped pigs weighed 45 kilograms in total. The king, shocked by the number, stared blankly. He hadn't expected livestock this heavy from the delegation. Outside, chaos erupted. Pigs sprinted through straw paths as guards shouted and struggled to contain them. A guard was thrown down. Confused, he shouted, was this even a pig? Or some hybrid creature? The prince demanded action, furious. If they were soldiers, why couldn't they even catch runaway pigs? The pig charged furiously. Mistaking a royal guard's red robes for a threat, it aimed with precision. The guard panicked, clinging tightly, but the pig thrashed violently, refusing to be held back. Despite resistance, the enraged animal shook free and sprinted ahead, leaving the soldier tumbling backward in dust. Determined to act, the envoy grabbed a piglet mid-run and wrestled it into his arms swiftly. Panting and covered in dirt, he sighed if Joseon saw this chaos. What remained of his pride? Two pigs wander through a field, sniffing around and enjoying the fresh air on a peaceful day, and one pig looks back at the other, clearly startled by the noise of nearby movement. The two men observe the pigs, commenting on their destructive nature and resemblance to wild boars. A man, wearing royal attire, speaks to the pigs with a casual tone. Approaching them slowly, he addresses the pigs with a hint of humor, noting their long journey to reach Joseon's lands. The man holds a bundle of straw, smiling as he continues his casual conversation with the pigs. The pig stares back at him, its expression confused and uncertain about the human's intentions. And then, he notes the pig's hunger, hinting that it isn't as ordinary as it seems. The man continues speaking, revealing his thoughts on the pig's future, looking at it with a knowing grin. A different tone emerges, and the pig's curiosity grows about this strange human who seems unusual. The two men walk together, discussing the upcoming challenges, with one speculating on potential reforms and changes. One man mentions the public work to be done, indicating that it will require significant effort. He shares his knowledge, mentioning agricultural techniques from the Ming Empire that could help Joseon's growth. With optimism, the man believes these methods will change the country's diet and improve public health. As they walk, the conversation shifts to discussing talent, specifically a person named Fang Zhen, who's mentioned. The man addresses a skilled craftsman, complimenting his work and emphasizing how useful such craftsmanship is. He mentions the importance of having someone with enthusiasm and how it adds to their value. Another man agrees, saying it's essential for them to have someone with a passion for craft. They discuss their goal to improve, with one man mentioning his experience and how he learned. The conversation shifts to technology, where a man humbly suggests his skills are merely focused on crafting tools. The instructor announces he will teach a new method, calling it CrossFit, and preparing to demonstrate. He explains that these exercises will help clear the mind and move away from old habits. As he shows the movements, he encourages the group to watch closely and learn the technique. The instructor demonstrates a new exercise, calling it burpees, and explaining how it helps improve fitness. The group reacts with excitement, eager to try, hoping the new workout will bring noticeable results. The instructor begins the workout routine, stating that the first exercise is 20 repetitions of burpees. Next, he demonstrates box jumps, explaining that the second exercise requires jumping over a high log stack. The third exercise is kettlebell swings, where the goal is to complete 20 swings with a 20 kilograms weight. The instructor adds that the final exercise is 20 squats with weights, ensuring the participants understand the goal. He encourages them to repeat the routine twice, take breaks, and prepare for the intense training ahead. The man cries out in frustration, feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the workout and unable to continue. He struggles to breathe, his face showing signs of exhaustion as he tries to push through. Unable to handle the strain, he gasps, feeling like he's about to collapse from exhaustion. He stumbles, warning the others that he might vomit from the intense physical effort he's enduring. Concerned, the instructor reacts quickly, noticing his distress, worried about his condition and what comes next. The instructor laughs, revealing that he once felt the same way, sharing his past struggles. He continues, explaining how the hard work pays off despite the challenges faced during training. After a long explanation, he urges the trainee to focus, instructing him to study after the workout. The man struggles, feeling exhausted and questioning how he's supposed to study with his body so drained. He sighs deeply, overwhelmed, clearly unsure about how to continue studying, while still feeling physically spent. The two men discuss the famous figures of history, noting their focus on a particular training method. One man expresses confusion, unable to understand how the method worked, questioning its true effectiveness. The other man continues, introducing a famous calligrapher's work to clarify the potential of discipline and focus. He reveals that the library not only stores books but also features intricate carvings and artwork. The conversation shifts to the tools used for creating records, showcasing the variety of writing instruments available. The older brother agrees, expressing interest in visiting a place where Confucius's descendants reside for learning. He mentions that their father seemed pleased with the diplomatic mission's outcome and asked for his opinion. The younger brother listens closely, surprised by his father's request, eager to know the next steps. The older brother shifts the conversation, asking if the younger one has noticed a significant transformation. He smiles, asking about the physical change in the assistant scribe, noting his impressive physical progress. The older brother grins, humorously mentioning how his muscles are now too large to lift heavy objects. He jokes that his younger brother will never understand how hard it is to lift a dumbbell. Despite his jokes, the older brother admits his muscles are still quite strong, though he faces some challenges. The younger brother questions whether the older one ever had a different passion, one that wasn't fitness. The older brother laughs, promising to personally train the younger brother, urging him to strengthen their bond. The man proudly holds up his newly created weapon, explaining that it is his latest invention. He demonstrates the weapon's power, sending a forceful strike through the air with a swift motion. The weapon's effectiveness is evident as it cuts through the air, traveling both close and far with ease. He then asks for the opinion of his companion, curious about what improvements the weapon might need. The companion responds, contemplating the weapon's design as he watches it in action, intrigued by its potential. The man nods in agreement, confirming that the talented individual from Joseon has a unique skill set. He mentions that if this individual creates something valuable, he should inform the higher authorities immediately. The conversation continues as they discuss the importance of detailed drawings, which can significantly increase an item's value. He then questions if there's anything in Joseon as valuable as silver coins, pondering the economy's worth. The man proudly holds up his invention, a large firearm designed to shoot long distances with precision. Initially, the weapon was designed to rest on the shoulder, but adjustments were necessary for comfort. After testing, the shoulder method proved difficult to manage, so a new design was created. The new method involves placing the firearm between the side and arm, allowing for better control. The man describes the weapon as revolutionary, similar to the ones used in the Goryeo Dynasty. The man confidently holds his firearm, explaining that this invention could potentially change the battlefield for soldiers. He continues, stating the limitation of the weapon in situations where enemies are attacking directly, making it difficult. Determined to prove the weapon's effectiveness, he decides to demonstrate it by firing the weapon himself. The shot is fired, but the bullet misses the target completely, showing that accuracy still needs improvement. He acknowledges the issue, realizing that adjustments are needed to improve the accuracy for future use. The man ponders adjusting the size of the weapon, considering sacrificing some power for improved practicality and mobility. He then asks about any alternatives for the firing method, wondering if there's a more efficient approach. His companion hesitates but suggests a possible solution, though the details remain uncertain at this point. Suddenly, a rustling sound interrupts their conversation, causing both men to turn their attention toward the source. The man asks if the sound was just his imagination, clearly concerned about the unexpected noise. A royal figure arrives and asks if the man's invention is ready for demonstration, showing great interest. The man confirms the arrival of the royal guest and is eager to showcase his creation. The royal asks if the weapon could replicate the precision and power of other famous weapon designs. Without hesitation, the man demonstrates the weapon, proudly showing its effectiveness by firing it at a target. The royal watches intently as the shot is fired, clearly impressed with the weapon's capabilities. The man fires the weapon, and the shot is seen flying through the air toward the target. As expected, the bullet hits the target accurately, impressing the onlookers with the weapon's precision. He explains that high accuracy requires steady eyes and the ability to align the weapon correctly. However, he admits there's another challenge to overcome, one that may need further testing and adjustment. The royal watches intently, noting that more work is still required, but the weapon shows great potential. The man, frustrated, attempts to perfect his technique, while his companion observes and offers critical advice. He encourages the man to focus, stating that his stance and technique must be perfected for success. A discussion ensues about the design and how the drawing of the weapon needs clear instructions. They talk about the challenges of creating a usable prototype, but the solution is within reach. The man decides to refine his work, determined to improve and finalize the design for practical use. The royal figure comments on the preparations, noting that the team has been thorough in their efforts. He continues, observing how the military officials are taking their task seriously, particularly inside the royal palace. Despite the preparation, he expresses concern about potential malfunctions with the weapons, worrying about their reliability. The military leader gives an order, commanding the preparation for the firing of the infantry cannon without delay. An officer responds immediately, instructing his subordinates to fill the firearm with gunpowder, ensuring readiness. The officer prepares the weapon, making sure to load it correctly before the firing sequence begins. He instructs his subordinate to insert the pellet into the muzzle, ensuring the weapon is ready to fire. The other soldiers look on, confused and concerned, wondering why the weapon is making so much noise. The commander, familiar with such weapons, calmly remarks that the sound is typical for those without battle experience. With the preparation complete, the order to fire is given, and the weapon is discharged. The officer carefully aims and fires the weapon, the shot echoing as it cuts through the air. The weapon discharges with a loud bang, surprising the onlookers as it strikes the target. The soldiers eagerly await the results, keeping their eyes on the target to see if it hits. The officer orders a check on the target's condition, eager to confirm whether the shot was successful. The report comes in, 1 shot, 1 hit. The target has been struck, proving the weapon's power. The soldiers are surprised, noticing only 1 shot was fired, questioning why the weapon didn't do more. One soldier wonders why the weapon only works for a single shot, raising doubts about its effectiveness. Another soldier explains that this limitation may be because the cannon can only handle 1 shot at a time. With a determined expression, the officer orders the next round of preparations, ready to fire again. The soldiers ready themselves, preparing to fire once more, hoping the cannon will prove its power. The officer fires the cannon again, this time achieving 2 successful hits on the target, impressing everyone. The soldiers cheer, relieved to see the weapon is functioning better, confirming its potential for use. While the results are good, one soldier points out that it still takes too long to reload. The other agrees, suggesting it's good for 1 shot at a time, but reloading is slow. The officer chuckles, suggesting that the cannon could be loaded in advance and fired when needed. The royal figure addresses the crown prince, discussing the weapons and their effectiveness during the demonstration. He notes that the first weapon, the infantry hand cannon, has a much slower firing rate. The second weapon, the handheld cannon, is slower than a bow, raising concerns about its practicality. The royal then asks how they can make use of such a weapon in a real battle. The response comes, explaining that while the hand cannon can't replace a bow, it has potential. The officer explains that hitting the target properly with the hand cannon requires at least 6 months of practice. He mentions that the marksmen they've trained for only 15 days still need more practice to perfect it. Confident in their progress, he asks for the skilled marksmen to demonstrate their abilities with the hand cannon. The marksmen stand ready, preparing to show their skills, hopeful that they can prove the weapon's worth. And the prince, with a confident smile, addresses the gathered soldiers, ready to lead the demonstration. He commands, asking for the skilled marksmen to step forward and showcase their talent and precision. The soldiers, preparing their weapons, steady themselves, knowing the important task about to unfold before them. With a firm command, the prince orders, "Get ready." As everyone braces for the upcoming shot, the prince shouts, "Fire!" signaling the marksmen to release their shots, demonstrating their expertise in unison. The marksmen's arrows hit their targets with precision, confirming their skills. The prince observes closely, impressed. A report reveals that 19 out of 60 shots struck the center, showcasing their excellent aim and focus. The prince, analyzing the results, remarks on the impressive performance and the high skill level achieved. He states that even the wind conditions are not enough to hinder the marksman's accurate shots. The prince notes, even an expert's skills can't match this after only 2 months of practice. The prince notices a large cannon being prepared. The soldiers are preparing for a demonstration of its power. Curious, the prince questions the unusual cannon. The soldier confirms it's a cannon of great strength. The prince, intrigued by the cannon, wonders what kind of ammunition it uses for such destructive power. The soldier explains that the cannon uses large slugs, emphasizing its immense power and devastating impact. With a loud roar, the cannon fires, unleashing a powerful blast that shakes the area violently. The cannon fires with tremendous force, creating a large explosion that fills the air with smoke. The surrounding soldiers react in awe, their faces showing shock and admiration at the display of power. The prince, acknowledging the destructive potential of the cannon, points out that even skilled soldiers fear it. The prince, looking at his advisor, thanks him for his contribution, impressed by the weapon's impact. In a calm tone, the prince acknowledges the help he received, expressing gratitude for the newfound strength. A man deep in thought examines a distant scene. He is considering the developments within the empire. He reflects on the prince's impressive achievements, especially the development of firearms, a new force in the kingdom. His expression shows concern as he talks about the difficulty of replicating such advanced technology without proper expertise. He suggests that although recreating the firearms might be hard, there may be another solution to their needs. The scene shifts as a new chapter begins, with a sense of anticipation building for what's to come. The king and his advisor discuss the challenges of mass-producing newly developed technologies for widespread use. The advisor, noticing the king's concern, asks if there is a specific problem with the production. The king reveals that a letter from the Ming Empire has arrived, containing important news for them. The letter mentions the Ming Emperor's interest in items made in Joseon, specifically the cannons and firearms. The king, surprised, wonders how the Ming Empire learned about these developments and questions their possible spies. The king considers the situation, acknowledging that sending the wrong items could spark suspicion from the Ming Empire. He expresses concern that if they send something different, the Ming might think they're hiding firearms on purpose. The advisor acknowledges the situation, admitting only Wang Zhen could have devised such a complicated plan. The king, now pondering a solution, orders that 2,000 pieces of a tribute be sent to the Ming. The advisor protests, arguing that 2,000 is excessive, suggesting a smaller number would be more appropriate. The king insists that 2,000 pieces be sent as tribute, reinforcing the importance of the decision. The advisor is shocked, questioning the king's choice of sending such a large number of items. The king explains that the Ming Emperor's letter mentioned the third prince's involvement, signaling potential diplomatic significance. The advisor points out the risk, questioning the wording in the letter that referred to their items as objects. He wonders aloud why the letter referred to them as objects, considering their true value and purpose. The advisor suggests that the Ming Empire must have a deeper plan, as the tribute issue seems strategic. He proposes that, if things go wrong, they can pressure the Ming to send more tribute. The advisor, confident in his understanding of the Ming's behavior, dismisses concerns, suggesting it won't happen. He mentions that, had he been in charge, he would have used the situation to gain more. In a sinister tone, the advisor suggests taking the second prince of Joseon as a hostage for leverage. A fire rages in the distance, burning down a building. The destruction draws the attention of nearby villagers. Amid the chaos, two individuals, Yonghei and another person, engage in a conversation about recent news. The second person asks about the contents of an announcement, clearly interested in understanding the new information. Yonghai replies, explaining he couldn't fully read the notice due to unclear handwriting and strange phrasing. He finally mentions hearing that the government will soon establish a new military unit, the Military Training Command. One person questions why the new military training is happening so far from the capital, pondering the decision. The other replies, speculating that since they are recruiting in the capital, cavalry training is likely involved. The first person, unsure of his ability to participate, mentions that he doesn't even own a horse. He adds that it seems impossible for him to join the cavalry, as he lacks basic equipment. The conversation continues, discussing the announcement, which surprisingly didn't mention horseback riding or the need for bows and arrows. One man, shocked, questions whether the rumors about the new training program are really true, feeling doubtful. The other man explains that the training requires strong individuals and mentions the need for a powerful physique. He adds that the announcement even specified they would not question the physical strength of applicants. The man mentions the future training plans, noting that participants will become commanders along with their families. A father tells his son he's being sent to the capital, warning him about the consequences ahead. A young man kneels in the snow, praying earnestly for the safety of his parents while away. He reflects on the announcement that has drawn many young people from all regions, eager for change, believing in their physical strength. They hope the military training will be their path to a new future. The sun sets over the royal palace, casting a golden glow over the tranquil city below. In the capital, officials discuss the rumors of an army gathering and the upcoming military challenge. The conversation pauses, and one official looks up, asking if they should be worried about the numbers. Another official dismisses the concern, stating that the enemy must be more substantial for this to be dangerous. The final official murmurs a warning, cautioning that these men don't even appear to be trained soldiers. Su Yang notices someone hiding behind him and asks why they keep avoiding being seen in the discussion. The person behind hesitates, unsure, and asks if they can speak instead of Su Yang, seeking guidance. Su Yang, irritated, reminds them that they are the Minister of War and should lead the army. The official behind Su Yang admits feeling uneasy, revealing they have only handled administrative tasks, not military duties. Su Yang reassures them, saying the king must trust their abilities and urges them to stay calm. Su Yang, with a determined look, contemplates how difficult it is to have reached this point in history. He speaks aloud, introducing himself as the Grand Prince Su Yang, appointed by the king to command the military. Su Yang explains that due to limited resources, not everyone will be able to participate in the military training. He adds that only those who pass the test will be allowed to join the training camp. The first test, Su Yang states, will begin with a simple but challenging trial running. Su Yang addresses the gathered group, noting that although they look tough, they still need military training. He tells them to follow him as he leads them to the training site for their first test. Su Yang warns the group that from now on they must run hard, staying behind in the rear. Su Yang advises them that their destination is a challenging one, requiring everyone to be prepared and focused. With determination, Su Yang commands them to march quickly, preparing to face the challenges ahead. As the test progresses, some fall behind, struggling to keep up. The number of participants dwindles. The voice of Su Yang echoes, announcing that only a few people remain in the running. Su Yang looks up at the sky, reflecting on the challenge ahead for those still standing. Su Yang stresses the importance of staying strong and determined as they face the grueling test ahead. He advises them to push their limits, even as they face challenges, with their bodies exhausted. Su Yang instructs the trainees to perform front squats, lifting weights equal to their body weight for the test. A trainee, eager but nervous, prepares for the challenge, determined to follow Su Yang's orders carefully. Su Yang nods, encouraging the trainee, then turns to others, saying he will begin with the first participant. With a serious look, Su Yang tells the trainee, it doesn't matter if they fail, just try their best. The trainee nods confidently, focusing on lifting the weight, prepared to give it everything he has. A trainee struggles with the heavy weight, grunting as he tries to push himself to succeed. Su Yang notices the trainee's strain, warning him not to overdo it. Concerned about his form, the trainee, exhausted but determined, continues with the lift, his efforts showing despite the obvious difficulty. After the test, only 221 of the trainees remain, having passed the grueling challenge, showing their strength. As night falls, the remaining trainees rest under the trees, readying themselves for what comes next. As night falls, the remaining trainees continue their march, with one trainee commenting about the approaching mountain. Another trainee remarks that with the mountain ahead, they might finally be allowed to rest and eat. One of the officials, overhearing their conversation, questions their confidence, noting that the challenges are far from over. Su Yang, listening to the conversation, disagrees, stating that the previous challenges were too easy, raising the stakes. The group arrives at the imposing Namsan fortress, with Su Yang foreseeing a much harder test ahead. Su Yang addresses the group, explaining that this place is where they will transform into true soldiers. He instructs the trainees to wash up at the wash hall, as a meal is prepared. A trainee asks if it's acceptable to use soap from the wash hall, unsure about the rules. Su Yang reassures them, saying that as soldiers, they are allowed to use the soap freely for hygiene. Excited, the trainees react loudly, eager to clean up and rest after the grueling tests. The official steps out and informs Su Yang that the next person is ready to come in for the interview. Su Yang responds, agreeing to let the next trainee in, his tiredness visible as he rubs his neck. Su Yang sighs, commenting that the interviews are almost over, with only a few left to go. The official announces that the next candidate is from the Hong family, preparing Su Yang for the interview. Su Yang begins questioning the trainee, asking why he applied for the military training, considering his noble background. The trainee explains that he wanted to repay his parents for their hardship, pursuing training to help them. Su Yang listens carefully, acknowledging the trainee's commitment, noting that his training will not be easy. Su Yang further warns that the training will be challenging, With the goal of shaping strong soldiers, the trainee eagerly expresses his desire to prove himself, excited about the tough training ahead. Su Yang, impressed by the trainee's spirit, dismisses him, telling him to return to his quarters. A new trainee enters the room, introducing himself as Yoon Sung from Gwangju, showing confidence in his demeanor. Yoon Sung admits to having a strong body but acknowledges that he needs more training to improve. He mentions that he joined to change his fate, as he's eager to reshape his life. Su Yang observes that people often believe they can't change, but the 22-year-old trainee is determined. Su Yang warns him that those who leave too soon won't succeed, as real progress takes time. Su Yang sternly questions the trainees, asserting that if they cannot endure harsh tactics, they aren't fit for the military. He intensifies his gaze, challenging them further, asking why soldiers even exist if they cannot withstand such hardships. Su Yang questions the trainees again, emphasizing the importance of enduring harsh tactics for their future as soldiers. His serious tone grows more intense, urging them to reflect on the true purpose of soldiers. Su Yang waits, making it clear that he expects them to discover the answer for themselves. After a moment of silence, Su Yang tells them they may leave, ending the interrogation for now. The trainees, slightly shaken, exit, reflecting on his words and the true meaning of their training. Su Yang observes the group, noting that even the strongest trainees like Hong Yun-seong need to change. He directs the group, instructing them to prepare for their next drill, which requires strict discipline. As they march, Su Yang orders them to focus, not allowing any distractions or chatter during the training. The trainees continue the drill, but one comments on how unique and intense Su Yang's training methods are. Su Yang, hearing the comment, continues his command, pushing the trainees forward, determined to make them stronger. Su Yang tells the group that there is nothing more important than loyally following orders on the battlefield. He emphasizes that soldiers must act with discipline, where failure to follow commands could lead to failure. Su Yang directs the trainees to practice the proper sounds for commands, crucial for military discipline and leadership. He reminds them that those who will lead must master these commands and make them a habit. The trainees listen attentively, understanding the importance of proper command as Su Yang watches them practice. A trainee nervously admits to Su Yang that he's still learning the proper sounds for military commands. Su Yang, understanding, advises the trainee that it's normal to struggle but reassures him about getting better with practice. Su Yang encourages the trainee to keep going, suggesting that even leaders need to master these basic commands. The scene shifts, showing the trainees in action. One trainee exclaims that he lost the challenge. Another trainee, noticing the loss, calls out to his teammate, reminding him that it's his turn to plan. A trainee, looking tired, explains he plans to take a walk to clear his head and relax. Another trainee, unimpressed, sarcastically remarks that taking a walk isn't exactly going to help him. The first trainee, brushing off the comment, insists that taking a break will make him feel better. As the first trainee walks away, he reflects on the harshness of the situation, walking slowly. Elsewhere, a grizzled man with a hardened look advises the first trainee to sell his assets. The grizzled man reassures the trainee, saying they don't need to worry about him or the situation. The trainee looks back, acknowledging the comment but still lost in his thoughts as the sunset looms. The trainee, deep in thought, notices the unusual sight of a brightly lit tent in the distance. Curious, he realizes the tent is the only one still illuminated, even as night falls. As he watches, the trainee catches his breath, wondering what's going on inside that tent. The trainee, panting, notices something unusual in the distance and wonders what it could be. A voice from behind tells him to leave if his curiosity is the only reason for staying. The trainee, embarrassed, quickly apologizes for his intrusion, realizing his actions might have been disrespectful. He hesitates, then asks about the large clubs in front of him, curious about their use. The man, seemingly unfazed, responds with a question of his own, asking the trainee his rank. The man notices the trainee's curiosity and, with a smile, asks if he's interested in the large club. The trainee, intrigued, responds with a simple signaling his interest in learning more about the object. The man laughs and offers the trainee a chance to hold the club if he's truly curious. Confused, the trainee asks, "Pardon?" as the man prepares to demonstrate the use of the club. The man explains that the club is called a meal and is used for strength training. The trainee, struggling with the heavy meal, groans loudly, feeling the intense strain on his muscles. Exasperated, he wonders aloud who could have possibly created such a brutal training tool to torture them. Another trainee answers, jokingly suggesting that it must have been created by Grand Prince Su Yang himself. The trainees pause, hearing a voice from behind, wondering if someone is talking about their leader, Su Yang. Su Yang, unfazed, explains that the exercises will differ depending on the weapon they choose, urging them to try everything. The trainee, relieved, asks if that means he won't need to use the heavy meal after all. Su Yang hands him a large plate weighing 24 kilograms, instructing him to use that instead. The trainee, frightened by the heavy weight, screams in shock, apologizing for his previous comments about the meal. He quickly admits he's uneducated and can't use the heavy shield either, ready to retreat. Su Yang, noticing his hesitation, asks where the trainee is going, signaling his intent to avoid the challenge. The trainee, drenched in sweat, smiles weakly after finally finishing his training, feeling relieved. Su Yang, walking past, casually remarks that he will see the trainee again tomorrow, adding to his exhaustion. After an hour, the trainee, still catching his breath, wonders how he will endure this intense training. Exhausted, he mutters to himself, feeling both sore and weary as he slowly moves away. The trainee, still grimacing, considers the long road ahead, unsure how he will keep up tomorrow. The trainee hears someone call his name and turns to see Young-hae approaching, looking tired. The trainee asks Young-hae where he's been, noticing he seems a bit out of breath. Young-hae replies that he got bored of the training with weaker trainees, so he decided to exercise alone. The trainee, concerned, notices something strange and suddenly exclaims, pointing at Young-hae's arm with shock. Young-hae, unfazed, looks down at his bloodied arm, nonchalantly asking if the trainee noticed the injury. Young-hae, with a calm expression, tells the trainee to forget about what he saw outside today. He mentions that it seems Grand Prince Su Yang has been watching his every move carefully. Young-hae advises the trainee to just ignore what happened, urging him to go back inside. As he walks away, Young-hae turns back, revealing his bloody arm, calmly stating the blood isn't his. The trainee, confused and concerned, watches as Young-hae disappears into the shadows, wondering about his cryptic words.